wages, and who regarded the alien garrisons with fear that continually diminished, and hate that continually grew. And behind regulars and irregulars alike, the wild Arab tribes of the desert and the hardy blacks of the forests, goaded by suffering of the earth. Never was there such a house of cards as the Egyptian dominion in the Sudan. The marvel is that it stood so long, not that it fell so soon. The names of two men of character and fame are forever connected with the actual outburst. One was an English general, the other an Arab priest. Both were earnest and enthusiastic men of keen sympathies and passionate emotions. Both were powerfully swayed by religious fervor. Both exerted great personal in the Englishman, a superior and civilized development of the Arab. In the end, they fought to the death. But for an important part of their lives, their influence on the fortunes of the Sudan was exerted in the same direction. Muhammad Ahmed, the Mahdi, will be discussed in his own place. Charles Gordon needs little introduction. Long before this tale begins, his reputation was European, and the fame of the ever-victorious army had spread far beyond the Great Wall of China. The misgovernment of the Egyptians and the misery of the Sudanese reached their greatest extreme in the 7th decade of the present century. From such a situation, there seemed to be no issue other than by force of arms. The Arab tribes lacked no provocation, yet they were destitute of two moral forces essential to all rebellions. The first was the knowledge that better things existed. The second was a spirit of combination. General Gordon showed them the first, the Mahdi provided the second. It is impossible to study King Charles' his wealthy very fortunes lead him from Sebastopol to Peking, from Gravesend to South Africa. Yet, as are the scenes, very precious is the truly disinterested man. Potentates of many lands in different degree, the Emperor of China, the King of the Belgians, the Premier of Cape Colony, the Khedive of Egypt, competed to secure his services. The importance of his offices varied no less than their nature. One day he was a subaltern of sappers, on another he commanded the Chinese army. The next he directed an orphanage, or was Governor General of the Sudan, with supreme powers of life and death and peace and war, or served as private secretary to Lord Ripon. But in whatever capacity he labored, he was true to his reputation. Whether he is portrayed bitterly criticizing the grab, the tactics of the assault on the Redan, or pulling the head of Larwan from under his bedstead and waving it in paroxysms of indignation before the astonished eyes of Sir Holiday Macartney, or riding alone into the camp of the rebel Suleiman and receiving the respectful salutes of those who had meant to kill him, or telling the Khedive Ismail that he must have the whole Sudan to govern, or reducing his salary to half the regulation amount because he thought it was too much, or ruling a country as large as Europe, or collecting facts for Lord Ripon's rhetorical efforts, and perceive a man careless alike of the frowns of men or the smiles of women, of life or comfort, wealth or fame. It was a pity that one, thus gloriously free from the ordinary restraining influence of human society, should have found in his own character so little mental ballast. His moods were capricious and uncertain, his passions violent, his impulses sudden and inconsistent. The mortal enemy of the morning had become a trusted. All in succession were pressed with enthusiasm. All at times were rejected with disdain. A temperament naturally neurotic had been aggravated among them. It must also be set down that few more uncertain and impracticable forces than Gordon have ever been introduced into administration and diplomacy. Although the Egyptian government might loudly proclaim their detestation of slavery, their behavior in the Sudan was viewed with suspicion by the European powers, and particularly by Great Britain. To vindicate his sincerity, the Khedive Ismail in 1874 appointed Gordon to be governor of the Equatorial Province in succession to Sir Samuel Baker. The name of the general was a sufficient guarantee that the slave trade was being earnestly attacked. The Khedive would gladly have stopped at the guarantee and satisfied the world without disturbing vested interests. But the mission, which may have been originally instituted as pretense, soon became in Gordon's energetic hands very real. Circumstances, moreover, soon enlisted the sympathies of the Egyptian government on the side of their zealous agent. The slave dealers had committed every variety of atrocity for which the most odious traffic in the world afforded occasion. But when, under the leadership of Zubair Rahamna, they refused to pay their annual tribute, it was felt in Cairo that their crimes had cried aloud for chastisement. Zubair is sufficiently described when it has been said that he was the most notorious slave dealer Africa has ever produced. His infamy had spread beyond the limits of the continent which was the scene of his exploits to the distant nations of the north and west. In reality, his rule was a distinct advance on the anarchy which had preceded it, and certainly he was no worse than others of his vile trade. His scale of business was, however, more extended. What William Whiteley was in respect of goods and chattels, that was Zubair in respect of slaves, a universal provider. Magnitude lends a certain grandeur to crime, and Zubair, in the height of his power, at the head of the slave merchants' confederacy, might boast the retinue of a king and exercise authority over wide regions and a powerful army. As early as 1869, he was practically the independent ruler of the Bahr el Ghazal. The Khedive resolved to assert his rights. A small Egyptian force was sent to subdue the rebel slaver, who not only disgraced humanity, but refused to pay tribute. Like most of the Khedivial expeditions, the troops under Belil Bey met with ill fortune. They came, they saw, they ran away. Some, less speedy than the rest, fell on the field of dishonor. The rebellion was open. Nevertheless, it was the Khedive who sought peace. Zubair apologized for defeating the vice-regal soldiers and remained supreme in the Bahr el Ghazal. Thence he planned the conquest of Darfur, at that time an independent kingdom. The Egyptian government were glad to join with him in the enterprise. The man they had been unable to conquer, they found it expedient to assist. The operations were successful. The king of Darfur, who was distinguished no less for his valor than for his folly, was killed. The whole country was subdued. The whole population available after the battles became slaves. Zubair thus wielded a formidable power. The Khedivial government, thinking to ensure his loyalty, created him a pasha, a rank which he could scarcely disgrace, and the authority of the rebel was thus unwillingly recognized by the ruler. Such was the situation when Gordon first came to the Sudan. It was beyond the power of the new governor of the Equatorial Province at once to destroy the slave-hunting confederacy. Yet he struck heavy blows at the slave trade, and when in 1877, after a short visit to England, he returned to the Sudan as governor general and with absolute power, he assailed it with redoubled energy. Fortune assisted his efforts, for the able Zubair was enticed to Cairo, and once there, the government refused to allow their faithful ally and distinguished guest to go back to his happy hunting grounds. Although the slave dealers were thus robbed of their great leader, they were still strong, and Zubair's son, the brave Suleiman, found a considerable following. Furious at his father's captivity, and alarmed lest his own should follow, he meditated revolt. But the governor general, mounted on a swift camel, attired in full uniform, rode alone into the rebel camp and compelled the submission of its chiefs before they could recover from their amazement. The Confederacy was severely shaken. And when, in the following year, Suleiman again revolted, the Egyptian troops under Gessi Pasha were able to disperse his forces and induce him to surrender on terms. The terms were broken, and Suleiman and 10 of his companions suffered death by shooting. Taken from von Slatten, Baron Rudolf Karl, Fire and Sword in the Sudan, page 28. The League of the Slave Dealers was thus destroyed. End of part 1 of chapter 1. Part 2 of chapter 1 of The River War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill, chapter 1, part 2. Towards the end of 1879, Gordon left the Sudan. With short intervals, he had spent 5 busy years in his provinces. His energy had stirred the country. He had struck at the root of the slave trade. He had attacked the system of slavery, and as slavery was the greatest institution in the land, he had undermined the whole social system. Indignation had stimulated his activity to an extraordinary degree. In a climate usually fatal to Europeans, he discharged the work of 5 officers. Careless of his methods, he bought slaves himself, drilled them, and with the soldiers thus formed, pounced on the caravans of the hunters. Traversing the country on a fleet dromedary, on which in a single year he is said to have covered 3,840 miles, he scattered justice and freedom among the astonished natives. He fed the infirm, protected the weak, executed the wicked. To some he gave actual help, to many freedom, to all new hopes and aspirations. Nor were the tribes ungrateful. The fiercest savages and cannibals respected the life of the strange white man. The women blessed him. He could ride unarmed and alone where a brigade of soldiers dared not venture. But he was, as he knew himself, the herald of the storm. Oppressed yet ferocious races had learned that they had rights. The misery of the Sudanese was lessened, but their knowledge had increased. The whole population was unsettled, and the wheels of change began slowly to revolve. Nor did they stop until they had accomplished an enormous revolution. The part played by the second force is more obscure. Few facts are so encouraging to the student of human development as the desire, which most men in all communities manifest at all times, to associate with their actions at least the appearance of moral right. However distorted may be their conceptions of virtue, however feeble their effort to attain even to their own ideals, it is a pleasing feature and a hopeful augury that they should wish to be justified. No community embarks on a great enterprise without fortifying itself with the belief that from some points of view its motives are lofty and disinterested. It is an involuntary tribute, the humble tribute of imperfect beings to the eternal temples of truth and beauty. The sufferings of a people or a class may be intolerable, but before they will take up arms and risk their lives, some unselfish and impersonal spirit must animate them. In countries where there is education and mental activity or refinement, this high motive is found in the pride of glorious traditions or in a keen sympathy with surrounding misery. Ignorance deprives savage nations of such incentives. Yet in the marvelous economy of nature, this very ignorance is a source of greater strength. It affords them the mighty stimulus of fanaticism. The French communists might plead that they upheld the rights of man. The desert tribes proclaimed that they fought for the glory of God. But although the force of fanatical passion is far greater than that exerted by any philosophical belief, its sanction is just the same. It gives men something which they think is sublime to fight for. And this serves them as an excuse for wars which it is desirable to begin for totally different reasons. Fanaticism is not a cause of war. It is the means which helps savage peoples to fight. It is the spirit which enables them to combine, the great common object before which all personal or tribal disputes become insignificant. What the horn is to the rhinoceros, what the sting is to the wasp, the Mohammedan faith was to the Arabs of the Sudan, a faculty of offense or defense. It was all this and no more. It was not the reason of the revolt. It strengthened, it characterized, but it did not cause. Quote, I do not believe that fanaticism exists as it used to do in the world, judging from what I have seen in this so-called fanatic land. It is far more a question of property, and is more like communism under the flag of religion. End quote. From General Gordon's Journals at Khartoum, Book 1, page 13. Those whose practice it is to regard their own nation as possessing a monopoly of virtue and common sense are wont to ascribe every military enterprise of savage peoples to fanaticism. They calmly ignore obvious and legitimate motives. The most rational conduct is considered mad. It is therefore been freely stated, and to some extent believed, that the revolt in the Sudan was entirely religious. If the worst untruths are those that have some appearance of veracity, this impression must be very false indeed. It is perhaps an historical fact that the revolt of a large population has never been caused solely or even mainly by religious enthusiasm. The reasons which forced the peoples of the Sudan to revolt were as strong as the defense which their oppressors could offer was feeble. Looking at the question from a purely political standpoint, we may say that upon the whole there exists no record of a better case for rebellion than presented itself to the Sudanese. Their country was being ruined, their property was plundered, their women were ravished, their liberties were curtailed, even their lives were threatened. Aliens ruled the inhabitants, the few oppressed the many, brave men were harried by cowards, the weak compelled the strong. Here were sufficient reasons. Since any armed movement against an established government can be justified only by success, strength is an important revolutionary virtue. It was a virtue that the Arabs might boast. They were indeed far stronger than they, their persecutors, or the outside world had yet learned. All were soon to be enlightened. The storm gathered, and the waters rose. 3 great waves impelled the living tide against the tottering house founded on the desert sand. The Arab suffered acutely from poverty, misgovernment, and oppression. Infuriated, he looked up and perceived that the cause of all his miseries was a weak and cowardly foreigner, a double Turk. The antagonism of races increased the hatred sprung from social evils. The moment was at hand. Then, and not till then, the third wave came, the wave of fanaticism, which, catching up and surmounting the other waves, covered all the flood with its white foam, and bearing on with the momentum of the waters, beat in thunder against the weak house so that it fell, and great was the fall thereof. Down to the year 1881, there was no fanatical movement in the Sudan. In their utter misery, the hopeless inhabitants had neglected even the practices of religion. They were nevertheless prepared for any enterprise, however desperate, which might free them from the Egyptian yoke. All they made them was the waterside leader who could combine the tribes and restore their broken spirits. And in the summer of 1881, the leader appeared. His subsequent career is within the limits of this account, and since his life throws a strong light on the thoughts and habits of the Arabs of the Sudan, it may be worthwhile to trace it from the beginning. The man who was the proximate cause of the river war was born by the banks of the Nile, not very far from Dongola. His family were poor, and of no account in the prophets. But as the prophet had claimed the royal descent, and as a sacred example was sprung from David's line, Muhammad Ahmed asserted that he was of the Ashraf, descendants of the prophet. And the assertion, since it cannot be disproved, may be accepted. His father was a humble priest, yet he contrived to give his son some education in the practices of religion, principles of the Quran, and the art of writing. Then he died at Karari while on a journey to Khartoum, and left the future Mahdi, still a child, to the mercies of the world. Solitary trees, if they grow at all, grow strong. And a boy deprived of a father's care often develops, if he escape the perils of youth, an independence and vigor of thought which may restore in afterlife the heavy loss of early days. It was so with Muhammad Ahmed. He looked around for an occupation and subsistence. A large proportion of the population of religious countries passed their lives at leisure, supported by the patient labor of the devout. The young man determined to follow the profession for which he felt his talent, because doing so affords. At an early age, he manifested a zeal for that service, and displayed a peculiar aptitude for learning the tenets and dogmas of the Mohammedan belief. So promising a pupil did not long lack a master in a country where intelligence and enthusiasm were scarce. His aspirations growing with his years and knowledge, he journeyed to Khartoum as soon as his religious education was completed, becoming a disciple of the renowned and holy Sheikh, Muhammad Sharif. His devotion to his superior, to his studies, and to the practice of austerities, and a strange personal influence he was already beginning to show, won him by degrees a few disciples of his own, and with them he retired to the island of Aba. Here by the waters of the White Nile, Muhammad Ahmed lived for several years. His two brothers, who were boat builders in the neighborhood, supported him by their industry. But it must have been an easy burden, for we read that he hollowed out for himself a cave in the mud bank and lived in almost entire seclusion, fasting often for days, and occasionally paying a visit to the head of the order to assure him of his devotion and obedience. I take this passage from Fire and Sword in the Sudan by Slatton. His account is the most graphic and trustworthy of all known records of the Mahdi. He had terrible opportunities of collecting information. I have followed chapter 4 very closely on this subject. Meanwhile, his sanctity increased, and the labor and charity of the brothers were by the alms of godly travelers on the river. This virtuous and frugal existence was disturbed and terminated by an untoward event. The renowned and holy Sheikh made a feast to celebrate the circumcision of his sons. That the merriment of the auspicious occasion and the entertainment of the guests might be increased, Sharif, according to the lax practice of the time, granted a dispensation from any sins committed during the festivities, and proclaimed in God's name the suspension of the rules against singing and dancing, by which the religious orders were bound. The ascetic of Aba Island did not join in these seemingly innocent dissipations. With the recklessness of the reformer, he protested against the demoralization of the age, and loudly affirmed the doctrine that God alone could forgive sins. These things were speedily brought to the ears of the renowned Sheikh, and in all the righteous indignation that accompanies detected wrongdoing, he summoned Muhammad Ahmed before him. The latter obeyed. He respected his superior. He was under obligations to him. His ire had disappeared as soon as it had been expressed. He submissively entreated forgiveness, but in vain. Sharif felt that some sort of discipline must be maintained among his flock. He had connived at disobedience to the divine law. All the more must he uphold his own authority. Rising in anger, he drove the presumptuous disciple from his presence with bitter words, and expunged his name from the order of the elect. Muhammad went home. He was greatly distressed. Yet his fortunes were not ruined. His sanctity was still a valuable and, unless he chose otherwise, an inalienable asset. The renowned Sheikh had a rival, nearly as holy and more enterprising than himself. From him the young priest might expect a warm welcome. Nevertheless, he did not abandon his former superior. Placing a heavy wooden collar on his neck, clad in sackcloth and sprinkled with ashes, he again returned to his spiritual leader, and in this penitential guise implored pardon. He was ignominiously ejected. Nor did he venture to revisit the unforgiving Sheikh. But it happened that in a few weeks, Sharif had occasion to journey to the island of Aba. His former disciple appeared suddenly before him, still clad in sackcloth and defiled by ashes. Careless of his plain misery, and unmoved by his loyalty, which was the more remarkable since it was disinterested, the implacable Sheikh poured forth a stream of invective. Among many insults, one went home. "Be off, you wretched Dongolawi!" Although the natives of the Dongola province were despised and disliked in the southern Sudan, it is not at first apparent why Muhammad should have resented so bitterly the allusion to his birthplace. But abuse by class is a dangerous, though effective practice. A man will perhaps tolerate an offensive word applied to himself, but will be infuriated if his nation, his rank, or his profession is insulted. Muhammad Ahmed rose. All that man could do to make amends he had done. Now he had been publicly called a wretched Dongolawi. Henceforth he would afflict Sharif with his repentance no longer. Reaching his house, he informed his not abandoned him in all his trouble, that the Sheikh had finally cast him off, and that he would now take his discarded allegiance. The Sheikh El Quraishi lived near Mesolania. He was jealous of Sharif and envied him his sanctimonious disciples. He was therefore delighted to receive a letter from Muhammad Ahmed announcing his breach with his former superior and offering his most devoted services. He received a cordial invitation, and the priest of Aba Island made all preparation for the journey. This new development seemed to have startled the unforgiving Sharif. It was no part of his policy to alienate his followers.
Email me at neededblessings8@gmail.com. Weston Union me. Denise LaShawn Morrell.
He wrote him a letter to this effect, but it was now too late. Muhammad replied with grave dignity that he had committed no crime, that he sought no forgiveness, and that a wretched Dongolawi would not offend by his presence the renowned Sheikh.
And leave me the fuck alone, so I can think about shit. Send me some information.
And wide sword. He declared that he
Well, if I want to go to jail, I need to go to jail.
And the torpor of the times.
Hopefully I like your soul.
It appears that he was quite justified in making a virtue of necessity.
Because if I don't, get it going.
And the people growing under oppression looked from all the regions to the figure that began
okay,
to grow.
you're going to die, go to jail.
His fame grew. Loud tongues, hearts of Islam. Whisperings added that a man was found who should break from off the necks of the tribes the hateful yoke of Egypt. Muhammad now deliberately entered upon the path of ambition. Throughout Nubia, the Shukri belief prevails. Someday, in a time of shame and trouble, a second great prophet will arise, a Mahdi, who shall lead the faithful nearer God and sustain the religion. The people of Sudan always look inquiringly for an ascetic who rises to fame, and the question is often repeated, art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? Of this powerful element of disturbance, Muhammad Ahmed resolved to avail himself. He requested and obtained the permission of the Sheikh Quraishi to return to Aba, where he was well known, and with which island village his name was connected, and so he went in triumph to the scene of his disgrace.
Shaka Zulu made me find
He received valuable presents, which he distributed to the poor, who acclaimed him as Zahid, a renouncer of earthly pleasures.
Yeah,
he journeyed preaching through Kufa, he received the respect of the priesthood and the homage of the people. And while he spoke of the purification of the religion, they thought that the burning words might be applied to the freedom of the soul. He supported his sermons by writings, which were widely read. When a few months later the Sheikh Quraishi died, the priest of Aba proceeded forthwith to erect a tomb to his memory, directing and controlling the voluntary labors of the reverend Arabs who carried the stones. While Muhammad was thus occupied, he received the support of a man, less virtuous than, but nearly as famous as himself. Abdullah was one of 4 brothers, the sons of an obscure priest, but he inherited no great love of religion or devotion to its observances. He was a man of determination and capacity. He set before himself 2 distinct ambitions, both of which he accomplished: to free the Sudan of foreigners and to rule it himself. He seems to have had a clear presentiment of
Say
this
for the
This much
devil.
he knew. There would be a great religious leader, and he would be his lieutenant and his successor. When Zubair
That's
conquered
what it
Darfur,
said.
Abdullah presented himself before him and hailed him as the expected Mahdi. Zubair, however, protested with superfluous
Y'all
energy that he
get
was
some
insane,
shit
and
around
the
that
impulsive
bitch
nature
if
was
you
compelled
want
to
to.
accept his assurances. So soon as he saw Muhammad
Kill,
rising
steal,
from fame
and
and displaying
destroy.
qualities of courage and energy, he hastened to throw himself at his feet and assure him of his devotion. No part of Sultan Pasha's fascinating account of his pharaohs and cycles is so entertaining as that in which Abdullah, then become Khalifa of the whole Sudan,
Listen to me.
describes his early struggles and adversity.
I know best.
Indeed, it was a very troublesome journey. At that time, my entire property
Karmic
consisted of one dog,
play,
and
man.
he had a gall on his back, so that I could not ride him.
A nigga
I
think
immediately
he
carried my
is
water
gonna
skin and
play,
bag of
bitch.
corn, over which I
You
spread my
know
rough
what
cotton
I'm
blanket
saying?
and drove him along in front of me.
The
At
fuck?
that time, I wore the white cotton shirt, like the rest of
I'm
the
finna
time.
meet him.
My clothes and my
Pussy ass
jacket once marked me
nigga.
I was a
That
stranger
bitch
wherever I
finna
went.
get up off
When I
me.
crossed the Nile, I was frequently greeted with, "What do you want? Back to your own country? There is nothing to steal here."
All these punks, you
While
done
lined up
fuck.
upside
You
down,
letting them come
it was a
around
long strike
me.
from the ownership
Bitch,
of
are
one
you
saddle ball donkey
serious?
to the undisputed rule of an empire. The weary wayfarer may have dreamed of this, for ambitious
I
through his
seen that one
imagination,
of that
really from his
bitch.
imagination excites ambition. But further he could not expect or wish to see.
Yeah,
Both
you
the anticipatory
nasty
eyes and the complacency of
motherfucker.
a man who had done with evil days.
I
Joy of his
touch
rise
your
to the
body,
submissive
bitch.
slaves.
Stop
But the day
sending the
would come when he would lead
motherfuckers
an
over
army of more than
here.
50,000 men to destruction.
Fucking
And
weird
the night
ass
would fall away,
queer.
almost alone, his empire shrunk again to the
Cut
size
it
of
out.
Barbie. He would seek his home in distant Kordofan, while the same Slatin
I
who knelt
seen
so
it
long
in
before
his
him
walk,
led the fierce
bitch.
pursuing squadrons on the trail. Muhammad Ahmed perceived his new adherent kindly, but without
Suck
enthusiasm.
your dick.
For some months, Abdullah carried stones to build the tomb of the Sheikh al-Qurayshi. Gradually, they got to know each other. But
Well,
one day he
want
trusted
to.
me with a secret.
Really
I knew he
badly.
was the expected guide.
Those
Slatin fired
T-Rex,
sword for 21.
bitch.
And though the world might think that the messenger of God was
No.
sent to lead men to happiness in heaven, Abdullah attached to the phrase a significance of his own.
Either way it
And he
goes,
should lead
get
into
the
power on earth.
motherfuckers
The
from
two
around
formed a
me.
strong combination.
I don't know why you
Mahdi
fucking
was such a
yourself,
Muhammad,
because
always
bitch, I'm
secret
telling you
ambassadors.
what's finna
But
go
the wild
down.
enthusiasm of
That
religion
shit
led on a
aggravating.
stainless life,
Hey,
and
bitch,
the
I done
influence of
told
superstition
you.
into the movement. But if he were the soul of the plot, Abdullah was the brain. He was
Y'all
the man of the
stupid
world,
ass
not the
around.
politician, the general. There now commenced a great
They
conspiracy
come
against the
and they
Egyptian government.
leave.
It was fostered by the discontents and justified by the miseries of the people of the Sudan.
I do not
Mahdi began
take
to collect
nothing
endurance and to extend his
this
influence to
serious,
all parts
but
of the
bitch,
country.
I
He
will
made a
about
second
the
journey to
kids, bitch,
Kordofan
y'all
and received
stupid as
everywhere
fuck.
promises of support from all
I
classes.
don't even know what's
Most
right, but I
assurances
will.
of devotion and reverence, and what was of more importance, of armed resistance. The
What's
secret
more
could not be well
important
confined
of
to
our
those who welcomed the movement.
resistance?
As the ramifications of the plot spread, they were perceived by the renowned Sheikh Sharif, who still nursed his chagrin and thirsted for revenge. He warned the
Sheriff.
Egyptian government. They, knowing his envy and hatred of his former disciple, discounted his evidence and for some time paid no attention to the gathering of the storm. But presently, more trustworthy witnesses confirmed his statements, and Raouf Pasha, then Governor General, finding himself confronted with a growing agitation, determined to act. He accordingly sent a messenger to the island of Aba to summon Muhammad Ahmed to Khartoum to justify his behavior and explain his intentions. The news of the dispatch of the messenger was swiftly carried to the Mahdi. He consulted with his trusty lieutenant. They decided to risk though it be in a bad condition, can stamp out the beginnings of revolt among the population. The courage of their resolve must be admired. The messenger arrived. He was received with courtesy by Abdullah, and forthwith conducted before the Mahdi. He delivered his message and urged Muhammad Ahmed to comply with the orders of the Governor General. The Mahdi listened for some time in silence, but with increasing emotion. And when the messenger advised him, as he valued his own safety, to journey to Khartoum, if only to justify himself,
Don't be a
his
fan.
passion overcame him. What? He shouted, rising suddenly and striking his breast with his hand. By the grace of God and his prophet, I am master of this country, and never shall I go to Khartoum to justify myself. From Slatin, Fire and Sword, page 135. The terrified messenger withdrew. The rebellion of the Mahdi had begun. Both the priest and the Governor General prepared for military enterprise. The Mahdi proclaimed a holy war against the foreigners, alike the enemies of God and the scourge of men. He collected his followers. He roused the local tribes. He wrote letters to all parts of the Sudan, calling upon the people to fight for a purified religion, freedom of the soil, and God's holy prophet, the expected Mahdi. He promised the honor of men to those who lived, the favor of God to those who fell, and lastly, that the land should be cleared of the miserable Turk. Better, he said, and it became the watchword of the revolt. Thousands of graves and $1 tax. For Orwalder, 10 years captivity in the Mahdi's camp. Nor was Raouf Pasha idle. Of his
Gotta do the
characteristic
right
position.
shit.
Each company was commanded by a captain. To encourage their efforts, whichever officer captured the Mahdi was promised promotion. At sunset on an August evening in 1881, the steamer arrived at Aba. The promise of the Governor General had provoked the strife, not the emulation of the officers. Both landed with their companies and proceeded by different routes under the cover of darkness to the village where the Mahdi dwelt. Arriving simultaneously from opposite directions, they fired into each other, and in the midst of this mistaken combat, the Mahdi rushed upon them with his scanty following and destroyed them impartially. A few soldiers succeeded in reaching the bank of the river, but the captain of the steamer would run no risks, and those who could not swim out to the vessel were left to their fate. With such tidings, the expedition returned to Khartoum. Muhammad Ahmed had been himself wounded in the attack, but the faithful Abdullah bound up the injury so that none might know that God's prophet had been pierced by carnal weapons. The effect of the success was electrical. The news spread throughout the Sudan. Men with sticks had slain men with rifles. A priest had destroyed the soldiers of the government. Surely this was the expected one. The Mahdi, however, profited by his victory only to accomplish a retreat without loss of prestige. Abdullah had no illusions. More troops would be sent. They were too near to Khartoum. Prudence counseled flight to regions more remote. But before this new Hijra, the Mahdi appointed his 4 caliphs, in accordance with prophecy and precedent. The first was Abdullah. Of the others, it is only necessary at this moment to notice
Oh,
Ali
me
Wad Ilu,
kids harm in my energy. You finna be
first to
fucked.
rally to the standard of revolt. Then the retreat began, but it was more like a triumphal progress. Attended by a considerable following, and preceded by tales of the most wonderful miracles and prodigies, the Mahdi retired to a mountain in Kordofan, to which he gave the name of Jebel Masa. That being the mountain whence the expected guide is declared in the Quran sooner or later to appear. He was now out of reach of Khartoum, but within reach of Fashoda. The Egyptian governor of that town, Rashid Bey, a man of more enterprise and even less military knowledge than is usual in his race, determined to make all attempt to seize the rebel and disperse his following. Taking no precautions, he fell on the 9th of December into an ambush, was attacked unprepared, and was himself with 1,400 men slaughtered by the ill-armed but valiant Arabs. The whole country stirred. The government, thoroughly alarmed by the serious aspect the revolt had assumed, organized a great expedition. 4,000 troops under Yusuf, a pasha of distinguished reputation, were sent against the rebels. Meanwhile, the Mahdi and his followers suffered the extremes of want. Their cause was as yet too perilous for the rich to join. Only the poor flocked to the holy standard. All that Muhammad possessed he gave away, keeping nothing for himself, excepting only a horse to lead his followers in battle. Abdullah walked. Nevertheless, the rebels were half famished, and armed with scarcely any more deadly weapons than sticks and stones. The army of the government approached slowly. Their leaders anticipated an easy victory. Their contempt for the enemy was supreme. They did not even trouble themselves to post sentries by night, but slept calmly inside a slender thorn fence, unwatched save by their tireless foes. And so it came to pass that in the half light of the early morning of the 7th of June, the Mahdi, his ragged caliphs, and his almost naked army rushed upon them and slew them to a man. The victory was decisive. Sadiq Kordofan was at the feet of the priest of Abba. Stores of arms and ammunition had fallen into his hands. Thousands of every class hastened to join his standard. No one doubted that he was the divine messenger sent to free them from their oppressors. The whole of the Arab tribes all over the Sudan rose at once. The revolt broke out simultaneously in Sennar and Darfur, and spread to provinces still more remote. The smaller Egyptian posts, the tax gatherers and local administrators were massacred in every district. Only the larger garrisons maintained themselves in the principal towns. They were at once blockaded. All communications were interrupted. All legal authority was defied. Only the Mahdi was obeyed. It is now necessary to look for a moment to Egypt. The misgovernment which in the Sudan caused the rebellion of the Mahdi in Egypt produced the revolt of Arabi Pasha. As the people of the Sudan longed to be rid of the foreign oppressors, the so-called Turks, so those of the Delta were eager to free themselves from the foreign regulators and the real Turkish influence. While men who lived by the sources of the Nile asserted that tribes did not exist for officials to harry, others who dwelt at its mouth protested that nations were not made to be exploited by creditors or aliens. The ignorant South found their leader in a priest. The more educated North looked to a soldier. Muhammad Ahmed broke the Egyptian yoke. Arabi gave expression to the hatred of the Egyptians for the Turks. But although the hardy Arabs might scatter the effete Egyptians were not likely to disturb the solid battalions of Europe. After much hesitation and many attempts at compromise, the liberal administration of Mr. Gladstone sent a fleet which reduced the forts of Alexandria to silence and the city to anarchy. The bombardment of the fleet was followed by the invasion of a powerful army. 25,000 men were landed in Egypt. The campaign was conducted with celerity and skill. The Egyptian armies were slaughtered or captured. Their patriotic but commonplace leader was sentenced to death and condemned to exile. Great Britain assumed the direction of Egyptian affairs. The British soon restored law and order in Egypt, and the question of the revolt in the Sudan came before the English advisors of the Khedive. Notwithstanding the poverty and military misfortunes which depressed the people of the Delta, the desire to hold their southern provinces was evident. The British government, which at that time was determined to pursue a policy of non-interference in the Sudan, gave a tacit consent, and another great expedition was prepared to suppress the false prophet, as the English and Egyptian deemed him, the expected Mahdi, as the people of the Sudan believed. A retired officer of the Indian Staff Corps and a few European officers of various nationalities were sent to Khartoum to organize the new field force. Meanwhile, the Mahdi, having failed to take by storm, laid siege to El Obeid, the chief town of Kordofan. During the summer of 1883, the Egyptian troops gradually concentrated at Khartoum until a considerable army was formed. It was perhaps the worst army that has ever marched to war. One extract from General Hicks's letters will suffice. Writing on the 8th of June, 1883, to Sir E. Wood, he says, incidentally, 51 men of the Krupp battery deserted on the way here, although in chains. The officers and men who had been defeated fighting for their own liberties at Tel El Kebir were sent to be destroyed, fighting to take away the liberties of others in the Sudan. They had no spirit, no discipline, hardly any training, and in a force of over 8,000 men, there were scarcely a dozen capable officers. The two who were the most notable of these few, General Hicks, who commanded, and Colonel Farquhar, the chief of the staff, must be remarked. El Obeid had fallen before the ill-fated expedition left Khartoum, but the fact that Slatin Bey, an Austrian officer in the Egyptian service, was still maintaining himself in Darfur, provided it with an object. On the 9th of September, Hicks and his army, the actual strength of which was 7,000 infantry, 400 mounted Bashi Bazooks, 500 cavalry, 100 Circassians, 10 mounted guns, 4 cross, and 6 Nordenfelt machine guns, left Omdurman and marched to Douai. Although the actual command of the expedition was vested in the English officer, Ala el-Din Pasha, the governor general who had succeeded Rauf Pasha, exercised an uncertain authority. Differences of opinion were frequent, though all the officers were agreed in taking the darkest views of their chances. The miserable host toiled slowly onward towards its destruction, marching in a southwesterly direction through Shat and Rahat. Here the condition of the force was so obviously demoralized that a German servant, Gustav Klutz, the servant of Baron Seckendorf, actually deserted to the Mahdi's camp. He was paraded in triumph as an English officer. On the approach of the government troops, the Mahdi had marched out of Obeid and established himself in the open country, where he made his followers live under military conditions and continually practiced them in warlike evolutions. More than 40,000 men collected round his standard, and the Arabs were now armed with several thousand rifles and a few cannon, as well as a great number of swords and spears. To these proportions had the little band of followers who fought at Abba grown. The disparity of the forces was apparent before the battle. The Mahdi thereupon wrote to Hicks, calling on him to surrender and offering terms. His proposals were treated with disdain, although the probable result of an engagement was clear. Until the expedition reached Rahat, only a few cavalry patrols had watched its slow advance. But on the 1st of November, the Mahdi left Obeid and marched with his whole power to meet his adversary. The collision took place on the 3rd of November. All through that day, the Egyptians struggled slowly forward, in great want of water, losing continually from the fire of the Sudanese riflemen, and leaving several guns behind them. On the next morning, they were confronted by the main body of the Arab army, and their attempts to advance further were defeated with heavy loss. The force began to break up. Yet another day was consumed before it was completely destroyed. Scarcely 500 Egyptians escaped death. Hardly as many of the Arabs fell. The European officers perished fighting to the end, and the general met his fate sword in hand at the head of the last formed body of his troops, his personal valor and physical strength exciting the admiration even of the fearless enemy, so that in chivalrous respect they buried his body with barbaric honors. Muhammad Ahmed celebrated his victory with a salute of 100 guns, and well he might, for the Sudan was now his, and his boast that, by God's grace and the favor of the Prophet, he was to all the land had been made good by force of arms. No further attempt was made to subdue the country. The people of the Sudan had won their freedom by their valor and by the skill and courage of their saintly leader. It only remained to evacuate the towns and withdraw the garrisons safely. But what looked like the winding up of one story was really the beginning of another, much longer, just as bloody, commencing in shame and disaster, but ending in triumph and, let us hope, in peace. I desire for a moment to take a more general view of the Mahdi's movement than the narrative has allowed. The original causes were social and racial, but great as was the misery of the people, their spirit was low, and they would not have taken up arms merely on material grounds. Then came the Mahdi. He gave the tribes the enthusiasm they lacked. The war broke out. It is customary to lay to the charge of Muhammad Ahmed all the blood that was spilled. To my mind, it seems that he may divide the responsibility with the unjust rulers who oppressed the land, with the incapable commanders who muddled away the lives of their men, with the vacillating ministers who aggravated the misfortunes. But whatever is sent to the Mahdi's account, it should not be forgotten that he put life and soul into the hearts of his countrymen and freed the native land of foreigners. The poor, miserable natives, eating only a handful of grain, toiling half naked and without hope, found a new, if terrible magnificence added to life. Within their humble breasts, the spirit of the Mahdi roused the fires of patriotism and religion. Life became filled with thrilling, exhilarating terrors. They existed in a new and wonderful world of imagination. While they lived there were great things to be done, and when they died, whether it was slaying the Egyptians or charging the British squares, a paradise which they could understand awaited them. There are many Christians who reverence the faith of Islam, and yet regard the Mahdi merely as a commonplace religious impostor whom force of circumstances elevated to notoriety. In a certain sense, this may be true, but I know not how a genuine may be distinguished from a spurious prophet, except by the measure of his success. The triumphs of the Mahdi were in his lifetime far greater than those of the founder of the Mohammedan faith, and the chief difference between Orthodox Mohammedanism and Mahdism was that the original impulse was opposed only by decaying systems of government and society, and the recent movement came in contact with civilization and the machinery of science. Recognizing this, I do not share the popular opinion, and I believe that if in future years prosperity should come to the peoples of the Upper Nile, and learning and happiness follow in its train, then the first Arab historian who shall investigate the early annals of that new nation will not forget, foremost among the heroes of this race, to write the name of Muhammad Ahmed. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2, Part 1 of The River War. This LibreVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 2, The Fate of the Envoy. All great movements, every vigorous impulse that a community may feel, become perverted and distorted as time passes, and the atmosphere of the earth seems fatal to the noble aspirations of its peoples. A wide humanitarian sympathy in a nation easily degenerates into hysteria. A military spirit tends toward brutality. Liberty leads to license, restraint to tyranny. Pride of race is distended to blustering arrogance. The fear of God produces bigotry and superstition. There appears no exception to the mournful rule, and the best efforts of men, however glorious their early results, have dismal endings, like plants which shoot and bud and put forth beautiful flowers, and then grow rank and coarse and are withered by the winter. It is only when we reflect that the decay gives birth to fresh life, and that new enthusiasms spring up to take the places of those that die. As the acorn is nourished by the dead leaves of the oak, the hope strengthens that the rise and fall of men and their movements are only the changing foliage of the ever-growing tree of life, while underneath a greater evolution goes on continually. The movement which Muhammad Ahmed created did not escape the common fate of human enterprise, nor was it long before the generous blood of a patriotic and religious revolt congealed into the dark clot of a military empire. With the expulsion or destruction of the foreign officials, soldiers, and traitors, the racial element began to subside. The reason for its existence was removed. With the increasing disorders, the social agitation dwindled, for communism presupposes wealth, and the wealth of the Sudan was greatly diminished. There remained only the fanatical fury which the belief in the divine mission of the Mahdi had excited, and as the necessity for a leader passed away, the belief in his sanctity grew weaker. But meanwhile, a new force was making itself felt on the character of the revolt. The triumph, no less than the plunder which had rewarded the Mahdi's victories, had called into existence a military spirit, distinct from the warlike passions of the tribesmen, the spirit of the professional soldier. The siege of Khartoum was carried on while this new influence was taking the place of the original forces of revolt. There was a period when a neutral point was obtained, and the Mahdist power languished. But the invasion of the eastern Sudan by the British troops in the spring, and the necessary advance of the relieving columns in the winter of 1884, revived the patriotic element. The tribes who had made a great effort to free themselves from foreign domination saw in the operations of Sir Gerald Graham and Lord Wolseley an attempt to bring them again under the yoke. The impulse which was given to the Mahdi's cause was sufficient to raise a fierce opposition to the invading forces. The delay in the dispatch of the relief expedition had sealed the fate of Khartoum, and the fall of the town established the supremacy of the military spirit on which the Dervish Empire was afterwards founded. All the warlike operations of Mohammedan peoples are characterized by fanaticism, but with this general reservation it may be said that the Arabs who destroyed Yusuf, who assaulted El Obeid, who annihilated Hicks, fought in the glory of religious zeal. That the Arabs who opposed Graham, Earl, and Stewart fought in defense of the soil, and that the Arabs who were conquered by Kitchener fought in the pride of an army. Fanatics charged at Shechem, patriots at Abu Klea, warriors at Omdurman. In order to describe conveniently the changing character of the revolt, I have anticipated the story and must revert to a period when social and racial influences were already weakening and the military spirit was not yet grown strong. If the defeat of Yusuf Pasha decided the whole people of the Sudan to rise in arms and strike for their liberties, the defeat of Hicks satisfied the British government that those liberties were won. The powerful influence of the desire to rule prompted the Khedive's ministers to make still further efforts to preserve their country's possessions. Had Egypt been left to herself, other desperate efforts would have been made, but the British government had finally abandoned the policy of non-interference with Egyptian action in the Sudan. They advised its abandonment. The protests of Sharif Pasha provoked Lord Grenville to explain the meaning of the word advice. The Khedive bowed to superior authority. The minister resigned. The policy of evacuation was firmly adopted. Let us, said the ministers, collect the garrisons and come away. It was simple to decide on the course to be pursued, but almost impossible to follow it. Several of the Egyptian garrisons, as in Darfur and El Obeid, had already fallen. The others were either besieged, like Sennar, Tokar, and Sikkat, or cut off from the north, as in the case of the Equatorial Province, by the area of rebellion. The capital of the Sudan was, however, as yet unmolested, and as its Egyptian population exceeded the aggregate of the provincial towns, the first task of the Egyptian government was obvious. Mr. Gladstone's administration had repressed the revolt of Arabi Pasha. Through their policy, the British were in armed occupation of Egypt. British officers were reorganizing the army. A British official supervised the finances. A British plenipotentiary advised with the re-established Tewfik. A British fleet lay attentive before the ruins of Alexandria, and it was evident that Great Britain could annex the country in name as well as in fact. But imperialism was not the object of the radical cabinet. Their aim was philanthropic and disinterested, as they were now determined to be made to justify interference by reorganization. The British government watched therefore with anxious solicitude the efforts of Egypt to evacuate the Sudan and bring the garrison safely home. They utterly declined to assist with military force, but they were generous with their advice. Everybody at that time distrusted the capacities of the Egyptians, and it was thought the evacuation might be accomplished if it were entrusted to stronger and more honest men that were bred by the banks of the Nile. The ministers looked about them, wondering how they could assist the Egyptian government without risk or expense to themselves, and in an evil hour for their fame and fortunes, someone whispered the word Gordon. Forthwith they proceeded to telegraph to Cairo. Would General Charles Gordon be of any use to you or to the Egyptian government, and if so, in what capacity? The Egyptian government replied through Sir Evelyn Baring that as the movement in the Sudan was partly religious, they were very much averse from the appointment of a Christian in high command. The eyes of all those who possessed local knowledge were turned to a different person. There was one man who might stand the tide of Mahdi, who might perhaps restore the fallen dominion of Egypt, who might at least save the garrisons of the Sudan. In necessity and distress, the Khedivial advisors and the British plenipotentiary looked as a desperate remedy to the man whose liberty they had curtailed, whose property they had confiscated, and whose son they had executed, Zubair Pasha. This was the agent for whom the government of Egypt hankered. The idea was supported by all who were acquainted with the local conditions. A week after Sir Evelyn Baring had declined General Gordon's services, he wrote, "Whatever may be Zubair's faults, he is said to be a man of great energy and resolution. The Egyptian government considers that his services may be very useful. Baker Pasha is anxious to avail himself of Zubair Pasha's services." From Sir Evelyn Baring, letter of December 9, 1883. It is certain that had the Egyptian government been a free agent, Zubair would have been sent to the Sudan as its sultan, and assisted by arms, money, and perhaps by men, to make head against the Mahdi. It is probable that at this particular period the Mahdi would have collapsed before a man whose fame was nearly equal to, and whose resources would have been much greater than his own. But the British ministry would countenance no dealings with such a man. They scouted the idea of Zubair, and by so doing increased their obligation to suggest an alternative. Zubair being rejected, Gordon remained. It is scarcely possible to conceive a greater contrast than that which these two men presented. It was a leap from the equator to the North Pole. When difficulties and dangers perplex all minds, it has often happened in history that many men, by different lines of thought, arrive at the same conclusion. No complete record has yet been published of the telegrams which passed between the government and their agent at this juncture. The blue books reserve a disingenuous discretion, but it is known that from the very first, Sir Evelyn Baring was bitterly opposed to General Gordon's appointment. No personal friendship existed between them, and the administrator dreaded the return to the feverish complications of Egyptian politics of the man who had always been identified with unrest, improvisation, and disturbance. The pressure was, however, too strong for him to withstand. Nubar Pasha, the Foreign Office, the British public, everyone clamored for the appointment. Had Baring refused to give way, it is probable that he would have been overruled. At length he yielded, and as soon as this consent had been obtained, the government turned with delight to Gordon. On the 17th of January, Lord Wolseley requested him to come to England. On the 18th, he met the cabinet. That same night, he started on the long journey from which he was never to return. Gordon embarked on his mission in high spirits, sustained by that belief in personality which too often misleads great men and beautiful women. It was, he said, the greatest honor ever conferred upon him. Everything smiled. The nation was delighted. The ministers were intensely relieved. The most undoubted confidence was reposed in the envoy. His interview with the Khedive was very satisfactory. His complete authority was proclaimed to all the notables and natives of the Sudan in the proclamation of the Khedive, January 26, 1884. He was assured of the support of the Egyptian government in a communication from Sir E. Baring to Major General Gordon, January 25, 1884. The London Foreign Office, having with becoming modesty admitted that they had not sufficient local knowledge, taken from Earl Granville to Sir E. Baring, January 22, 1884, accorded him wide discretionary power. From Sir E. Baring to Earl Granville, February 1, 1884. £100,000 was placed to his credit, and he was informed that further sums would be supplied when this was exhausted. He was assured that no effort would be wanting on the part of the Caroline authorities, whether English or Egyptian, to afford him all the support and cooperation in their power. Sir E. Baring to Major General Gordon, January 25, 1884. There is no sort of difference, wrote Sir Evelyn Baring, between General Gordon's views and those entertained by Nubar Pasha and myself. Sir E. Baring to Earl Granville, February 1, 1884. Under these propitious auguries, the dismal and disastrous enterprise began. His task, though difficult and, as it ultimately proved, impossible, was clearly defined. You will bear in mind, wrote Sir Evelyn Baring, that the main end to be pursued is the evacuation of the Sudan. The object of your mission to the Sudan, declared the Khedive, is to carry into execution the evacuation of those territories and to withdraw our troops, civil officials, and such of the inhabitants as may wish to leave for Egypt. And after the evacuation, to take the necessary steps for establishing an organized government in the different provinces. Nor was he himself under any misconception. He drew up a memorandum when on board the Tanjoy, in which he fully acquiesced in the evacuation of the Sudan. In a sentence which breathes the same spirit as Mr. Gladstone's famous expression, "A people rightly struggling to be free," he wrote, "I must say it would be an iniquity to conquer these peoples, and then hand them back to the Egyptians without guarantees of future good government." Finally, he unhesitatingly asserted, "No one who has ever lived in the Sudan can escape the reflection, what a useless possession is this land." And Colonel Stewart, who accompanied him and endorsed the memorandum, added, "And what a huge encumbrance to Egypt." Thus far, there was complete agreement between the British envoy and the Liberal cabinet. It is beyond the scope of these pages to describe his long ride across the desert from Korosko to Abu Hamed, his interview with the notables at Berber, or his proclamation of the abandonment of the Sudan, which some affirm to have been an important cause of his ruin. On the 22nd of February, he arrived at Khartoum. He was received with rejoicing by the whole population. They recognized again their just Governor General and their present deliverer. Those who had been about to fly for the north took fresh heart. They believed that behind the figure of the envoy stood the resources of an empire. The Mahdi and the gathering dervishes were perplexed and alarmed. Confusion and hesitancy disturbed their councils and delayed their movements. Gordon had come. The armies would follow. Both friends and foes were deceived. The great man was at Khartoum, but there he would remain, alone. Whatever confidence the general had felt in the power of his personal influence had been dispelled on the journey to Khartoum. He had no more illusions. His experienced eye reviewed the whole situation. He saw himself confronted with a tremendous racial movement. The people of the Sudan had risen against foreigners. His only troops were Sudanese. He was himself a foreigner. Foremost among the leaders of the revolt were the Arab slave dealers, furious at the attempted suppression of their trade. No one, not even Sir Samuel Baker, had tried harder to suppress it than Gordon. Lastly, the whole movement had assumed a fanatical character. Islam marched against the infidel. Gordon was a Christian. His own soldiers were under the spell they were trying to destroy. To them, their commander was accursed. Every influence was hostile, and in particular hostile to his person. The combined forces of race, class, and religion were against him. He bowed before their irresistible strength. On the very day of his arrival at Khartoum, while the townsfolk were cheering his name in the streets and the batteries were firing joyful salutes, while the people of England thought his mission already accomplished, and the government congratulated themselves on the wisdom of their action, General Gordon sat himself down and telegraphed a formal request to Cairo for Zubair Pasha. The whole story of his relations with Zubair is extremely characteristic. Zubair's son, Suleiman, had been executed, if not Gordon's orders, at least during his administration of the Sudan, and with his complete approval. Thus, he had said, does God make gaps in the ranks of his enemies? He had hardly started from London on his new mission when he telegraphed to Sir Evelyn Baring, telling him that Zubair was a most dangerous man and requesting that he might be at once deported to Cyprus. This was, of course, quite beyond the powers or intention of the British agent. The general arrived in Cairo like a whirlwind close behind his telegram, and was very angry to hear that Zubair was still in Egypt. Before starting up the river, he went to see Sharif Pasha. In the ex-minister's anteroom, he met the very man he had determined to avoid, Zubair. He greeted him with effusion. They had a long talk about the Sudan, after which Gordon hurried to the agency and informed Sir Evelyn Baring that Zubair must accompany him to Khartoum at once. Baring was amazed. He did not himself disapprove of the plan. He had, in fact, already recommended it, but he thought the change in Gordon's attitude too sudden to be relied on. Tomorrow he might change again. He begged the general to think more seriously of the matter. Gordon, with his usual frankness, admitted that his change of mind had been very sudden. He had been conscious, he said, of a mystic feeling that Zubair was necessary to save the situation in the Sudan. Gordon left Cairo still considering the matter. So soon as he made his formal demand from Khartoum for the assistance of Zubair, it was evident that his belief in the old slave dealer's usefulness was a sound conviction and not a mere passing caprice. Besides, he had now become the man on the spot, and as such his words carried double force. Sir Evelyn Baring determined to support the recommendation with his whole influence. Never was so good a case made out for the appointment of so bad a man. The envoy extraordinary asked for him. Colonel Stewart, his colleague, concurred. The British agent strongly urged the request. The Egyptian government were unanimous, and behind all these were ranged every single person who had the slightest acquaintance with the Sudan. Nothing could exceed the vigor with which the demand was made. On the 1st of March, General Gordon telegraphed, I tell you plainly, it is impossible to get Cairo employees out of Khartoum unless the government helps in the way I told you. They refused Zubair, but it was the only chance. And again, on the 8th, if you do not send Zubair, you have no chance of getting the garrisons away. I believe, said Sir Evelyn Baring in support of these telegrams, that General Gordon is quite right when he says that Zubair Pasha is the only possible man. Dubar is strongly in favor of him. Dr. Bodorf, the African traveler, fully confirms what General Gordon says of the influence of Zubair. The Pasha was vile, but indispensable. Her Majesty's government refused absolutely to have anything to do with Zubair. They declined to allow the Egyptian government to employ him. They would not entertain the proposal, and scarcely consented to discuss it. The historians of the future may occupy their leisure and exercise their wits in deciding whether the ministers and the people were right or wrong, whether they had a right to indulge their sensitiveness at so terrible a cost, whether they were not more nice than wise, whether their dignity was more offended by what was incurred or by what was avoided. General Gordon has explained his views very clearly and concisely. Had Zubair Pasha been sent up when I asked for him, Berber would in all probability never have fallen, and one might have made a Sudan government in opposition to the Mahdi. We choose to refuse his coming up because of his antecedents in the slave trade. Granted that we had reason yet, as we take no precautions as to the future of these lands with respect to the slave trade, the above opposition seems absurd. I will not send up A because he will do this, but I will leave the country to B, who will do exactly the same. From Major General Gordon, journals at Khartoum. But if the justice of the decision is doubtful, its consequences were obvious. Either the British government were concerned with the Sudan, or they were not. If they were not, then they had no reason or right to prohibit the appointment of Zubair. If they were bound to see that the garrisons were rescued. It was no question whether Great Britain was originally responsible for the safety of the garrisons. General Gordon contended that we were bound to save them at all costs, and he backed his belief with his life. Others may hold that governments have no right to lay, or at any rate, must be very judicious in the laying of burdens on the backs of their own countrymen, in order that they may indulge a refined sense of chivalry towards foreigners. England had not misgoverned the Sudan, had not raised the revolt or planted the garrisons. All that Egypt had a right to expect was commiseration. But the moment Zubair was prohibited, the situation was changed. The refusal to permit his employment was tantamount to an admission that affairs in the Sudan involved the honor of England, as well as the honor of Egypt. When the British people, for this was not merely the act of the government, adopted a high moral attitude with regard to Zubair, they bound themselves to rescue the garrisons, peacefully if possible, forcibly if necessary. With their refusal to allow Zubair to go to the Sudan began the long and miserable disagreement between the government and their envoy. Puzzled and disturbed at the reception according to his first request, Gordon cast about for other expedients. He had already stated that Zubair was the only chance, but it is the duty of subordinates to suggest other courses when those they recommend are rejected. And with a wholehearted enthusiasm and unreserved loyalty, the general threw himself into the affair and proposed plan after plan with apparent hope. Gordon considered that he was personally pledged to effect the evacuation of Khartoum by the garrison and civil servants. He had appointed some of the inhabitants to positions of trust, thus compromising them with the Mahdi. Others had undoubtedly been encouraged to delay their departure by his arrival. He therefore considered that his honor was involved in their safety. Henceforward he was inflexible. Neither rewards nor threats could move him. Nothing that men could offer would induce him to leave Khartoum till its inhabitants were rescued. The government on their side were equally stubborn. Nothing, however sacred, should induce them to send troops to Khartoum, or in any way involve themselves in the middle of Africa. The town might fall, the garrison might be slaughtered. Their envoy, but what possibilities they were prepared to face as regards him will not be known until all of this and the next generation are buried and forgotten. The deadlock was complete. To some men, the Foreign Office might have suggested lines of retreat, covered by the highest official praise, and leading to preferment and reward. Others would have welcomed an order to leave so perilous a post. But the man we had sent was the one man of all others who was beyond their control, who cared nothing for what they could give or take away. So events dragged on their wretched course. Gordon's proposals became more and more impracticable, as the best courses he could devise were successively vetoed by the government, and as his irritation and disappointment increased. The editor of his journals has enumerated them with indignant care. He had asked for Zubair. Zubair was refused. He had requested Turkish troops. Turkish troops were refused. He had asked for Mohammedan regiments from India. The government regretted their inability to comply. He asked for a firman from the Sultan to strengthen his position. It was peremptorily refused. He proposed to go south in his steamers to Equatoria. The government forbade him to proceed beyond Khartoum. He asked that 200 British troops might be sent to Berber. They were refused. He begged that a few might be sent to Aswan. None were sent. He proposed to visit the Mahdi himself and try to arrange matters with him personally. Perhaps he recognized the kindred spirit. The government in this case very naturally forbade him. At last the quarrel is open. He makes no effort to conceal his disgust. I leave you, he says, the indelible disgrace of abandoning the garrisons. From Major General Gordon to Sir E. Baring, telegraphic, received at Cairo, April 16. Such abandonment is, he declares, the climax of meanness. It dispatched April 8th. He reiterates his determination to abide with the garrison of Khartoum. I will not leave these people after all they have gone through. Major General Gordon to Sir E. Baring, Khartoum, July 30, received at Cairo, October 15. He tosses his commission contemptuously from him. I would also ask Her Majesty's government to accept the resignation of my commission. Major General Gordon to Sir E. Baring, telegraphic, Khartoum, March 9. The government trusts that you will not resign. Earl Granville to Sir E. Baring, Foreign Office, March 13. And his offer remains in abeyance. Finally, in bitterness and vexation, thinking himself abandoned and disavowed, he appeals to Sir Evelyn Baring personally. I feel sure, whatever you may feel diplomatically, I have your side, and that of every man professing himself a gentleman in private. Major General Gordon to Sir E. Baring, telegraphic, received at Cairo, April 16. And as a last hope, he begs Sir Samuel Baker to appeal to British and American millionaires to subscribe £200,000 to enable him to carry out the evacuation without, and even in spite of, the governments of Cairo and London. And Sir Samuel Baker writes a long letter to the Times in passionate protest and entreaty. Such are the chief features of the Russian business. Even the blue books in their dry recital arouse in the reader painful and indignant emotions. And meanwhile, other, still more stirring events are passing outside the world of paper and ink. The arrival of Gordon at Khartoum had seriously perplexed and alarmed Muhammad Ahmed and his Khalifa. Their following was discouraged, and they themselves feared lest the general should be the herald of armies. His Berber proclamation reassured them, and as the weeks passed without reinforcements arriving, the Mahdi and Abdullah, with that courage which in several great emergencies drew them to the boldest courses, determined to put a brave face on the matter and blockade Khartoum itself. They were assisted in this enterprise by a revival of the patriotic impulse throughout the country, and a consequent stimulus to the revolt. To discover the cause, it is necessary to look to the eastern Sudan, where the next tragedy, after the defeat of Hicks, is laid. The Hadendoa tribe, infuriated by oppression and misgovernment, had joined the rebellion under the leadership of the celebrated and perhaps immortal Osman Digna. The Egyptian garrisons of Tokar and Sinkat were beleaguered and hard-pressed. Her Majesty's government disclaimed all responsibility. Yet, since these towns were not far from the coast, they did not prohibit an attempt on the part of the Egyptian government to rescue the besieged soldiers. Accordingly, an Egyptian force 3,500 strong marched from Suakin in February 1884 to relieve Turkic Commander General Baker, once the gallant colonel of the 10th Hussars. Hard by the wells of Tent they were, 5th of February, attacked by about 1,000 Arabs. On the square, being only threatened by a small force of the enemy, the Egyptian troops threw down their arms and ran, carrying away the black troops with them, and allowing themselves to be killed without the slightest resistance. General Baker to Sir E. Baring, February 6, official dispatch, telegraphic. The British and European officers in vain endeavored to rally them. The single Sudanese battalion fired impartially on friend and foe. The general, with that unshaken courage and high military skill which had already on the Danube gained him a continental reputation, collected some 1,500 men, mostly unarmed, and so returned to Suakin. 96 officers and 2,250 men were killed. Krupp guns, machine guns, rifles, and a large supply of ammunition fell to the victorious Arabs. Success inflamed their ardor to the point of madness. The attack of the towns was pressed with redoubled vigor. The garrison of Sinkat, 800 strong, sallied out and attempted to fight their way to Suakin. The garrison of Tokar surrendered. Both were destroyed. The evil was done. The slaughter was complete. Yet the British government resolved to add to it. The garrisons they had refused to rescue, they now determined to avenge. In spite of their philanthropic professions, and in spite of the advice of General Gordon, who felt that his position in Khartoum would be still further compromised by operations on his only line of retreat, Sir E. Baring to Earl Granville, Cairo, February 23, a considerable military expedition, consisting of 1 cavalry and 2 infantry brigades, was sent to Suakin. The command was entrusted to General Graham. Troops were hurriedly concentrated. The 10th Hussars, returning from India, were stopped and mounted on the horses of the gendarmerie. With admirable celerity, the force took the field. Within a month of the defeat at Teb, they engaged the enemy almost on the very scene of the disaster. On the 4th of March, they slew 3,000 Hadendoa and drove the rest in disorder from the ground. 4 weeks later, a second action was fought at Tamai. Again, the success of the British troops was complete. Again, the slaughter of the Arabs was enormous. But neither victory was bloodless. El Teb cost 24 officers and 168 men. Tamai, 13 officers and 208 men. The effect of these operations was the dispersal of Osman Digna's gathering. That astute man, not for the first or last time, made a good retreat. 10,000 men had thus been killed in the space of 3 months in the eastern Sudan. By the discipline of their armies, the government were triumphant. The tribes of the Red Sea shore cowered before them. But as they fought without reason, so they conquered without profit. As soon as Gordon had finally refused the assistance of Zubair Pasha, it was evident that the rescue of the garrisons was impossible. The general had been sent as the last hope. Rightly or wrongly, his recommendations were ignored. His mission was an admitted failure. After that, the only question was how to bring him away as quickly as possible. It was certain that he would not come willingly. Force was necessary, yet it was difficult to know how to apply it. After the victories in the eastern Sudan, the opportunity presented itself. The road was open. The local tribes were crushed. Berber had not then fallen. The Mahdi was himself still on the road from El Obeid to Khartoum. Sir Evelyn Baring saw the chance. He did not then occupy the formidable and imposing position in Egyptian politics that he has since attained. But with all his influence, he urged the dispatch of a small flying column to Khartoum. His idea was simple. 1,000 or 1,200 men were to mount on camels and ride thither via Berber. Those who fell ill or whose camels broke down would have to take their chance by the roadside. The plan, however, broke down in the military detail. Only one honorable course remained, a regular expedition. This the British agent at once began to urge. This the government obstinately refused to admit, and meanwhile time was passing. The situation at Khartoum became grave even before the breach between General Gordon and Mr. Gladstone's cabinet was complete. While the British government was indulging in vengeful operations in the eastern Sudan, the Mahdi advanced slowly but steadily upon the town with a following variously estimated at from 15 to 20,000 men. On the 7th of March, Colonel Stewart telegraphed from Khartoum. The Mahdi has attempted to raise the people of Shendi by an emissary. We may be cut off. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart to Sir E. Baring, March 7, 1884. And on the 11th, Gordon himself reported, the rebels are 4 hours distant on the Blue Nile. That one man, soldiers of inferior race, and by his courage has sustained the hearts of 30,000 inhabitants of notorious timidity. Have offered vigorous resistance to the increasing attacks of an enemy who, though cruel, would yet accept surrender. During a period of 317 days, he is an event perhaps without parallel in history. But it may safely be predicted that no one will ever write an account which will compare in interest or in detail with that set forth by the man himself in the famous Journals and Cartoon. The brief account has delighted thousands of readers in Europe and America. Perhaps it is because he is careless of the sympathy of men that Charles Gordon so readily wins it. Before the first of the 6 parts into which the journals were divided is finished, the reader has been won. Henceforth he sees the world through Gordon's eyes, with the empty scoffs at the diplomatists, despises the government, becomes impatient, unreasonably perhaps, with a certain Major Kitchener in the intelligence branch, whose information miscarried or was not dispatched. He is wearied by the impracticable Shaiga irregulars, takes interest in the turkey cock whose terrible 4 wives, laughs at the black sluts seeing their faces for the first time in the mirror, with the unawareness for the fate of the poor little beast, the Husseiniya, when she drifts stern foremost on the shoal, a penny steamer under cannon fire. Day after day he gazes through the general's powerful telescope from the palace roof, down the long brown reaches of the river towards the rocks of the Shaluka Gorge, and longs for some sign of the relieving steamers. And when the end of the account is reached, no man of British birth can read the last words. Now mark this, if the expeditionary force, asked for no more than 200 men, does not come within 10 days, the town may fall. I have done my best for the honor without being frilled with vain regrets and futile resolutions. And then the account stops short, nor will the silence ever be broken. The 6th installment of the journals was dispatched on the 14th of December, and when it is finished, the reader, separated suddenly from the pleasant companionship, experiences a feeling of loss and annoyance. The imagination, long supported, is brushed aside by stern reality. Henceforward, Gordon's perils were unrecorded. End of part 1 of chapter 2. Chapter 2, part 2 of The River War. First, he had struggled vainly against the rebellion. He had fought numerous engagements with very success. He had been several times wounded. Throughout his province and even beyond its limits, he bore the reputation of a brave and capable soldier. The story of his life, written by himself, is widely known, and he is thought by those who have read it to be a man of feeling and of honor. By those who enjoy his personal acquaintance, this belief is unhesitatingly confirmed. He had, however, committed an act which deprived him of Gordon's sympathy and respect. During the fighting in Darfur, after several defeats, his Mohammedan soldiers were discouraged and attributed their evil fortune to the fact that their commander was an infidel under the curse of the Almighty. Sladden therefore proclaimed himself a follower of the Prophet, and outwardly at least adopted the faith of Islam. The troops, delighted at his conversion and cheered by the hope of success, renewed their efforts, and the resistance of the Greeks
fuck y'all up. I don't know what happened with him, but he better find it.
The Arab leaders, who admired his courage, respect and kindness. And he was conducted to the Mahdi in his encampment before Tarshish. There, during the siege, he remained.
Somebody in there putting in the seat.
He wrote letters to Gordon explaining his surrender,
Zulu descended.
that he might be allowed to find the 12 years of danger and degradation that lay before this man, who refused their compassion. Gordon was inflexible. Before the arrival of the letters, his allusions to Sladden are contemptuous. One cannot help being amused at the Mahdi carrying all the Europeans about with him. Nuns, priests, Greeks, Austrian officers. What a medley! A regular état-major from the Journals and Cartoon. He is suspicious of the circumstances of his surrender. The Greek says Sladden had 4,000 ardems of Dura, 1,500 cows, and plenty of ammunition. He had been given 8 horses by the Mahdi. He will not vouch for such a man, but he adds with characteristic justice, all this information must be taken with reserve. At length, the letters came. At the peril of his life, when ordered to write the demand of surrender of the town, Sladden substituted an appeal to Gordon to countenance his escape. This is the uncompromising minute in the journals. October 16, the letters of Sladden have arrived. I have no remarks to make on them. Cannot make out why he wrote them.
The call wasn't a bad in my strength.
He is evidently not a Spartan. He will want some quarantine. I feel sorry for him. The next day, he is again inexorable and gives his reasons clearly. I shall have nothing to do with Sladden's coming here to stay, unless he has the Mahdi's positive, which he is not likely to get. His doing so, the struggle is protracted. Men can only be persuaded to accept evil things by the lively realization of the fact that greater terrors await. The ugly truth is revealed that fear is the foundation of obedience. It is certain that the influence of General Gordon upon the garrison townspeople of Khartoum owed its greatest strength to that sinister element. It is quite painful, he writes in his journals in September, to see men tremble so when they come and see me, that they cannot hold a match to their cigarette. Yet, he employed all other methods of inspiring their efforts. As the winter drew on, the sufferings of the besieged increased, and their faith in their commander and his promises of relief diminished. To preserve their hopes, and by their hopes their courage and loyalty, was beyond the power of man. But what a great man in the utmost exercise of his faculties and authority might do, Gordon did. His extraordinary spirit never burned more brightly than in these last gloomy days. The money to pay the troops was exhausted. He issued notes, signing them with his own name. The citizens groaned under the triple scourge of scarcity, disease, and war. He ordered the bands to play merrily and discharged rockets. It was said that they were abandoned, that help would never come, that the expedition was a myth, the lie of a general who was disavowed by his government. Forthwith he placarded the walls with the news of victories, not the advance of a triumphant British army, or hired all the best houses by the river's bank for the accommodation of the officers of the relieving force. A dervish shell crashed to his palace. He ordered the date of its arrival to be inscribed above the whole. For those who served him faithfully, he struck medals and presented them with pomp and circumstance. Others less laudable, he shot. And by all these means and expedients, the defense of the city was prolonged through the summer, autumn, and winter of 1884, and on into the year 1885. All this time, the public anxiety in England had been steadily growing. If Gordon was abandoned, he was by no means forgotten. As his mission had been followed with intense interest throughout the whole country, so its failure had caused general despondency. Disappointment soon gave place to alarm. The subject of the personal safety of the distinguished envoy was first raised in the House of Commons on the 16th of March by Lord Randolph Churchill. Availing himself of the opportunities provided by supply, he criticized the vacillating policy of the government, their purposeless slaughter in the eastern Sudan, and their failure to establish the Suakin Berber route. He proceeded to draw attention to the perilous position of General Gordon at Khartoum. Colonel Kurtigan has stated that Khartoum may be easily captured. We know that General Gordon is surrounded by hostile tribes and cut off from communications with Cairo and London. And under these circumstances, the House has a right to ask Her Majesty's government whether they are going to do
See, I'm
anything to
gonna
relieve
fuck
him.
you
Are they
up.
going to remain indifferent to the fate of the one man on whom they have counted to extricate them from their dilemmas, to leave him to shift for himself and not make a single effort on his behalf? From Hansard's parliamentary
I'm
debates,
gonna
March
fuck
16,
you up.
the government remained impassive. Lord E. Fitzmaurice made some sort of reply, and there were ministerial cheers, but the subject once raised was not allowed to drop. Inspired and animated by the earnest energy of a young man, the opposition were continually growing stronger. The conduct of Egyptian affairs afforded ample opportunity for criticism and attack. All through the summer months and almost every night, ministers were invited to declare whether they would rescue their envoy or leave him to his fate. Mr. Gladstone returned evasive answers. The Conservative press took the cue. The agitation became intense. Even among the supporters of the government there was dissatisfaction, but the Prime Minister was obdurate and unflinching. At length, at the end of the session, the whole matter was brought forward in the gravest and most formal way by the moving of a vote of censure. The debate that followed Sir Michael Hicks' Beech's motion was long and acrimonious. Mr. Gladstone's speech only increased the disquietude of his followers and the fury of the opposition. Mr. Forster openly declared his disagreement with his leader, and although Lord Hartington, in winding up the debate, threw out some hopes of an expedition in the autumn, the government majority fell on the division to 28. And after the prorogation, the controversy was carried on with undiminished vigor outside the walls of Parliament, and the clamour in the country grew louder and louder. It is usual to look upon as dictated by benevolent weakness. History may take another view. Strong and stubborn as Walter was its equal. If Gordon was the better man, Gladstone was incomparably the greater. It was easy for the First Minister of the Crown to dispatch an expedition against savages. He was accustomed to the exercise of power. Compared with the resources of the empire, the enterprise was insignificant. Few men have feared responsibility less than Gladstone. On the other hand, the expressed desire of the nation was a force to which he had always bowed, to which indeed he owed his political existence. Yet, in spite of the growing agitation throughout the land, he remained stern and silent. Most men do what is right, or what they persuade themselves is right. Nor is it difficult to believe that Mr. Gladstone did not feel justified in involving the nation in operations in the heart of the Sudan for the purpose not of saving the life of the envoy, for Gordon had but to embark on his steamers and come home, but simply in order to vindicate the personal honor of a man. And it is possible that a feeling of resentment against the officer, whose intractable nature was bringing such odium upon him, may have colored his resolution with a darker tinge. But for all his power and influence, he was forced to give way. The government, which had long ignored the call of honor abroad, was driven to the Sudan by cries of shame. Lord Hartington, at that time Secretary of State for War, must be dissociated from the general censure which his principal colleagues had incurred. He was the first to recognize the obligation which lay upon the cabinet, and through the cabinet,
Everything
upon the
wrong
nation.
for him.
It was to his
Because
hands that
of
the
you.
dispatch of the
Thank
relieving
you.
expedition was mainly due.
I like that.
Commander-in-Chief and Adjutant General, who were fully alive to the critical position
Teamwork.
in Khartoum, added their recommendations. But even at the last moment,
But
Mr.
I don't
Gladstone
like
was
this
induced to
shit
sanction
for
the
your
advance
kids
only by the
because
belief
you're
that
gonna
the
get
scale of the
fucked up.
operations would be small, and that only a single brigade would be necessary. The decision was taken forthwith by the ministry and announced to the nation. The Adjutant General, however, asked for a very different course than what the government had anticipated, and the single brigade was expanded into an expedition of 10,000 men, selected from the whole army.
10,000.
Reverse the decision was now however,
10.
impossible, and the Gordon Relief Expedition began. The commander to whom the conduct of the operations had been entrusted reviewed the
Strength
situation.
card.
He saw himself confronted with a
Sword.
task which was easy and safe if it were undertaken
Easy
with pleasure,
and
and it was
safe.
doubtful and perilous if it done in haste. All the fruits of a long and successful career were set on the result, and it is scarcely wonderful that he declined to be swift and reckless. Shrewdly estimating the military difficulties, he made his plans for a methodical and deliberate advance, which would leave nothing to luck, and which resembles in character that afterwards carried out by Sir H. Kitchener. He
Working on
excluded the idea
what?
of a wild, glorious rush which might result in astonishing success or terrible disaster. Troops and stores were steadily collected at Wadi Haifa and along the Nile. The new Camel Corps, consisting of 4 regiments, practiced their drills and evolutions. To pipe the boats up the cataracts,
Drills.
voyageurs were brought from Canada. At length, when all preparations were complete, the expedition started. The plan was simple.
Building
A small
tower.
column of infantry and boats was to work up the river. In case that should not arrive in time, the Camel Corps was to strike across the Bayuda Desert from Korti to Metema. Having arrived there, a small detachment was to be thrown into Khartoum by Gordon's
Small
steamers to sustain the defense until the arrival of the main
detachment,
body in March or even April of 1885, when the town could be regularly relieved. The dramatic character of the enterprise and its picturesque and original
Small.
features fascinated the nation, and the advance was watched with breathless
Fascinated.
interest. The fortunes of the river
Fascinated.
have been graphically described by one who played no small part in the campaign.
Fascinated.
The campaign of the cataracts by William Butler is a record of hard and unceasing toil. Day upon day, the lines of soldiers all on the tow ropes or pulled at the oars of the broad-bottomed boats. Night after night they camped on the banks amid the grim desolation of the Montesir
Double
Desert.
gump shrimp.
Yet their monotonous labors were encouraged by the knowledge that as soon as the
Finna go to
benefit
jail
of
by
the
bubble,
Alabama was
bitch.
reached, the strong north
They
wind
finna go to
carried the
motherfucking jail,
and it seemed
bitch.
a strange and bitter irony that the order to turn back and the
Mhm.
news that all had
Strange,
been
bitter
made was
bitches.
announced to the troops on the very day when they
Bitter
cleared the
bum.
cataracts.
Shout out
They
to
were forwarded
you,
5 times to
Tara. I
Fort
think
Smith.
that's her name.
The Desert Column started from Korti on the 30th of December. Their strength did not exceed 1,100 officers and men, but they were the flower of the army. Dropping their communications, they set forth along the
Butterfly.
caravan route towards Metema. The knowledge which we have since gained of the resources of the Monists enables the
Who
peril of
with
their
the
desperate
horn?
nature to be fully
Back it
appreciated.
on up.
Although the dervishes were neither so well armed nor
Back
trained
it
as the military, they
up.
were nearly as numerous and equal
Right
to avoid
now.
fear. Their
City
tactics were
bus.
in accordance with modern conditions. Their fanaticism
Thank
was
you,
satisfactory.
Joe.
The British force, on the other hand, was equipped with weapons scarcely comparable with those employed in
Scarcely.
concluding campaigns.
Ain't
Instead of the
gonna
powerful
shit.
Lee Metford
Burden
rifle,
on
with its
the
spotless powder, its magazine
And a
action,
wand.
and its absence of recoil, they were armed with the
Flying
Marquis Henry,
back
which possessed none
here.
of these advantages. In
With
place
my
of the
mind.
Maxim, there was the Gardner gun,
See?
the gun that jammed at Tamai, and that jammed again at Abu Klea. The artillery was also
So
in many
done
respects
stole,
inferior to that of
bitch.
general use. Besides all this, the principles of
Chris
fire
too.
discipline and scientific musketry were new, little understood, and hardly well
Pay me in
Nevertheless, the
gold.
Camel Corps went boldly forward and engaged an enemy whose destruction
Move
ultimately
forward.
required the strength of a better
Please
armed and
move
better
forward,
disciplined
everyone.
12 times as strong. On the 3rd of January, they reached
Still in my
Abu Klea.
tarot
100
business.
miles of their march was accomplished. But they were
Yeah,
now delayed by the
bitch.
necessity of
9
escorting
of
a second column
Pentacles.
of
I
supplies
want
to
my
Glasgow.
shit.
And after that,
Thank
until
you.
the arrival of reinforcements which raised their strength to 1,800
Of
more.
course.
The interval was employed in building 2 small forts and establishing an
This
advanced
is
depot.
Pentacles.
Nor was it until the 13th that the march was
Hangman.
resumed. The number of camels was not sufficient for the necessities of the transport.
Not
Some of the
sufficient.
camels was too poor for the work they had to perform. On
What?
the 16th, however, they had made 50 miles and approached the wells of Abu Qir.
50
Here, the
miles.
advance was disputed by the enemy.
5
News
change.
of the advance of the desert column had been duly reported.
Back
to
it
Ryan
up, back
and
it up.
a small party
Wreck
of
it,
the
wreck the
with
car,
camels
wreck
and
that
camels
Honda
had been
truck
to the
that's
rescue of the
burgundy.
Persian city. Their numbers
Wreck
were
that
few,
Honda
scarce
truck
2,000.
now.
How should they hope to prevail against the
Acura
expected
truck,
army
wreck
and the
that
conquering peace
burglary,
army of square
Acura
pegs?
truck.
They were
Crash and
yet they
burn
should die. Not one should escape.
by fire
The
and
late
force.
advance offered ample opportunity.
Name
Great
the
forces
King
there
Jehovah
resisted.
Jireh.
Slatton relates how several
Archangel
thousand men
Michael.
with important hinders were detached from the
Them
army of Khartoum
ancestors.
and marched northward eager for the
Hunt
slaughter of
'em
the enemy's
down.
God. At Matema, the main strength of the Jailan tribe was
These little
selected.
ones.
With reinforcements from
Loving
Abu, the total force of the Arabs actually at hand was not less
Crash
than
and
10,000,
burn, yeah.
and behind were many thousands more. They
Behind.
permitted the little column to advance until their retreat, if defeated, was
Mhm.
impossible. And then, confident of victory, offered battle near the wells of Abu Klea. The
Mhm.
Camel Corps remained halted during the morning of the 16th,
Come
and built a small
around
fort
here.
in which they placed their reserve of stores and made some arrangement for the reception of wounded. At 1 o'clock, they moved leisurely forward, passed through the rocky defile which led into the bay of Abu Klea, and bivouacked. Early the next morning, the force moved out in square formation and advanced upon the enemy. The most savage and bloody act ever fought in the Sudan by British troops followed.
Queen.
Notwithstanding the numbers and the valor of the Arabs, that they penetrated the square, and that they inflicted on the troops a loss of 9 officers and 65 men killed, and 9 officers and 85 men wounded, 10% of the entire force. They were driven from the field with great slaughter, and the desert column camped at the
Slaughter.
wells. On the morning of the 18th, they rested,
Mhm.
placed their wounded in the small fort they had built, and buried their dead.
18.
In the afternoon, they
Day.
continued their advance, marched all through the
What
night.
is
and
that? The
120 miles,
19th.
all
Oh,
the
y'all
way almost
rested,
within sight of the
bitch.
river at daylight on the 19th.
Y'all
Meanwhile, the
rested.
enemy had
They
gained
like
great strength, and an
19.
effective rifle fire was opened on the column. Sir Herbert Stewart received the wound of which a few
Ain't
weeks
that
later he
some
died.
shit?
The command devolved upon Sir Charles Wilson. The position was desperate. Water
Oh,
was running short. The Nile was only 4 miles away, but the column was impeded by their wounded and stores, and between the river and the thirsty men lay the
Wounded.
Turkish army, infuriated by their losses, and fully aware of the sore strength to which their astonishing enemy was now reduced. It now became necessary to divide the small force.
Okay.
Some must remain to guard the
Necessary.
baggage and the wounded. The others must fight their way to the water.
They
3
must.
o'clock in the afternoon of the
Wade
19th,
in the
900
water,
men hastily
children.
made Sariba and marched towards the river.
Sariba.
Without their camels or those of the transport, they
Without
appeared
the
insignificant, a mere
candles.
speck on the broad plain of Matema. The dervishes hastened to clinch the matter. The square advances slowly and painfully over the stony ground, with frequent jerky halts to preserve order and to pick up the wounded. Little puffs of white smoke dot the distant sandhills. Here and there a gaudy flag waves defiantly. In front, the green tops of the palm trees by the Nile tantalize, but stimulate the soldiers. On the left, the great mud labyrinth of Matema stretches indefinitely. Suddenly, it finally stops. The low square in front is aligned with the swarming figures of the enemy. All the flags dance forward together. Ragged white figures stand up in hundreds. Emirs on horses, as if by magic. Everywhere are men
By
running swiftly forward,
magic.
waving their spears and calling upon the prophet of God to speed their enemies.
Prophet of
The square
God.
halts. The weary men begin to fire with thoughtful care. The dervishes
Thoughtful
drop thickly.
care.
On then, children of the desert. You are so many,
Children
they are
of
so
the
few. They are
desert.
worn with fatigue, and their throats are parched.
In
You have come
exile.
deeply of the Nile. One rush will trample the accursed under the feet of the
Children
faithful.
of the Nile, brother.
A bugle sounds in the waiting square. The
Mm.
fire stops. What is this? They lose heart. Their ammunition is exhausted. On then, and make ahead. Again, the smoke ripples along the line of bayonets, and fire is reopened, this time at closer range and with far greater effect. The stubborn grandeur of the British soldier is displayed by desperate circumstances. The men shoot to hit. The attack crumbles. The emirs, force of man, collapse.
That ain't even
The
gonna
others
put
turn
on
and
the
walk.
picture
They will
news.
not
I
move.
wouldn't give a
Suddenly back
fuck.
towards the town.
Bitch, I know that
The square
shit
starts
fucking
forward.
up over
The road to the
there.
river is open. With dusk, the water is
Yeah, it
reached,
is.
and never have victors gained a more longed for prize.
Part
The
the
Nile is
Red
won.
Sea.
Gordon
Name
remains.
of King
Sir
Jehovah.
Charles Wilson, having collected his force, remained 3 days by the bank of the Nile before
Let
attempting
my
any further
people
advance
go.
on Khartoum. He has explained why this delay was necessary,
Archangel
to the
Michael.
satisfaction of most military critics. Nor is it easy to believe that men who have made such splendid efforts would have willingly lost a single moment. On the 4th day, he embarked on 2 of Gordon's steamers, which awaited the relieving column, and taking with him 20 British soldiers and a few bluejackets, set forth towards the Shavlupa Gorge and the town that lay beyond. On the 27th of January, the rescuers came in sight of Khartoum and under the fire of the enemy. Many of their perilous adventures seemed to belong to romance rather than to reality. The tiny gimcrack boats, struggling with the strong stream of the cataract, running the gauntlet of the Arab guns, dropping disconsolately down the river with their terrible news, or wrecked and stranded on the sandbank. Stuart Wortley rowing to the camp before Matema for help. Beresford starting in the remaining steamer, the bursting of the boiler by a dervish shell. Benbow mending it in a single day. Wilson's rescue, and the return to the entrenchment at Gubat. But the scene that appeals to the imagination above all the others is that where, with banks ablaze with musketry and artillery, the black smoke pouring through the shot holes and the funnels, the water rising in spurts from the bullets, the men who had come so far and braved so much stared at the palace roof, and, seeing no flag flying, knew that all was over, and that they had come too late. The news of the dervish defeats at Abu Klea and Abu Kru impelled the Mahdi to a desperate venture. The English were but 120 miles away. They were few, but victorious. It was difficult to say what force could stop such men. In spite of the wrath of the true God and the valor of Islam, they might prevail. The Mahdi depended on success for existence. The tremendous forces of fanaticism are exerted only in a forward direction. Retreat meant ruin. All must be staked on an immediate assault. And, besides, the moment was ripe. Thus the Arab chiefs reasoned, and wisely resolved to be reckless. Thus he carried out his schemes. He invited his own tribe, the Taisha section of the Baggara Arabs, to come and live in Omdurman. Come, he wrote in numerous letters to them, and take possession of the lands which the Lord your God has given you. Allured by the hopes of wealth and wives and the promise of power, the savage herdsmen came to the number of 7,000 warriors. Their path was made smooth and easy. Granaries were erected along the route. Steamers and sailing vessels awaited on the Nile. Arrived at the capital, all were newly clothed at the expense of the state. An entire district of the city was forcibly cleared of its inhabitants for the accommodation of the strangers. What the generosity of the Khalifa forgot or refused, the predatory habits of his clansmen procured, and they robbed, plundered, and swindled with all the arrogance and impunity of royal favorites. The populace of the city returned a bitter hatred for these injuries, and the Khalifa's object was attained. He had created a class in Omdurman who were indissolubly attached to him. Like him, they were detested by the local tribes. Like him, they were foreigners in the land. But, like him, they were fierce and brave and strong. His dangers, his enemies, his interests were their own. Their lives depended on their loyalty. Here was the motor muscle which animated the rest. The Taisha Bagara controlled the Black Jihadiya, once the irregular troops of the Egyptians, now become
Life
the regulars of
depended
the
on your
Khalifa.
loyalty.
The Black Jihadiya overawed the Arab army in the capital. The army in the capital dominated the forces in the provinces. The forces in the provinces subdued the inhabitants. The centralization of power was assured by the concentration of military material. Cannon, rifles, stores of ammunition, all the necessities of war were accumulated in the arsenal. Only the armies on the frontiers, the Taisha tribe, and the Khalifa's personal bodyguard habitually carried firearms and cartridges. The enormous population of Omdurman was forced to be content with spears and swords. Rifles were issued to the Sudanese whenever safe and necessary, cartridges only when they were about to be used. Thus, several millions of warlike and savage people, owning scarcely any law but that of might, and scattered about a vast roadless territory, were brought into the firm grip of a single man. The third principle of government which the Khalifa was compelled, or inclined, to adopt was to keep the relative power of the various tribes and classes conveniently proportionate. If an emir rose to great influence and wealth, he became a possible rival, and suffered forthwith death, imprisonment, or spoliation. If a tribe threatened the supremacy of the Taisha, it was struck down while its menace was yet immense. The regulation of classes and tribes was a far more complicated affair than the adjustment of individuals. Yet for 13 years the Khalifa held the balance, and held it exact until the very end. Such was the statecraft of a savage from Kordofan. His greatest triumph was the Abyssinian War. It is not likely that two great barbaric kingdoms living side by side, but differing in race and religion, will long continue in peace, nor was it difficult to discover a cause of the quarrel between the dervishes and the Abyssinians. Time of harassing and desultory warfare disturbed the border. At length in 1885, a dervish, half-traitor, half-brigand, sacked an Abyssinian church. Bas Adal, the governor of the Amhara province, demanded that this sacrilegious robber should be surrendered to justice. The Arabs haughtily refused. The response was swift. Collecting an army which may have amounted to 30,000 men, the Abyssinians invaded the district of Galabat and marched on the town. Against this host, the Emir Wad Arbab could muster no more than 6,000 soldiers. But, encouraged by the victories of the previous 4 years, the dervishes accepted battle, in spite of the disparity of numbers. Neither valor nor discipline could withstand such odds. The Moslems, broken by the fierce onset, and surrounded by the overwhelming numbers of their enemies, were destroyed, together with their intrepid leader. Scarcely any escaped. The Abyssinians indulged in all the triumphs of savagery. The wounded were massacred, the slain were mutilated, the town of Galabat was sacked and burnt, the women were carried into captivity. All these tidings came to Omdurman. Under this heavy and unexpected blow, the Khalifa acted with prudence. He opened negotiations with King John of Abyssinia for the ransom of the captured wives and children, and at the same time he sent the Emir Yunus with a large force to Galabat. The immediate necessities having thus been dealt with, Abdullah prepared for revenge. All the Arab leaders which 15 years of continual war and tumult throughout the Sudan produced, none displayed higher ability, none obtained greater successes, and none were more honorable, though several were more famous, than the man whom the Khalifa selected to avenge the destruction of the Galabat army. Abu Anga had been a slave in Abdullah's family long before the Mahdi had preached at Abba Island, and while Egypt yet oppressed the country. After the revolt had broken out, his adventurous master summoned him from the distant Kordofan home to attend him in the war, and Abu Anga came with that ready obedience and strange devotion for which he was always distinguished. Nominally as a slave, as a comrade, he fought by Abdullah's side in all the earlier battles of the rebellion. Nor was it until after the capture of El Obeid that he rose suddenly to power and place. The Khalifa was a judge of men. He saw very clearly that the Black Sudanese troops, who had surrendered and were surrendering as town after town was taken, might be welded into a powerful weapon. And in Abu Anga, he knew a man who could not only fashion the blade, but would hold it ever loyally at his master's disposal. The former slave threw himself into the duties of his command with extraordinary energy. His humble origin pleased the hardy blacks, who recognized in their leader their equal in birth, their superior in prowess. More than any other emir, Abu Anga contributed to the destruction of Hicks's army. The Jihadiya, as his soldiers were called, because they had joined in the Jihad, or Holy War, were armed with Remington rifles, and their harassing fire inflicted heavy losses on the struggling column until it was finally brought to a standstill, and the moment for the spearmen to charge arrived. Henceforward, the troops of Abu Anga became famous throughout the land for their weapons, their courage, and their cruelty. Their numbers at first did not exceed 5,000, but as more towns were taken and more soldiers, they increased, until at one time they reached a formidable total of 15,000 men. During the siege of Khartoum, the Black Riflemen distinguished themselves by the capture of Omdurman fort, but their violent natures and predatory instincts made them an undesirable garrison even for the Dervish capital, and they were dispatched under their general to Kordofan, where they increased their reputation by a series of bloody fights with the Nubas, an aboriginal mountain people who cared for nothing but their independence. At the end of June, Abu Anga reached Omdurman with an army variously estimated at from 22,000 to 31,000 men, of whom at least 10,000 were armed with Remington rifles. The Khalifa received him with the utmost honor. After a private interview, which lasted for several hours, a formal entry into the town was arranged. At daybreak on the following morning, the whole force marched into the city and camped along the northern suburbs, applauded and welcomed alike by the population and their ruler. A few days after this, a great review was held under the Kareri Hills, on the very ground where the Dervish Empire was doomed to be shattered. But the faithful place oppressed the Khalifa with no forebodings. He exulted in his power, and well he might, for after the cannon had thundered indefinite salutes, no fewer than 100,000 armed men defiled to the music of the war drums and the Ambias before the famous Black Flag. The spectacle of the enormous numbers provoked their enthusiasm. The triumphant Khalifa was cheered by his mighty host, who pressed upon him in their exuberant loyalty until he was almost crushed. It was indeed a stirring scene. The whole plain was filled with a throng. Banners of every hue and shape waved gaily in the breeze, and the sunlight glinted from innumerable spear points. The swarming dervishes displayed their bright party-colored jivas. The wild Bagara cavalry circled on the flanks of the array. The brown dome of the Mahdi's tomb, rising above the city, seemed to assure the warriors of supernatural aid. Abdullah was at the summit of his power. The movement initiated by the priest of Abba Island had attained its climax. Behind, in the plain, the frowning rocks of Surgham Hill rose ragged and gloomy, as if their silence guarded the secrets of the future. After the feast of Bayram had been celebrated on a gigantic scale, Abu Anga was dispatched to Galabat with his army and considerable reinforcements from the troops in Omdurman, and it became evident that war with Abyssinia was imminent. The great leader relieved the Emir Yunus, much to the latter's disgust, of the chief command, and since the strong Galabat garrison was added to his own force, Abu Anga was able to take the field at the head of 15,000 riflemen and 45,000 spearmen. The Khalifa had embarked on a great venture in planning the invasion of Abyssinia. The vast strength of the Negus was known to the dervishes and has since been proved to the world. The Mahdi had forbidden such a war. An ill-omened prophecy further declared that the king of Abyssinia had his horse to a solitary tree by Khartoum, while his cavalry should ride through the city, fetlock deep in blood. But Abdullah feared neither God nor man. He reviewed the political situation, and determined at all risks to maintain his frontiers inviolate. His emir Wad Arbab had been killed. Blood must settle the matter. The Abyssinians had not watched the extensive hostile preparations apathetically. Ras Sadal had collected an army which in numbers actually exceeded that of the dervishes, but the latter were far superior in rifles, and the black infantry were of invincible valor. Nevertheless, confident in his strength and relying on his powerful cavalry, the Abyssinian general allowed the Arabs to toil through all the mountainous country, to traverse the Mintik Pass, and to debouch unmolested on the plain of Debre Sin. Abu Anga neglected no precaution. He knew that since he must fight in the heart of Abyssinia, with the mountains behind him, a defeat would involve annihilation. He drew up his army swiftly and with skill. Then the Abyssinians attacked. The rifle fire of the Sudanese repulsed them. The onset was renewed with desperate gallantry. It was resisted with equal valor and superior weapons. After frightful losses, the Abyssinians wavered, and the wise Arab seized the moment for a counterstroke. In spite of the devotion of his cavalry, Ras Adal was driven from the field. Great numbers of his army were drowned in the river in front of which he had recklessly elected to fight. His camp was captured, and the valuable spoil rewarded the victors, who also gratified their passions with a wholesale slaughter of the wounded, a practice commonly followed by savages. The effect of the victory was great. The whole of the Amhara province submitted to the invaders, and in the spring of 1887, Abu Anga was able to advance without further fighting to the capture and sack of Gondar, the ancient capital of Abyssinia. Meanwhile, the Khalifa had been anxiously expecting tidings of his army. The long silence of 30 days which followed their plunge into the mountains filled him with fear, and Orwalder relates that he aged visibly during that period. But his judgment was proved by the event, and the arrival of a selected assortment of heads turned doubt to triumph. The dervishes did not long remain in Abyssinia, as they suffered from the climate. In December, the army returned to Galabat, which they commenced to fortify, and their victorious general followed his grisly but convincing dispatch to Omdurman, where he received the usual welcome accorded by warlike peoples to military heroes. But the famous and faithful slave may have been more gratified by the tears of joy which his master and sovereign shed on beholding him again safe and successful. The greater struggle was still to come. The whole of Abyssinia was convulsed with fury, and King John in person prepared to take the field and settle the quarrel forever. He assembled a mighty host, which is said to have amounted to 130,000 foot and 20,000 horsemen. The rumors of this formidable concentration reached Galabat and Omdurman, and in spite of the recent victory caused deep alarm. The Khalifa saw his frontiers, even his existence, menaced, for King John had declared that he would sweep the dervishes from off the face of the earth, and in the hour of need, the general on whom so much depended died of some poisonous medicine with which he had endeavored to cure himself of indigestion. Abu Anga was buried in his red brick house at Galabat, amid the lamentations of his brave black soldiers, and gloom pervaded the whole army. But since the enemy were approaching, the danger had to be faced. The Khalifa appointed Seki Tumal, one of Anga's lieutenants, to the command of the forces at Galabat, which by strenuous exertions he brought up to a total of 85,000 men. King John sent word that he was coming, lest any should say that he had come secretly as a thief. The dervishes resolved to remain on the defensive, and fortifying themselves in an enormous zariba around the town, awaited the onslaught. At dawn, on the 9th of March, 1889, the Abyssinians came within sight of their enemies, and early the next morning the battle began. Great clouds of dust obscured the scene, and all intelligible sounds were lost in the appalling din. The Abyssinians, undaunted by the rifle fire of the Sudanese, succeeded in setting the zariba alight. Then, concentrating all their force on one part of the defense, they burst into the enclosure in town. The division of Wad Ali, a fourth part of the entire Dervish army, which bore the brunt of this attack, was almost completely destroyed. The interior of the zariba was crowded with women and children, who were ruthlessly butchered by the exultant Abyssinians. The assailants scattered in all directions in search of plunder, and they even had time to begin to disinter the body of Abu Anga, which they were eager to insult in revenge for Gondar. The dervishes already wavered, their ammunition began to fail, when suddenly a rumor spread about among the Abyssinians that the king was killed. Seizing what booty they could snatch, the victorious army began a general retreat, and the zariba was soon cleared. The Arabs were too exhausted to pursue, but when on the following day the attack was not renewed, they learned to their surprise that they were the victors, and that their enemy was falling back towards the Akbar River. Zeki Tumal resolved to pursue, and his army were further incited to the chase by the fact that the Abyssinians brought with them a large number of dervish women, including the harem of the late beloved Abu Anga. 2 days after the battle, the dervishes overtook the enemy's rear guard, and, surprising their camp, inflicted severe loss and captured much booty. The temporary Nagus who had been appointed to fill the vacancy caused by the death of King John was among the killed. The body of that courageous monarch fell into the hands of the dervishes, who struck off the head and sent it, a tangible proof of victory, to Omdurman. The Abyssinians, still formidable, made good their retreat, nor did Zeki Tumal venture to follow into the mountains. Internal difficulties within his dominions prevented the new Nagus from resuming the offensive, and thus the Dervish-Abyssinian war dwindled down to, as it had arisen out of, frontier raids. The arrival in Omdurman of King John's head intoxicated the Khalifa with joy. Abyssinia was regarded throughout the Sudan as a far greater power than Egypt, and here was its mighty ruler, slain and decapitated. But the victory had been dearly purchased. The two great battles had been fought with indescribable ferocity by both sides, and the slaughter was appalling. No reliable statistics are available, but it may be reasonably asserted that neither side sustained a loss in killed during the war of fewer than 15,000 fighting men. The flower of the Dervish army, the heroic blacks of Abu Anga, were almost destroyed. The Khalifa had won a Pyrrhic triumph. Never again was he able to put so great a force in the field. And although the army which was shattered at Omdurman was better armed and better drilled, it was less formidable than that which broke the might of Abyssinia. During the progress of the struggle with Abyssinia, the war against Egypt languished. The Mahdi, counting upon the support of the population, had always declared that he would free the Delta from the Turks, and was already planning its invasion when he and his schemes were interrupted by death. His successor inherited all the quarrel, but not all the power. Much of Muhammad Ahmad's influence died with him. Alive, he might conquer the Muslim world. Dead, he was only a saint. All fanatical feeling in Egypt soon subsided. Nevertheless, the Khalifa persisted in the enterprise. The success of the Abyssinian War encouraged and enabled him to resume the offensive on his northern frontier, and he immediately ordered Wad el-Najumi, who commanded in Dongola, to march with his scanty force to the invasion of Egypt. The mad enterprise ended, as might have been foreseen, in the destruction of both emir and army at Toski. The Khalifa received the news with apparent grief, but it is difficult to avoid suspecting him of dark schemes. He was far too clever to believe that Egypt could be conquered by 5,000 men. He knew that besides the Egyptians there was a strange white tribe of men, the same that had so nearly saved Khartoum. But for the English, he exclaimed on several occasions, I would have conquered Egypt. Yet, knowing of the British occupation, he deliberately sent an army to its inevitable ruin. It is difficult to reconcile such conduct with the character for sagacity and intelligence which Abdullah has deserved. There is no doubt that he wanted to conquer Egypt, possibly by some extraordinary chance. Wad el-Najib might succeed, even with his small force. If so, then the glory of God and the power of the Khalifa would advance together. If not, and herein lies the true reason for the venture. The Ribéry tribes would have received a crippling blow. The terrible slaughter of the Abyssinian War had fallen mainly on the Jihadiyya and the Eastern Arabs. The jealous tribes in the north had not suffered. The balance of power was in need of readjustment. The Jailed and Barabra were fast becoming dangerous. The Junni's army was recruited almost entirely from these sources. The reinforcements sent from Omdurman consisted of men selected from the flag of the Khalifa Sharif, who was growing too powerful, and of the Batahin tribe, who had shown a mutinous spirit from Orwalder 10 years' captivity. The success of such an army in Egypt would be glorious. Its destruction anywhere would be convenient. Whatever Abdullah's motives may have been, his advantage was certain. The life of the empire, thus compelled to prey upon itself, must necessarily be short. Other forces were soon added to the work of exhaustion. The year following the end of the Abyssinian War was marked by a fearful famine. Slatin and Orwalder vied with each other in relating its horrors, men eating the raw entrails of donkeys, mothers devouring their babies, scores dying in the streets, all the more ghastly in the bright sunlight. Hundreds of corpses floating down the Nile. These were among the hideous features. The depopulation caused by the scarcity was even greater than that produced by the fighting. The famine area extended over the whole Sudan and ran along the banks of the river as far as Lower Egypt. The effects of the famine were everywhere appalling. Entire districts between Omdurman and Berber became wholly depopulated. In the salt regions near Shendi, almost all the inhabitants died of hunger. The camel-breeding tribes ate their she-camels. The riverine peoples devoured their seed corn. The population of Galabat, Gedaref, and Kassala was reduced by 9/10, and these once considerable towns shrank to the size of hamlets. Everywhere the deserted mud houses crumbled back into the plain. The frightful mortality, general throughout the whole country, made it gauged by the fact that Seki Tumul's army, which before the famine numbered not fewer than 87,000, could scarcely muster 10,000 men in the spring of 1890. The new harvest came only in time to save the inhabitants of the Sudan from becoming extinct. The remnant were preserved for further misfortunes. War, scarcity, and oppression there had always been, but strange and mysterious troubles began to afflict the tortured tribes. The face of heaven was pitiless or averted. In 1890, innumerable swarms of locusts descended on the impoverished soil. The multitude of their red or yellow bodies veiled the sun and darkened the air, and although their flesh, tasting when roasted like fried shrimps, might afford a delicate meal to the natives, they took so heavy a toll of the crops that the famine was prolonged and scarcity became constant. Since their first appearance, the locusts are said to have returned annually from Orwalder 10 years' captivity. Their destructive efforts were aided by millions of little red mice who destroyed the seeds before they could grow. So vast and immeasurable was the number of these tiny pests that after a heavy rain the whole country was strewn with and almost tinted by the squirrel-colored corpses of the drowned. Yet, in spite of all the strokes of fate, the Khalifa maintained his authority unshaken. The centralization which always occurs in military states was accelerated by the famine. The provincial towns dwindled, thousands and tens of thousands perished, but Omdurman continually grew, and its rulers still directed the energies of a powerful army. Thus, for the present, we might leave the Dervish Empire. Yet the gloomy city of blood, mud, and filth that arose by the confluence of the Niles deserves a final glance while still in the pride of independent barbarism. It is early morning, and the sun, lifting above the horizon, throws the shadows of the Khartoum ruins on the brimful waters of the Nile. The old capital is solitary and deserted. No sound of man breaks the silence of its streets. Only memory broods in the garden where the pashas used to walk, and the courtyard where the imperial envoy fell. Across the river, miles of mud houses, lining the banks as far as Khor Shambat, and stretching back into the desert and towards the dark hills, display the extent of the Arab metropolis. As the sun rises, the city begins to live. Along the road from Kareri, a score of camels pad to market with village produce. The north wind is driving a dozen sailing boats, laden to the water's edge with merchandise, to the wharves. One of Gordon's old steamers lies moored by the bank. Another, worked by the crew that mended in Egyptian days, is threshing up the Blue Nile, sent by the Khalifa to Sennar on some errand of state. Far away to the southward, the dust of a Darfur caravan breaks the clear-cut skyline with a misty blur. The prolonged beating of war drums and loud booming notes of horns chase away the silence of the night. It is Friday, and after the hour of prayer, all grown men must attend the review on the plain without the city. Already the streets are crowded with devout and obedient warriors. Soon the great square of the mosque, for no roof could shelter so many thousand worshippers, is filled with armed men, kneeling in humble supplication to the stern God of Islam and his most holy Mahdi. It is finished. They rise and hurry to the parade. The emirs plant their flags, and all form in the ranks. Woe to the laggard, and let the speedy see that he wear his newest jibbah, and carry a sharp sword and at least 3 spears. Presently the array is complete. A salute of 7 guns is fired, mounted on a fine camel, which is led by a gigantic Nubian, and attended by perhaps 200 horsemen in chain armor. The Khalifa rides on to the ground and along the ranks. It is a good muster. Few have dared absent themselves. Yet his brow is clouded. What has happened? Is there another revolt in the west? Do the Abyssinians threaten Galabat? Have the black troops mutinied? Or is it only some harem quarrel? The parade is over. The troops march back to the arsenal. The rifles are collected, and the warriors disperse to their homes. Many hurry to the marketplace to make purchases, to hear the latest rumor, or to watch the executions, usually executions. Others stroll to the Sir El Rekik and criticize the points of the slave girls as the dealers offer them for sale. But the Khalifa has returned to his house, and his council has been summoned. The room is small, and the ruler sits cross-legged upon his couch. Before him squat the emirs and qadis. Yaqub is there, with Ali Wad Hilu and the Khalifa Sharif. Only the Sheikh Ed Din is absent, for he is a dissolute youth, and much given to drinking. Abdullah is grave and anxious. A messenger has come from the north. The Turks are on the move. Advancing beyond their frontier, they have established themselves at Akasha. Wad Bishara fears lest they may attack the faithful who hold Firkat. In itself, this is but a small matter. For all these years, there have been frontier fighting. But what follows is full of menacing significance. The enemies of God have begun to repair the railway, have repaired it, so that the train already runs beyond Saras. Even now, they push their iron road out into the desert towards their position at Akasha and to the south. What is the object of their toil? Are they coming again? Will they bring those terrible white soldiers who broke the hearts of the Hadendoa and almost destroyed the Dekane and Finana? What should draw them up the Nile? Is it for plunder, or in sheer love of war? Or is it a blood feud that brings them? True, they are now far off. Perchance they will return, as they returned before. Yet the iron road is not built in a day, nor for a day, and of a surety, there are war clouds in the north. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The River War. This League of Box recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 4, The Years of Preparation. In the summer of 1886, when all the troops had retreated to Wadi Halfa and all the Sudan garrisons had been massacred, the British people averted their eyes in shame and vexation from the valley of the Nile. A long succession of disasters had reached their disgraceful culmination. The dramatic features added much to the bitterness and nothing to the grandeur of the tragedy. The cost was heavy. Besides the pain produced by the death of General Gordon, the heavy losses in officers and men, and the serious expenditure of public money, the nation smarted under failure and disappointment, and were, moreover, deeply sensible that they had been humiliated before the whole world. The situation in Egypt was scarcely more pleasing. The reforms initiated by the British administrators had as yet only caused unpopularity. Barron's interference galled the Khedive and his ministers. Vincent's parsimony and contempt. Moncrief's energy had convulsed the irrigation department. Wood's army was the laughingstock of Europe. Among and beneath the rotten weeds and garbage of old systems and abuses, the new seed was being sown. But England saw no signs of the crop, saw only the stubborn husbandman begrimed with the dust and dirt, and herself hopelessly involved in the Egyptian muddle. And so, with utter weariness and disgust, stopping her ears to the gibes and catcalls of the powers, she turned toward other lands and other matters. When the attention of the nation was again directed to Egypt, the scene was transformed. It was as though at the touch of an angel, the dark morasses of the slough of Despond had been changed to the breezy slopes of the Delectable Mountains. The Khedive and his ministers lay quiet and docile in the firm grasp of the consul general. The bankrupt state was spending surpluses upon internal improvement. The disturbed irrigation department was vivifying the land. The divided army held the frontier against all comers. Astonishment gave place to satisfaction, and satisfaction grew into delight. The haunting nightmare of Egyptian politics ended. Another dream began, a bright if vague vision of imperial power, of transcontinental railways, of African viceroys, of conquest, commerce. The interest of the British people in the work of regeneration grew continually. Each new reform was hailed with applause. Each annual budget was scrutinized with pride. England exulted in the triumph of failure turned into success. There was a general wish to know more about Egypt and the men who had done these great things. In 1893, this desire was satisfied, and yet stimulated by the publication of Sir Alfred Milner's England and Egypt. His skillful pen displayed what had been overcome, no less than what was accomplished. By explaining the difficulties, he enhanced the achievement. He showed how, while Great Britain was occupied elsewhere, her brilliant, persevering sons had repeated on a lesser scale in Egypt the marvelous evolution which is working out in India.
Marvelous.
Smaller systems circulate more rapidly. The administrators were guided by experience. The movement had been far swifter, and results were more surprising. Such was the wonderful story, and it was told in a happy moment. The audience were eager and sympathetic. The subject was enthralling. The storyteller had a wit and a style that might have brightened the dullest theme. In these proficient dances, the book was more than a book. The words rang like the trumpet call which rallies the soldiers after the parapets are stormed, and summons them to complete the victory. The regeneration of Egypt is not a theme which would fall within the limits of this account, even if it had not been fully dealt with by Sir Alfred Milner. But the reorganization of the Egyptian army, the forging of the weapon of reconquest, is an essential feature. On the 20th of December, 1882, the whole Egyptian army, or rather, such parts as had escaped destruction, was disbanded by a single sentence of British decree, and it was evident that some military body must replace that which had been swept away. All sorts of schemes for the employment of foreign legions or Turkish janissaries were devised, but Lord Dufferin adhered firmly to the principle of entrusting the defense of the country to its inhabitants, and it was determined to form a new Egyptian army. The poverty of the government, no less than the apparent folly of the experiment, demanded that the new army should be small. The force was intended only for the preservation of internal order and the defense of the southern and western frontiers of Egypt against the Bedouin Arabs. The Sudan still slumbered out its long nightmare. 6,000 men was the number originally drawn by conscription, for there are no volunteers in Egypt. From a population of more than 6 million, 26 British officers, either poor men attracted by the high rates of pay, or ambitious allured by the increased authority, and a score of excellent drill sergeants undertook the duty of teaching recruits to fight. Sir Evelyn Wood directed the enterprise and became the first British Sirdar of the Egyptian army. The work began and immediately prospered. Within 3 months of its formation, the army had its first review. The whole 6,000 paraded in their battalions and marched past the Khedive and their country's flag. Their bearing and their drill extorted the half-contemptuous praise of the indifferent spectators. Experienced soldiers noticed other points. Indeed, the new army differed greatly from the old. In the first place, it was paid. The recruits were treated with justice. Their rations were not stolen by the officers. The men were given leave to go to their villages from time to time. When they fell sick, they were sent to hospital instead of being flogged. In short, the European system was substituted for the Oriental. It was hardly possible that the fertile soil and enervating climate of the Delta would have evolved a warrior race. Ages of oppression and poverty rarely produce proud and warlike spirits. Patriotism does not grow under the courbash. The fellah soldier lacks the desire to kill. Even the Mohammedan religion has failed to excite his ferocity. He may be cruel, he is never fierce. Yet he is not without courage, a courage which bears pain and hardship and patience, which confronts ill fortune with indifference, and which looks on death with apathetic composure. It is the courage of downtrodden peoples, and one which stronger breeds may often envy, though they can scarcely be expected to admire. He has other military virtues. He is obedient, honest, sober, well-behaved, quick to learn, and above all, physically strong. Generations of toiling ancestors, though they could not brace his nerves, have braced his muscles. Under the pressure of local circumstances, there has been developed a creature who can work with little food, with little incentive, very hard, for long hours under a merciless sun. Throughout the river campaigns, if the intellect of the army, if the spirit of the troops have come from without, Egypt herself has provided the sinews of war. Such was the material out of which the British officers had formed the new Egyptian army. At first, indeed, their task was embittered by the ridicule of their comrades in the British and Indian services. But as the drill and bearing of the force improved, the thoughtless scorn would have been diverted from the Englishmen to fall only upon the Egyptian soldiers. But this was not allowed. The British officers identified themselves with their men. Those who abused the fellah soldier were reminded that they insulted English gentlemen. Thus, a strange bond of union was established between the officers and soldiers of the Egyptian service.
If you
And
cheat
although
me
little
out of
forces
any
never
damn
accomplished much,
thing,
without this moral factor, the
that's
extraordinary
the
results
servant
of
of
the
mine.
It was not long before the new
I'ma
military
fuck you
organization
up
was
right
exposed to the
now.
stern test of war. The army that was raised to preserve internal order was soon called upon to guard the frontier. The revolt in the Sudan, which in its earlier stages seemed the least of the Egyptian difficulties, speedily dwarfed all the rest. The value of the new force was soon recognized. In June 1883, we find General Hicks, then preparing for his fatal march, writing to Sir Evelyn Wood, "Send me 4 battalions of your new army, and I shall be content." But fortune protected the infant organization from such a disastrous beginning. The new army remained for a space in Cairo, and although during the Nile expedition of 1884 to 1885, the Egyptians were employed guarding the lines of communication, it was not until the British troops had been withdrawn from Dongola that they received at Guinness their baptismal fire. Henceforth, their place was on the frontier. From 1886 onward, the Egyptian troops proved equal to the task of resisting the northward pressure of the dervishes. The numbers of the army grew with its responsibilities. Up to the end of 1883, the infantry still consisted of 8 Fellahin battalions. In 1884, the first Sudanese battalion was raised. The black soldier was of a very different type of the Fellahin. The Egyptian was strong, patient, healthy, and docile. The Negro was in all these respects his inferior. His delicate lungs, slim legs, and loosely knit figure contrasted unfavorably with the massive frame and iron constitution of the peasant of the Delta. Always excitable and often insubordinate, he required the strictest discipline. At once slovenly and uxorious, he detested his drills and loved his wives with equal earnestness. Altogether, Sambo, or such is the Sudanese equivalent of Tommy, was a lazy, fierce, disreputable child. But he possessed 2 tremendous military virtues. To the faithful loyalty of the dog, he added the heart of a lion. He loved his officer, and feared nothing in the world. With the introduction of this element, the Egyptian army became a formidable military machine. Chance or design has placed the blacks ever in the forefront of the battle. And in Lord Kitchener's campaigns on the Nile, the losses in the 6 Sudanese battalions had exceeded the aggregate of the whole of the rest of the army. It was well that the Egyptian troops were strengthened by these valiant auxiliaries, for years of weary war lay before them. Sir Reginald Wingate, in his exhaustive account of the struggle of Egypt with the modest power, Mahdism and the Egyptian Sudan by Sir Reginald Wingate, has described the successive actions which accompanied the defense of the Wadi Halfa frontier and of Suakin. The 10 years that elapsed between Guinness and the first movements of the expedition of reconquest were the dreary years of the Egyptian army. The service was hard and continual, but the operations were petty, and untiring vigilance was imperative. The public eye was averted. A pitiless economy was everywhere in force. The British officer was deprived of his leave, and the Egyptian private of his rations, that a few pounds might be saved to the Egyptian treasury. The clothing of the battalions wore thin and threadbare, and sometimes their boots were so bad that the soldiers' feet bled from the cutting edges of the rocks. The convoy escorts left their trails behind them. But preparation was ever going forward. The army improved in efficiency, and constant warfare began to produce, even among the Fellahin infantry, experienced soldiers. The officers, sweltering at weary Wadi Halfa and Suakin, looked at the gathering resources of Egypt and out into the deserts of the declining Dervish Empire, and knew that someday their turn would come. The sword of reconquest which Evelyn Wood had forged, and Grenfell had tested, was gradually sharpened, and when the process was almost complete, the man who was to wield it presented himself. Horatio Herbert Kitchener, the eldest son of a lieutenant colonel, was born in 1850, and, after being privately educated, entered in 1869 the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich as a cadet of the Royal Engineers. In the spring of 1871, he obtained his commission, and for the first 10 years of his military service remained an obscure officer, performing his duties with regularity, but giving no promise of the talents and character which he was afterwards to display. One powerful weapon, however, he acquired in this time of waiting. In 1874, accident or instinct led him to seek employment in the surveys that were being made of Cyprus and Palestine, and in the latter country he learned Arabic. For 6 years, the advantage of knowing a language with which few British officers were familiar brought him no profit. For procuring military preferment, Arabic was in 1874 as valueless as Patagonian. All this was swiftly changed by the unexpected course of events. The year 1882 brought the British fleet to Alexandria, and the connection between England and Egypt began to be apparent. Kitchener did not neglect his opportunity. Securing leave of absence, he went to the scene of crisis. Alexandria was bombarded. Detachments from the fleet were landed to restore order. The British government decided to send an army to Egypt. British officers and soldiers were badly wanted at the scene of war. An officer who could speak Arabic was indispensable. Thus Kitchener came to Egypt and set his feet firmly on the high road to fortune. He came to Egypt when she was plunged in misery and shame, when hopeless ruin seemed already the only outcome of the public disasters, and when even greater misfortunes impended. He remained to see her prosperous and powerful, to restore empire to her people, peace to her empire, honor to her army. And among those clear-minded men of action by whom the marvelous work of reparation has been accomplished, Herbert Kitchener will certainly occupy the second place. Lord Wolseley, on his arrival, soon found employment for the actor who could speak Arabic. He served through the campaign of 1882 as a major. He joined the new army which was formed at the conclusion of the war as one of the original 26 officers. In the Nile expedition of 1885, Arabic again led him to the front, and in the service of the intelligence department he found ample opportunity for his daring and energy. His efforts to communicate with Gordon in Khartoum did not, however, meet with much success, and the journals bristle with so many sarcastic comments that their editor has been at pains to explain in his preface that there was really no complaint. Major King on the debt and other external charges, and with a view to preventing in the future the extravagance of the Convention in 1885 prescribed that the annual expenditure of Egypt shall not exceed a certain sum. When the expenditure exceeds this amount, for every pound that is spent on the government or development of Egypt, another pound must be paid to the commissioners of the debt, so that after the limit is reached, for every pound that is required to promote Egyptian interests, 2 pounds must be raised by taxation from an already heavily taxed community. But the working of this law was found to be so severe that, like all laws which exceed the human conception of justice, it has been solidified by an arrangement which was effected in 1888, that caisses de la dette are empowered, instead of devoting their surplus pound to the sinking fund, to pay it into a general reserve fund, from which the commissioners may make grants to meet extraordinary expenses. Those expenses, that is to say, which may be considered once for all capital expenditure and not ordinary annual charges. The Dongola expedition was begun, as has been said, without reference to the immediate internal condition of Egypt. The moment was a good one, but not the best. It was obviously impossible for Egypt to provide for the extraordinary expenses of the military operations out of revenue. The Ministry of Finance therefore appealed to the caisse de la dette for a grant from the General Reserve Fund. Here was an obvious case of extraordinary expenses. The Egyptian government asked for 500,000 Egyptian pounds. The caisse met in council. 6 commissioners, representing England, France, Russia, Germany, Austria, and Italy, duly discussed the application. 4 commissioners considered that the grant should be made. 2 commissioners, those representing France and Russia, voted against it. The majority decided. The grant was made. The money was handed to the Egyptian government and devoted to the prosecution of the war. Egypt, as a sovereign power, had already humbly begged to be allowed to devote part of the surplus of her own revenues to her own objects. A greater humiliation remained. The commissioners of France and Russia, who had been outvoted, brought in action against their colleagues on the grounds that the grant was ultra vires, and against the Egyptian government for the return of the money thus wrongly obtained. Other actions were brought at French instigation by various people purporting to represent the bondholders, who declared that their interests were threatened. The case was tried before the mixed tribunals, an institution which exists in Egypt superior to and independent of the sovereign rights of that country. On the part of the Egyptian government and 4 commissioners, it was contended that the mixed tribunals had no competency to try the case, that the attacking parties had no right of action, that the Egyptian government had, in applying, done all that the law of liquidation required, and that the act of sovereignty was complete as soon as the Kes, which was the legal representative of the bondholding interest, had pronounced its decision. The argument was a strong one, but had it been 10 times as strong, the result would have been the same. The mixed tribunals, an international institution, delivered its judgment on strictly political grounds, the judges taking their orders from the different countries they represented. It was solemnly pronounced that war expenses were not extraordinary expenses. The proximate destruction of the Khalifa's power was treated quite as a matter of everyday occurrence. A state of war was apparently regarded as usual in Egypt. On this wise and sensible ground, the Egyptian government were condemned to pay back 500,000 Egyptian pounds, together with interest and costs. After momentary hesitation as to whether the hour had not come to join issue on the whole subject of the financial restrictions of Egypt, it was decided to bow to this iniquitous decision. The money had now to be refunded. It had already been spent. More than that, other sums were needed for the carrying on of the war. The army was by then occupying Dongola, and was in actual expectation of a dervish counterattack, and it was evident section lines south of that to consider this within the theater of the war. Steamers, by barges towed, and by a number of native sailing craft. A stretch of 7 miles of railway avoids the first cataract, Aswan and Shalal. Above Shalal, a second flotilla of gunboats, steamers, barges, and Nile boats was collected to ply between Shalal and Alpha. The military railway ran from Halfa to Saras. South of Saras, supplies were forwarded by camels. To meet the increased demands of transport, 4,500 camels were purchased in Egypt and forwarded in boats to Aswan, whence they marched via Korosko to the front. British government had authorized the construction of the military railway to Akasha, and a special railway battalion was collected at Aswan, through which place sleepers and other material at once began to pass to Saras. The strategic railway construction will, however, form the subject of a later chapter, which I shall not anticipate. By the 1st of April, less than 3 weeks from the commencement of the advance, the whole line of communications had been organized and was working efficiently, although still crowded with the concentrated troops. As soon as the 16th Battalion of arrived at Suakin, the 9th Sudanese were conveyed by transports to Kosseir, and marched thence across the desert to Canaan. The distance was 120 miles, and the fact that in spite of 2 heavy thunderstorms, rare phenomena in Egypt, it was covered in 4 days, is a notable example of the marching powers of the black soldiers. It had been determined that the 10th Sudanese should follow at once, but circumstances occurred to detain them on the Red Sea littoral, and must draw the attention of the reader thither. The aspect and history of the town and port of Suakin is a useful instance to a cynical politician. Most of the houses stand on a small barren island, which is connected with the mainland by a narrow causeway. At a distance, the tall buildings of white coral, often 5 stories high, present an imposing appearance. The prominent chimneys of the condensing machinery, where there is scarcely any fresh water, seem to suggest manufacturing activity. But a nearer view reveals the melancholy squalor of the scene. A large part of the town is deserted. The narrow streets wind among tumbled down and neglected houses. The quaintly carved projecting windows of the facades are boarded up. The soil exhales an odor of stagnation and decay. The atmosphere is rank with memories of waste and failure. The scenes that meet the eye intensify these impressions. The traveler who lands on Quarantine Island is first confronted with the debris of the projected Suakin-Berger Railway. 2 or 3 locomotives that have neither felt the pressure of steam nor tasted oil for a decade lie rusting in the ruined workshops. Huge piles of railway material rot, unguarded and neglected, on the shore. Rolling stock of all kinds, carriages, trucks, vans, and ballast wagons, are strewn or heaped near the sheds. The Christian cemetery alone shows a decided progress. The long lines of white crosses which mark the graves of British soldiers and sailors who lost their lives in action or by disease during the various campaigns, no less than the large and newly enclosed areas to meet future demands, increase the depression of the visitor. The numerous graves of Greek traders, a study of whose epitaphs may conveniently refresh a classical education, protest that the climate of the island is pestilential. The high loopholed walls declare that the desolate scrub of the mainland is inhabited only by fierce and valiant savages who love their liberty. For 11 years, all trade had been practically stopped, and the only merchants remaining were those who carried on an illicit traffic with the Arabs, or, with Eastern apathy, were content to wait for better days. Being utterly unproductive, Suakin had been wisely starved by the Egyptian government, and the gloom of the situation was matched by the poverty of its inhabitants. The island on which the town stands is joined to the mainland by a causeway, at the further end of which is an arched gateway of curious design called the Gate of the Sudan. Upon the mainland stands the crescent-shaped suburb of El Kaf. It comprises a fleeing coral-built houses, a large area covered with mud huts inhabited by Arabs and fishermen, and all the barracks and military buildings. The whole surrounded by a strong wall 1.5 miles long, 15 feet high, 6 feet thick, with a parapet pierced for musketry, and reinforced at intervals by bastions armed with Krupp guns. 3 strong detached posts complete the defenses of Suakin. 10 miles to the northward, on the scene of Sir H. Kitchener's unfortunate enterprise, is the fort of Handun. Tembuk is 25 miles inland and among the hills. Situated upon a high rock, and consisting only of a store, a formidable blockhouse, and a lookout tower, this place is safe from any enemy unprovided with artillery. Both Handun and Tembuk were at the outset of the campaign provisioned for 4 months. The third post, Tokar Fort, lies 50 miles along the coast to the south. Its function is to deprive the Arabs of a base in the fertile delta of the Tokar River. The fort is strong, defended by artillery, and requires for its garrison an entire battalion of infantry. No description of Suakin would be complete without some allusion to the man to whom it owes its fame. Osman Digna had been for many years a most successful and enterprising Arab slave dealer. The attempted suppression of his trade by the Egyptian government drove him naturally into opposition. He joined in the revolt of the Mahdi, and by his influence roused the whole of the Hadendoa and other powerful tribes of the Red Sea shore. The rest is upon record. Year after year, at a hard sacrifice of men and money, the imperial government and the old slaver fought like wolves over the dry bone of Suakin. Bakers Teb, El Teb, Tamai, Tofrek, Hashim, Handun, Gemaiza, Al-Fafit. Such were the fights of Osman Digna, and through all he passed unscathed. Often defeated but never crushed, the wily Arab might justly boast to have run further and fought more than any emir in the Dervish armies. It had scarcely seemed possible that the advance on Dongola could influence the situation around Salah, yet the course of events encouraged the belief that the British diversion in favor of Italy had been effective. For at the end of March, as soon, that is to say, as the news of the occupation of Akasha reached him, Osman Digna separated himself from the army threatening Kassala and marched with 300 cavalry, 70 cavalry, and 2,500 foot towards his old base in the Tokar Delta. On the first rumor of his advance, the orders of the 10th Sudanese to move via Kosseir and Canaan to the Nile were cancelled, and they remained in garrison at Tokar. At home, the War Office, touched in a tender spot, quivered apprehensively, and began forthwith to make plans to strengthen the Suakin garrison with powerful forces. The state of affairs in the eastern Sudan has always been turbulent. The authority of the governor of the Red Sea littoral was not at this time respected beyond the extreme range of the guns of Suakin. The Hadendoa and other tribes, who lived under the walls of the town, professed loyalty to the Egyptian government, not from any conviction that their rule was preferable to that of Osman Digna, but simply for the sake of a quiet life. As their distance from Suakin increased, the loyalty of the tribesmen became even less pronounced. And at a radius of 20 miles, all the sheikhs oscillated alternately between Osman Digna and the Egyptian government, and tried to avoid open hostilities with either. Omar Tita, sheikh of the district round about Erkowit, found himself situated on this fringe of intriguing neutrality. Although he was known to have dealings with Osman, it was believed that if he had the power to choose, he would side with the Egyptian government. Early in April, Omar Tita reported that Osman Digna was in the neighborhood of Erkowit with a small force, and that he, the faithful ally of the government, had on the 3rd of the month defeated him with the loss of 4 camels. He said that if the Egyptian government would send up a force to fight Osman, he, the aforesaid ally, would keep him in play until it arrived. After a few days of hesitation and telegraphic communication from the Sirdar, Colonel Lloyd, the governor of Suakin, who was then in very bad health, decided that he had not enough troops to justify him in taking the risk of going up to Erkowit to fight Osman. Around Suakin, as along the Indian frontier, a battle was always procurable on the shortest notice. When a raid has taken place, the government may choose the scale of their reprisals. If they are poor, they will arrange a counter raid by means of friendlies, and nothing more will be heard of the affair. If they are rich, they will mobilize 2 or 3 brigades and make an expedition or fight a pitched battle, so that another glory may be added to the annals of the British Army. In the present instance, the Egyptian government were poor, and as the British government did not desire to profit by the opportunity, it was determined to have only a small-scale operation. The governor therefore arranged a plan for a demonstration at the foot of the hills near Khor Wintri by means of combined movements from Suakin and Tokar. The garrison of Suakin consisted of the 1st and half of the 5th Egyptian battalions, the 16th Egyptian reservists, who had just replaced the 9th Sudanese, and were as yet hardly formed into a military body, 1 squadron of cavalry, 1 company of camel corps, and some detachments of artillery. The garrison of Tokar consisted of the 10th Sudanese and few gunners. From these troops, there was organized in the 2nd, with all due ceremony, a Suakin field force. The plan of campaign was simple. Colonel Lloyd was to march out from Suakin and effect a junction with the Tokar column at Khor Wintri, where the Erkowit road enters the hills. It was then hoped that Osman Digna would descend and fight a battle of the required dimensions in the open, after which, if victorious, the force would return to Suakin and Tokar. In order to make the Suakin column as mobile as possible, the whole force was mounted on camels, of which more than 1,000 were requisitioned, as well as 60 mules and 120 donkeys. 200 Arabs accompanied the column to hold these beasts when necessary. 6 days' forage and rations, 1 day's reserve of water, 200 rounds per man, and 100 shell per gun were carried. At 5 o'clock on the afternoon of Tuesday, 14th of April, the troops paraded outside the walls of Suakin and bivouacked in the open, ready to march at daylight. The next morning, the column, which numbered about 1,200 men of all arms, started. After marching for 4 or 5 hours in the direction of Khor Wintri, the cavalry, who covered the advance, came in contact with the dervish scouts. The force thereupon assumed an oblong formation. The mixed Sudanese company and the 2 guns in front, 3 Egyptian companies on each flank, the camel corps company in the rear, and the transport in the center. The pace was slow, and since few camels had ever been saddled or ridden, progress was often interrupted by their behavior and by the broken and difficult nature of the country. Alas, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Turroy Wells, 8 miles from Khor Wintri, were reached, and here, having marched 19 miles, Colonel Lloyd determined to halt. While the infantry were making the Zariba, the cavalry were sent on under Captain Fenwick, an infantry officer employed on the staff, to gain touch with the Tokar force, who were expected to have already reached the rendezvous. Apparently under the belief that Omar Tita and his Arabs would give timely notice of an attack, the cavalry seemed to have neglected many of the usual precautions, and in consequence, at about 5 o'clock, when approaching Khor Wintri, they found themselves suddenly confronted with a force of about 200 dervish horsemen, supported by a large body of infantry. The squadron reeled about with promptitude and began to retire at a trot. The dervish horsemen immediately pursued. The result was that the Egyptians began a disorderly flight at a gallop through the thick and treacherous scrub, and over broken, dangerous ground. 16 horses fell, their riders were instantly speared by the pursuers. Rallying 38 troopers, Captain Fenwick seized a rocky hillock, and dismounting with the natural instinct of an infantryman, prepared to defend himself to the last. The remainder of the squadron continued their flight, and 32 troopers, under an Egyptian officer, whose force is said to have bolted, arrived at the Turroy Zariba with the news that their comrades had been destroyed, or had perhaps returned to Suakin, and that they themselves had been closely followed by the enemy. The news caused the gravest anxiety, which was not diminished when it was found the bush around the Zariba was being strongly occupied by dervish spearmen. 2 mounted men, who volunteered for the perilous duty, were sent to make their way through the savage cordon, and try to find either the remainder of the cavalry or the Tokar column. Both were hunted down and killed. The rest of the force continued in hourly expectation of an attack. Their suspense was aggravated towards midnight, when the dervishes began to approach the Zariba. In the darkness, what was thought to be a body of horsemen was seen moving along a shallow khor, opposite the right face of the defense. At the same moment, a loud yell was raised by the enemy on the other side. An uncontrolled musketry fire immediately broke out. The guns fired blindly up the valley, the infantry wildly on all sides. The fusillade continued furiously for some time, and when by the efforts of the British officers the troops were restrained, it was found that the British had retired, leaving behind them a single wounded man. Occasional shots were fired from the scrub until the morning, but no fresh attack was attempted by the dervishes. Meanwhile, Captain Fenwick maintained his solitary and perilous position on the hillock. He was soon surrounded by considerable bodies of the enemy, and as soon as it became dark, he was sharply attacked. But the dervishes fortunately possessed few rifles, and the officers and troopers, by firing steady volleys, succeeded in holding their ground and repulsing them. The sound of the guns at Turroy encouraged the Egyptians and revealed the direction of their friends. With the daylight, the dervishes, who seemed throughout the affair to have been poor-spirited fellows, drew off, and the detachment remounting made haste to rejoin the main body. The force, again united, pursued their way to Khor Wintri, where they found the Tokar already arrived. Marching early on the 15th, Major Sidney, with 250 men of the 10th Sudanese, the only really trustworthy troops in the force, had reached Khor Wintri the same afternoon. He drove out the small dervish post occupying the khor, and was about to bivouac when he was sharply attacked by a force of Arabs said to have numbered 80 horsemen and 500 foot. The Sudanese fought with their usual courage, and the dervishes were repulsed, leaving 30 dead upon the ground. The regulars had 3 men wounded. Up to this point, Colonel Lloyd's plan had been succeeded. It now remained to await the attack of Osman Digna and inflict any blow upon him. It was decided, however, in view of what had occurred, to omit this part of the scheme, and both forces returned together without delay to Suakin, which they reached on the 18th, having lost in the operations 18 Egyptian soldiers killed and 3 wounded. Their arrival terminated a period of anxious doubt as to their fate. The town, which had been almost entirely denuded of troops, was left in charge of Captain Ford Hutchinson. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 16th, a few stragglers from the Egyptian cavalry with half a dozen riderless horses knocked at the gates, and vague but sinister rumors spread on all sides. The belief that a disaster had overtaken the Egyptian force greatly excited the Arabs living within the walls, and it appeared that they were about to rise, plunder the town, and massacre the Christians. Her Majesty's ship Scout was, however, by good fortune, in the harbor. Strong parties of bluejackets were landed to patrol the streets. The guns of the warship were laid on the Arab quarter. These measures had a tranquilizing effect, and order reigned in Suakin until the return of the field force, when their victory was celebrated with appropriate festivities. It was announced that as a result of the successful operations, the Dervish enterprise against the Tokai Delta had collapsed, and that Osman Digna's power was forever broken. In order, however, that no unfortunate incident should mar the triumph, the 10th Sudanese were sent back to Tokar by sea via Trinkitat, instead of marching direct, and the garrison of Suakin confined themselves henceforward strictly to their defenses. Osman Digna remained in the neighborhood and raided the friendly villages. On the arrival of the Indian contingent, he was supposed to be within 12 miles of the town, but thereafter he retired to Adarama on the Atbara River, where he remained during the Dongola campaign. The fact that no further offensive operations were undertaken in the eastern Sudan prevented all fighting, for the dervishes were, of course, unable to assail the strong permanent fortifications behind which the Egyptians took shelter. They nevertheless remained in actual possession of the surrounding country until the whole situation was altered by the successful advance of powerful forces behind them along the Nile and by the occupation of Berber. After the affair of Khor Wintri, it was evident that it would not be possible to leave Suakin to the defense only of the 16th Battalion of reservists. On the other hand, Sir H. Kitchener required every soldier the Egyptian army could muster to carry out the operations on the Nile. It was therefore determined to send Indian troops to Suakin to garrison the town and forts, and thus release the 10th Sudanese and the Egyptian battalions for the Dongola expedition. Accordingly, early in the month of May, the Indian Army authorities were ordered to prepare a brigade of all arms for service in Egypt. The troops selected were as follows: 26th Bengal Infantry, 35th Sikhs, 1st Bombay Lancers, Bombay Mountain Battery, 2 Maxim guns, 1 section Queen's Own from Madras, sappers and miners, in all about 4,000 men. The command was entrusted to Colonel Edgerton of the Corps of Guides. On the 30th of May, the dreary town of Suakin was enlivened by the arrival of the first detachments, and during the following week the whole force disembarked at the rotten piers and assumed the duties of the defense. It is mournful to tell how this gallant brigade, which landed so full of high hope and warlike enthusiasm, and which was certainly during the summer the most efficient force in the Sudan, was reduced in 7 months to the sullen band who returned to India, wasted by disease, embittered by disappointment, and inflamed by feelings of resentment and envy. The Indian contingent landed in the full expectation of being immediately employed against the enemy. After a week, when all the stores had been landed, officers and men spent their time speculating when the order to march would come. It was true that there was no transport in Suakin, but that difficulty was easily overcome by rumors that 5,000 camels were on their way from the Somali coast to enable the force to move on Kassala or Berber. As these did not arrive, General Edgerton sent in a proposed scheme to the Sirdar, in which he undertook to hold all the advanced posts up to the Kakreb range if he were supplied with 1,000 camels for transport. A characteristic answer was returned to the effect that it was not intended to use the Indian contingent as a mobile force. They had come as a garrison for Suakin, and a garrison for Suakin they should remain. This information was not, however, communicated to the troops, who continued to hope for orders to advance until the fall of Dongola. The heat, when the contingent arrived, was not great, but as the months wore on, the temperature rose steadily, until in August and September, the thermometer rarely fell below 103 degrees during the night, and often rose to 115 degrees by day. Dust storms were frequent. A veritable plague of flies tormented the unhappy soldiers. The unhealthy climate, the depressing inactivity, and the scantiness of fresh meat, or the use of condensed water, provoked an outbreak of scurvy. At one time, nearly all the followers and 50% of the troops were affected. Several large drafts were invalided to India. The symptoms were painful and disgusting. Open wounds, loosening of the teeth, curious fungoid growths on the gums and legs. The cavalry horses and transport animals suffered from bursati, and even a pinprick expanded into a large open sore. It is doubtful whether the brigade could have been considered fit for active service after September. All the Europeans suffered acutely from prickly heat. Malarial fever was common. There were numerous cases of abscesses on the liver. 25% of the British officers were invalided to England or India, and only 6 escaped to stay in hospital. The experiences of the battalion holding Tokar Fort were even worse than those of the troops in Suakin. At length, the longed-for time of departure arrived. With feelings of relief and delight, the Indian contingent shook the dust of Suakin off their feet and returned to India. It is a satisfaction to pass from the dismal narrative of events in the eastern Sudan to the successful campaign on the Nile. By the middle of April, the concentration on the frontier was completed. The communications were cleared of their human freight and occupied only by supplies and railway material, which continued to pour south at the utmost capacity of the transport. 11,000 troops had been massed at and beyond Wadi Halfa, but no serious operations could take place until a strong reserve of stores had been accumulated at the front. Meanwhile, the army waited, and the railway grew steadily. The battalions were distributed in 3 principal fortified camps, Halfa, Saras, and Akasha, and detachments held a chain of small posts, which linked them together. Including the North Staffordshire Regiment, the garrison of Wadi Halfa numbered about 3,000 men. The town and cantonment, nowhere more than 400 yards in width, straggle along the riverbank, squeezed in between the water and the desert, for nearly 3 miles. The houses, offices, and barracks are all built of mud, and the aspect of the place is brown and squalid. A few buildings, however, attain to the dignity of 2 stories. At the northern end of the town, a group of fairly well-built houses occupy the riverfront, and a distant view of the clusters of palm trees, of the white walls, and the minaret of the mosque refreshes the weary traveler from Korosko or Shellal with the hopes of civilized entertainment. The whole town is protected towards the deserts by a ditch and mud wall, and heavy crop field pieces are mounted on little bastions where the ends of the rampart rest upon the river. 5 small detached forts strengthen the land front, and the futility of an Arab attack at this time was evident. Halfa had now become the terminus of a railway which was rapidly extending, and the continual arrival and dispatch of tons of material, the building of sheds, workshops, and storehouses, the African slum, the bustle and activity of a civilized city. Saras Fort is an extensive building, perched on a crag of black rock, rising on the banks of the Nile, about 30 miles south of Halfa. During the long years of preparation, it had been Egypt's most advanced outpost, now the terminus of the military railway. The beginning of the expedition swelled it into an entrenched camp, holding nearly 6,000 men. From each end of the black rock on which the fort stood, a strong stone wall and wire entanglement ran back to the river. The space thus enclosed was crowded with rows of tents and lines of animals and horses, and in the fort, Colonel Hunter, commanding the district known as Saras and the South, had headquarters. From Saras, the army seemed to have chosen a double line of advance. The railway reconstruction followed the old track which had been prepared for the desert in 1885. The convoy route wound along by the river. Both were protected from attack. The 7th Egyptians guarded the railhead, while the chain of small posts secured the road by the Nile to Akasha. The advance base grew during the months of April and May into a strong position. Only once did the Arabs venture to approach within artillery range. A small body of horse and camel men made a sort of haphazard reconnaissance, and being seen from the outpost line, were fired on at a great distance by a field gun. They fell back immediately, but it was believed that the range was too great for the projectile to have harmed them, and it was not until 2 days later that the discovery on the spot of a swollen, blistering corpse, clad in bright jibba, apprised the delighted gunners of the effect of their fire. Warned by this lucky shot, the dervishes came no more. The Sirdar, accompanied by Colonel Bundle, his chief of staff, left Cairo on the 22nd of March, and after a short stay at Aswan, reached Wadi Halfa on the 29th. Here he remained during the month of April, superintending and pressing the extension of the railroad and the accumulation of supplies. On the 1st of May, he arrived at Akasha with a squadron of cavalry under Major Byrne Murdoch as his escort. It happened that a convoy had come in the previous day, so that there were 2 extra cavalry squadrons at the advanced post. Almost at the same moment that Sir H. Kitchener entered the camp, a party of friendly Arabs came in with the news that they had been surprised some 4 miles to the eastward by a score of Dervish cavalmen, and had only succeeded in escaping with the loss of 2 of their number. In the belief that the enemy in the immediate vicinity were not in force, the Sirdar ordered the 3 squadrons of Egyptian cavalry, supported by the 11th Sudanese, to go out and reconnoiter towards Firket and endeavor to cut off any hostile patrols that might be found. At 10 o'clock, Major Byrne Murdoch started with 4 British officers and 240 lances. After moving for 7 or 8 miles among the hills which surround Akasha, the cavalry passed through a long sandy defile, flanked on either side by rocky peaks and impracticable ravines. As the head of the column was about to debouch from this, the advanced scouts reported that there was a body of dervishes in the open ground in front of the defile. The cavalry commander rode forward to look at dervishes numbering at least 1,500 foot and 250 horse. The cavalry, by trotting, had left the supporting infantry some distance behind them. The appearance of the enemy was threatening. The horsemen were drawn up scarcely 300 yards away, were already advancing to the attack, their right flank protected by a small force of cavalry, and behind was the solid array of the spearmen. Major Byrne Murdoch determined to fall back on his infantry support and escape from the bad ground. He gave the order, and the squadrons reeled about by troops and began to retire. Forthwith, the dervish horse charged, and, galloping furiously into the defile, attacked the cavalry in rear. Both sides were crowded in the narrow space. The wildest confusion followed, and the dust raised by the horses' hoofs hung over all like a yellow London fog, amid which the bewildered combatants discharged their pistols and thrust at random. The Egyptian cavalry, thus highly tried, showed at first no disposition to turn to meet the attack. The tumult drowned all words of command. A disaster seemed imminent. But the British officers, who had naturally been at the head of the column during its advance, were now at the rear and nearest the enemy. Collecting a score of troopers, they made such resistance with their swords and revolvers that they actually held the defile and beat back the dervish horse, who retired on their infantry, leaving a dozen dead upon the ground. 2 of the Egyptian squadrons continued to retreat until clear of the defile, a distance of 700 yards, but the 3rd and rearmost was compelled by the British officers to face about, and, galloping with this force down the ravine, Major Byrne Murdoch drove the Arabs pell-mell out of it. The other 2 squadrons had now returned, and the whole force dismounted, and, taking up a position among the sandhills near the mouth of the defile, opened fire with their carbines. The repulse of their cavalry seemed to have disheartened the dervishes, for they made no attempt to attack the dismounted troopers, and contented themselves with maintaining a desultory fire, which was so ill-aimed that but little loss was caused. The heat of the weather was terrific. Both men and horses suffered acutely from thirst. The squadron which had escorted the Sirdar had performed a long march before the reconnaissance, and was exhausted. The cavalry, however, held their position among the sandhills and easily defeated a feeble attempt to turn the right. At 12:15, the dervishes began to retire slowly and deliberately, and by 1 o'clock, when the 11th Sudanese arrived, eager and agog, the last Arab had disappeared. The force then returned to camp, bearing many spears and leading 6 captured horses as trophies of victory. The intensity of the heat may be gauged by the fact that one of the Sudanese soldiers, that is to say, an African Negro, died of sunstroke. Such was the affair of the 1st of May, and it is pleasing to relate that in this fierce fight the loss was not severe. 1 British officer, Captain Fitton, was slightly wounded. 1 native soldier was killed, 1 was mortally, and 8 severely wounded. During May, the preparations for the advance on the dervish position at Firket continued, and towards the end of the month it became evident that they were nearly complete. The steady accumulation of stores at Akasha had turned that post into a neat base from which the force might operate for a month without drawing supplies of any kind from the north. The railway, which had progressed at the rate of about half a mile a day, had reached and was working to Amigol Wells, where a 4-gun fort and entrenchment had been built. The distance over which convoys must plod was reduced by half, and the business of supply was doubly accelerated. By degrees, the battalions and squadrons began to move forward towards Akasha. Saras, deprived of its short-lived glory, became again the solitary fort on a crag. Wadi Halfa was also deserted, and except for the British battalion in garrison, could scarcely boast a soldier. Both the Egyptian battalions from Suakin had arrived on the Nile. The 10th Sudanese were on their way. The country beyond Akasha had been thoroughly reconnoitered and mapped to within 3 miles of the dervish position. Everything was ready. The actual concentration may be said to have begun on the 1st of June, when the Sirdar started for the front from Halfa, whither he had returned after the cavalry skirmish. Construction work on the railway came to a full stop. The railway battalions, dropping their pin shovels, shouldered their Remington rifles, and became the garrisons of the posts on the line communications. On the 2nd of June, the correspondents were permitted to proceed to Akasha. On the 3rd, the 10th Sudanese passed through Amigol and marched south. The horse battery from Halfa followed. The Egyptian battalions and squadrons, which had been camped along the river at convenient spots from Amigol to Akasha, marched to a point opposite Akma. Between this place and the advance post, an extensive camp, stretching 3 miles along the Nile bank, arose with magic swiftness. On the 4th, the 7th Egyptians moved from Railhead, and with these, the last battalion reached the front. 9,000 men with ample supplies were collected within striking distance of the enemy. All this time, the dervishes at Firket watched in senseless apathy the deliberate, machine-like preparations for their destruction. They should have had good information, for although the Egyptian cavalry patrolled ceaselessly, and the outpost line was impassable to scouts, their spies, as camel drivers, water carriers, and the like, were in the camp. They may not perhaps have known the exact moment of the intended blow, for the utmost secrecy was observed. But though they must have realized that it was imminent, they did nothing. There was indeed no course open to them but retreat. Once the army was concentrated with sufficient supplies at Akasha, their position was utterly untenable. The Emir-in-Chief, Hamuda, then had scarcely 3,000 men around his flag. Their rifles and ammunition were bad, their supplies scanty. Nor could the valor of 57 notable emirs sustained the odds against them. There was still time to fall back on Kosheh, or even on Suarda, anywhere outside the sweep of their terrible enemy's sword. They would not budge. Obstinate and fatuous to the last, they dallied and powdered on the fatal ground, until sudden, blinding, inevitable catastrophe fell upon them from all sides at once, and swept them out of existence as a military force. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The River War. This Box recording is in the public domain, and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War, by Winston Churchill, Chapter 6, Firket. June 7, 1896. Since the end of 1895, the Dervish force in Firket had been under the command of the Emir Hamuda, and it was through the indolence and neglect of this dissipated Arab that the Egyptian army had been able to make good its position at Akasha without any fighting. Week after week, the convoys had straggled unmolested through the difficult country between Saras and the advanced base. No attack had been made upon the brigade at Akasha. No enterprise was directed against its communications. This fatal inactivity did not pass unnoticed by Wad Bishara, the governor of Dongola. But although he was nominally in supreme command of all the Dervish forces in the province, he had hardly any means of enforcing his authority. His rebukes and exhortations, however, gradually roused Hamuda, and during May, 2 or 3 minor raids were planned and executed, and the Egyptian position at Akasha was several times reconnoitered. Bishara remained unsatisfied, and at length, despairing of infusing energy into Hamuda, he ordered his subordinate Osman Azrak to supersede him. Osman was a dervish of a very different type. He was a fanatical and devoted believer in the Mahdi, and a loyal follower of the Khalifa. For many years, he had served on the northern frontier of the Dervish Empire, and his name was well known to the Egyptian government as the contriver of the most daring and the most brutal raids. His cruelty to the wretched inhabitants of the border villages had excluded him from all hope of mercy should he ever fall into the hands of the enemy. His crafty skill, however, protected him, and among the emirs gathered at Firket, there was none whose death would have given greater satisfaction to the military authorities than the man who was now to replace Hamuda. Whether Osman Azrak had actually assumed command on the 6th of June is uncertain. It seems more likely that Hamuda declined to admit his right, and that the matter still stood at dispute. But in any case, Osman was determined to justify his appointment by his activity, and about midday he started from the camp at Firket, and, accompanied by a strong patrol of camelmen, set out to reconnoiter Akasha. Moving cautiously, he arrived unperceived within sight of the position at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The columns which were to storm Firket at dawn were then actually parading. But the clouds of dust which the high wind drove across and whirled about the camp obscured the view, and the dervish could distinguish nothing unusual. He therefore made the customary pentagonal mark on the sand to ensure good luck, and so returned to Firket. The Sirdar had concentrated for the capture of Firket, amounted to about 9,000 men, and was organized as follows. Commander-in-Chief, the Sirdar. The Infantry Division, Colonel Hunter commanding. 1st Brigade, Major Lewis, with the 3rd Egyptians, 4th Egyptians, and 10th Sudanese. 2nd Brigade, commanded by Major McDonald, with the 9th Sudanese, the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th Sudanese. 3rd Brigade, commanded by Major Maxwell, with the 2nd, 7th, and 8th Egyptians. Mounted forces under Major Byrne Murdoch. The Egyptian cavalry of 7 squadrons. The Camel Corps of 8 companies. Artillery, horse artillery, battery, field artillery, 2 batteries, Maxim guns, 1 battery. 2 roads led from Akasha to Firket, one by the bank of the river, the other inland and along the projected railway line. The Sirdar determined to avail himself of both. The force was therefore into 2 columns. The main column, under the command of the Sirdar, was to move by the river road and consisted of the infantry division, the field artillery, and the Maxim guns. The desert column, under command of Major Byrne Murdoch, consisted of the mounted forces, the horse artillery, the 12th Sudanese, drawn from McDonald's brigade and mounted upon camels, in all about 2,000 men. Precise orders were given to the smaller column, and Byrne Murdoch was instructed to occupy the hills to the southeast of the center of Firket village by 4:30 a.m. to dispose his force facing west, with the cavalry on the left, the Camel Corps in the center, and the 12th Sudanese on the right. The only point left to his discretion was the position to be occupied by the horse battery. He was especially warned not to come under the fire of the main infantry force. As soon as the enemy should be routed, the 12th Sudanese were to return to the Sirdar. The cavalry, and horse artillery were to pursue, the objective being, firstly, Koyeka, and secondly, Suarda. The infantry column began to march out of Akasha at 3:30 in the afternoon of the 6th, and trailed southwards along the track by the river in the following order. Lewis's brigade, with the 10th Sudanese leading, 2 Maxim guns and the artillery, McDonald's brigade, Maxwell's brigade, and lastly, the field hospitals and a half brigade forming rear guard. The Sirdar marched behind the artillery. The rear of the long column was clear of the camp by 4:30, and about 2 hours later, the mounted force started by the desert road. The river column made good progress till dark, but thereafter the advance was slow and tedious. The track led through broken rocky ground, and was so narrow that it nowhere allowed a larger front to be formed than 4 men abreast. In some places, the sharp rocks and crumbling heaps of stone almost stopped the gun mules altogether, while the infantry tripped and stumbled painfully. The moon had not yet risen, and the darkness was intense. Still, the long procession of men, winding like a whiplash between the jagged hills, toiled onward through the night, with no sound except the tramping of feet and the rattle of accoutrements. At 10:30, the head of Lewis's brigade debouched into a smooth, sandy plain about a mile to the north of Sacramento village. This was the spot, scarcely 3 miles from the enemy's position, where the Sirdar had decided to halt and bivouac. The bank and foreshore of the river were convenient for watering, all bottles and skins were filled, and soldiers and animals drank. A little food was eaten, and then, battalion by battalion, as the force arrived at the halting place, they lay down to rest. The tail of Maxwell's brigade reached the bivouac about midnight, and the whole column was then concentrated. Meanwhile, the mounted force were also on their way. Like the river column, they were disordered by the broken knees dismounted from their camels, and became again a fighting unit. Leaving the extra camels under a guard, Major Byrne Murdoch then advanced towards his appointed position on the hills, looking for Firket. The Sirdar moved on again with the infantry at 2:30. The moon had risen over the rocks to the left of the line of march. The thin crescent did not give much light. The very worst part of the whole track was encountered immediately the bivouac was left, and the column of nearly 6,000 men had to trickle through the narrow place in single file. There were already signs of the approach of dawn. The dervish camp was near. The Sirdar and his staff began to look. He sent many messages to the leading battalions to hurry, and the soldiers, although now very weary, ran and scrambled through the difficult passage like sheep crowding through a gate. By 4 o'clock, the leading brigade had cleared the obstacle, and the most critical moment seemed to have passed. Suddenly, a mile to the southward, rose the sound of the beating of drums. Everyone held his breath. The dervishes were prepared. Perhaps they would attack the column before it could deploy. Then the sound died away. And but for the clatter of the marching columns, all was again silent. It was no alarm, but only the call to the morning prayer, and the dervishes. The great mass of Firket Mountain, still dark in the half-light, now rose up on the left of the line of march. Between it and the river stretched a narrow strip of scrub-covered ground, and here, though obstructed by the long grass, bushes, palm trees, and holes, the leading brigade was ordered to deploy. There was, however, as yet, only room for the 10th Sudanese to form line, and the 3rd and 4th Egyptians contented themselves with widening to column of companies, the 3rd in the rear of the right of the 10th, the 4th in the rear of the center. The force now began to emerge from the narrow space between the hills and the river, and debouch into open country. As the space widened, number 1 field battery came into line on the left, and number 2 on the right of the 10th Sudanese. A swell of ground hid Firket village, though it was known to be within a mile, and it was now daylight. Still, there was no sign that the dervishes were prepared. It seemed scarcely possible to believe that the advance had not yet been discovered. The silence seemed to forebode some unexpected attack. The leading brigade and guns halted for a few minutes to allow MacDonald to form his battalions from fours into column of companies. Then at 5 o'clock, the advance was resumed, and at this moment, from the shoulder of Firket Mountain, there rang out a solitary shot. The dervish outposts had at last learned their danger. Several other shots followed in quick succession, and were answered by a volley from the 10th, and then from the 2 columns was simultaneous. The surprise of the enemy was complete. The great object was now to push on and deploy as fast as possible. The popping of musketry broke out from many points, and the repeated explosions of the horse battery added to the eager excitement of the troops. For what is more thrilling than the sudden and swift development of an attack at dawn? The 10th Sudanese had now reached the top of the rise which had hidden Firket, and the whole scene came into view. To the right front, the village of Firket stretched by the side of the river, a confusion of mud houses nearly a mile in length and perhaps 300 yards broad. On the landward side, the tents and straw shelters of the dervish force showed white and yellow. A system of mud walls and loopholed houses strengthened the northern end of the village. Behind it, as a background, stood lines and clusters of palm trees, through which the broad river and the masts of the Arab boats might be seen. In front of the troops, but a little to their left, rose a low rocky ridge surmounted with flags, and defended by a stone breastwork running along its base. Across the open space between the village and the hill, hundreds of dervishes on horse and on foot were hurrying to man their defenses, and others scrambled up to the rocks to see for themselves the number of the enemy. Scores of little puffs of smoke already speckled the black rocks of the ridge and the brown houses of the village. The attack developed very rapidly. The narrow passage between the mountain and the river poured forth its brigades and battalions, and the firing line stretched away to the right and left with extraordinary speed. The 10th Sudanese opened fire on the village as soon as they topped the rise. The 3rd and 4th Egyptians deployed on the right and left of the leading regiment, 2 companies on the 4th extending down onto the foreshore below the steep riverbank. Hicks Battery, number 1, and the massive guns coming into action from a spur of Firket Mountain on the rocky ridge. The ground in MacDonald's front was much broken by boulders and scrub, and a deep core delayed the advance. The enemy, though taking an obvious disadvantage, countless and inestimable are the chances of war. Those who read the story, and still more those who share the dangers of a campaign, feel that every incident is surrounded with a host of possibilities. What happened is singular. What might have happened, legion. But to try to gauge the influence of this uncertain force were utterly futile, and it is perhaps wise and indisputably convenient to assume that the favorable and adverse chances equate, and then eliminate them both from the calculation. The Sirdar's luck became almost proverbial in the Sudan. As the account progresses, numerous instances will suggest themselves. It was lucky that the dervishes did not harass the communications, or assail Akasha before it was fortified. It was lucky that they fought at Firket, that they retired from Berber, that Mahmud did not advance in January, that he advanced in March, that he did not retire before the Battle of the Atbara, that the Khalifa did not attack on the night before Omdurman, and that he did attack at dawn. But after Firket, all things were contrary. One unexpected misfortune succeeded another. Difficulties were replaced by others as soon as they had been overcome. The autumn of 1896 was marked by delay and disappointment. The state of the Nile, the storms, the floods, the cholera, and many minor obstacles, vexed but did not weary the commander. The victory at Firket was succeeded by a long pause in the operations. The army had made one sprang forward, it must now gather energy for another. The preparations, however, proceeded rapidly. A strong camp was formed in Firket. MacDonald's brigade occupied Swarda 2 days after the fight, and this place now became the advance. 2 months supply employed on the embankments. The line grew daily longer. On the 24th of July, the first train ran across the battlefield of Firket, and on the 4th of August, the railway was working to Kosheh. Kosheh is 6 miles south of Firket, and consists, like most places in the military Sudan, of little more than a name and a few ruined mud huts which were once a village. On the 5th of July, the whole camp was moved thither from the scene of the action. The reasons were clear and apparent. Kosheh is a point on the river above the Dal Cataract, whence a cold waterway runs at high tide to the Ondana. The camp at Firket had become foul and unsanitary. The bodies of the dead, swelling and decaying in their shallow graves, assailed as if in revenge the bodies of the living. The dysentery that had broken out was probably due to the green water, for during the early period of the flood, what is known as the King's Rise washes the filth and sewage off the foreshore all along the river, and brings down the green and rotting vegetation from the spongy swamps of the river. The water was then dangerous and impure. There was nothing else for the army to do, but it was undesirable to aggravate the evil by keeping the troops in a dirty camp. The earliest freight which the railway carried to Kosheh was the first of the new stern wheel guns. Train after train arrived with its load of steel and iron, or with the cumbrous sections of the hull, and a warship in pieces, engines, armaments, fittings, and stores, soon lay stacked by the side of the river. An improvised dockyard, equipped with powerful 20-ton shears and other appliances, was established, and the work, complicated as a Chinese puzzle, of fitting and riveting together the hundreds of various parts, proceeded swiftly. Gradually, the strange heaps of parts began to evolve a mighty engine of war. The new gunboats were in every way remarkable. The old vessels had been 90 feet long. These were 140 feet. Their breadth was 24 feet. They steamed 12 miles an hour. They had a command of 30 feet.
This shit
Their decks
good.
were all protected by steel plates and prepared by loopholed shields for musketry. Their armament was formidable. Each carried one 12-pounder quick-firing gun forward, two 6-pounder quick-firing guns in the central battery, and 4 Maxim guns. Every modern improvement, such as ammunition hoists, telegraphs, searchlights, and steam winches, was added. Yet with all this, they drew only 39 inches of water. The contract specified that these vessels should be delivered at Alexandria by the 5th of September, but by exertions, the first boat, the Zafir, reached Egypt on the 23rd of July, having been nearly 8 weeks, and in time to have assisted in the advance on London. The vessels and machinery had been constructed and erected in the works in London. They were then marked, handled, and taken to pieces, and after being shipped to Alexandria and transported to the front, were finally put together at Goshen. Although on a journey of 4,000 miles, they were 7 times transshipped, not a single important piece was lost. The convenience of Goshen on the clear waterway and the dirty condition of the cat were in themselves sufficient reasons for the change of camp, but another and greater cause lay behind. During the month of June, an epidemic of cholera began to
The
creep up
authorities
the
and
mountain.
devil energy.
On the 29th, there were some
Don't play
cases
with me
of
today.
On the 30th, it reached July. In consequence
Damn
of this,
police,
the
don't play with me
Children
today.
marched into camp at Gemini. Their 3 months' occupation of the town had not improved their health or their spirits. During the 16-mile march along the railway track to
Signs.
Gemini, the first fatal case occurred. Thereafter, the sickness clung to
Yeah,
them.
they is. Don't play with me today, Tampa police.
The cholera spread
Please.
steadily southward up the river, claiming successive victims in each camp. In the second week of July, reached the new camp at Goshen, whence all possible precautions to
I want some money from y'all.
The epidemic was at first of a virulent form. As is usual, when it had expended its destructive energy, recoveries became more frequent. But of the first 1,000 cases between Aswan and Swarta, nearly 800 proved fatal. Nor were the lives thus lost be altogether measured by the number. The attacks of deaths from cholera and the double
First of my golden opportunities. All right, bitch.
19 deaths. Native troops, 406 attacks, 260 deaths. Followers,
Dreading
788
it,
attacks,
huh?
640 deaths. To all, the time was one of trial, almost of terror. The violence of the battle may be chiefly braved, but the insidious attacks of disease appalled the boldest.
Oh.
Death moved about the ranks of the army. Not the death they had been trained to meet unflinchingly, but death in high enthusiasm and the pride of life. To weep or cheer, was silent, unnoticed, almost ignominious of summons, scarcely less sudden and far more painful than the bullet of the sword gun. The Egyptians, in spite of their fatalistic creed, manifested profound depression. The English soldiers were moody and ill-tempered. Even the light-hearted Sudanese lost their spirits. Their merry grins were seen no longer. Their laughter and their drums were stilled. Only the British officers preserved a stony cheerfulness and ceaselessly endeavored by energy and example to sustain the courage of their men. Yet they suffered most of all. Their education had developed their imaginations, and imagination, elsewhere a priceless gift, is amid such circumstances a dangerous burden. It was indeed a time of sore trouble. To find the servant dead in the camp kitchen, to catch a hurried glimpse of blanketed shapes hustled quickly to the desert on a stretcher, to hold the lantern over the grave into which a friend or comrade, alive and well 6 hours before, was hastily lowered, even though it was still night. And through it all to work incessantly at pressure in the solid, roaring heat, with a mind ever on the watch for the earliest of the fatal symptoms, and a thirst that could only be quenched by drinking of the deadly and contaminated Nile. All these things combined to produce an experience which those who endured are unwilling to remember, but unlikely to forget. One by one, some of the best of the field army and communication staff were stricken down. Gallant Fenwick, of whom they used to say that he was twice a VC without a gazette. Hobale, the railway subaltern, whose strange knowledge of the Egyptian soldiers had won stranger love. Trask, an heroic doctor, indifferent alike to pestilence or bloods. Mr. Bell, the chief superintendent of engines at Alpha. Palmer, a young officer already on his 4th campaign. Mr. Nicholson, a London engineer, long, quaint,
Tampa police, don't fucking play with me.
Alpha Cemetery were at the foot of Kirk Hill. At length, the epidemic was stamped out, and by the middle of August, it had practically ceased to be a serious danger. But the necessity of
Y'all
enforcing
steady
quarantine
playing. Y'all letting these bitches do all this shit in town.
delayed the progress of the
Okay.
in advance. Other unexpected hindrances arose.
Bye,
Sir
sis.
H. Kitchener had clearly recognized that the railway, equipped as it then was, the best of count
Don't fucking play with me, Tampa police. You understand me?
Organized an auxiliary boat service, Giants and others.
Don't fucking play with
Leading
me.
up the second cataract. During the summer months in the Sudan, a strong north wind prevails, which not only drives the sailing boats up against the stream, sometimes at the rate of 20 miles a day, but also gratefully cools the air. This year, for 40 consecutive days, at the critical period of the campaign, the wind blew hot at first from the south. The whole auxiliary boat service was thus practically arrested. But in spite of these aggravating obstacles, the preparations for the advance were forced onwards. It soon became necessary for the gunboats and steamers to be brought onto the upper reach of the river. The second cataract has a total descent and is about 9 miles long. Well, this distance the Nile flows down a rugged stairway, formed by successive ledges of black granite. The flood river deeply submerges
Those
these
black
steps, rushes
friends.
along above them with tremendous
That's
force,
all I'll
with a
be
smooth
to you.
swirling surface.
Go
As
lock
the
these
Nile subsides,
motherfuckers
steps
up
begin
right
filling
now.
until the river tumbles
If
violently.
not,
Its whole surface for miles churned to the white foam of broken water, thickly studded with black rocks.
I'm talking about lock up the head and not the
The
tail.
channel of the Nile is choked between limits.
Cause bitch, I'm not playing.
Stern walls of rock. These dark gorges present many perils to the navigator. The most formidable, the Bab el Kabir, is only 35 feet wide. The river here takes a plunge of 10 feet and 70 yards, and drops 5 feet at a single bound. An extensive pool above, formed by the junction of 2 arms of the river, increases the volume of the water and the force of the stream, so that the gate constitutes an obstacle of difficulty and danger which might well have been considered insurmountable. It had been expected that in the beginning of July, enough water would be passing down the second cataract to enable the gunboats and steamers waiting below to make the passage. Everything depended upon the rise of the river, and in the perversity of circumstances, the river this year rose much later and slower than usual. By the middle of August, however, the attempt appeared impossible. On the 14th, the first gunboat, the Matema, approached the cataract. The North Staffordshire Regiment from Gemai and the 6th and 7th Egyptian battalions from Kosheh marched to the gate to
Oh,
draw the
that
vessel
was bad.
firmly up in spite of the current. The best native pilots had been procured. Colonel Hunter and the naval officers under command of Colville directed the work. The boat had been carefully prepared for the ordeal. To reduce, by raising the
You
freeboard,
wanna arrest
risk of
these
swelling,
people?
the bows were heightened and strengthened, and stout wooden bulwarks were built running from bow to stern. Guns and ammunition were then removed, and the vessel lightened by every possible means. A strap of wire rope was passed completely round the hull, and to this strong belt the 5 cables were fastened, 2 on each side and 1 at the bow. So steep was the slope of the water that it was found necessary to draw all the fires, and the steamer was thus dependent entirely upon external force. It was luckily possible to obtain a direct pull for a crag of black rock rose above the surface of the pool.
Yes, you
opposite the
better.
gate. On this, a steel block was fixed, and the hawser was led away at right angles until it reached the east bank, where a smooth stretch of sand afforded a convenient place for the hauling parties. 2,000 men were then set to pull at the cables, yet such was the extraordinary force of the current that, although the actual distance in which these great efforts were necessary was scarcely 100 yards, the passage of each steamer occupied an hour and a half, and required the most strenuous exertions of the soldiers. No accident, however, occurred, and the 600 vessels accomplished the ascent on successive days. In a week, the whole flotilla steamed safely in the open water of the upper reach. And now for a moment it seemed that the luck of the expedition had returned. The cholera was practically extinct. The new gunboat Zephyr nearly ready at Kosheh, and her imposing appearance delighted and impressed the army. On the 23rd of August, all the 7 steamers which had passed the camp arrived in a stately procession opposite the camp. Almost at the same time, the wind changed to the north. A cool and delicious breeze refreshed the weary men, and bore southward to Suarda a whole fleet of sailing boats laden with supplies, which had been lying weatherbound during the previous 6 weeks at the head of the rapids. The preparatory orders for the advance tinkled along the telegraph. The North Staffordshire Regiment were, to the intense relief of officers and men, warned to hold themselves in readiness for an immediate move. The mounted troops had already returned to the front from the camps in which they had been distributed. At last, the miserable delay was over. From Kosheh to Kerma, the first dervish position, the distance by river is 127 miles. A study of the map shows that by land marches, this can be shortened by nearly 41 miles, 30 miles being saved by cutting across the great loop of the Nile from Kosheh to Sadin Fanti, and 11 miles by avoiding the angle from Farag to Abu Fatmeh. From Kerma to Dongola, which latter town was the objective of the expedition, a further distance of 35 miles must be traversed, making a total of 120 miles by land, or 161 by river. The long desert march from Kosheh to Sadin Fanti was the only natural difficulty by land. Although the river from Kosheh to Kerma is broken by continual rapids, it is, with one interval, freely navigable at half Nile. The Amarat Cataract, 10 miles beyond Kosheh, is easily ascended by sailing boats with a fair wind, and by steamers without assistance. From Amara to the Khyber Cataract stretches a reach of 65 miles of open water. The Khyber Cataract is, during the flood, scarcely any hindrance to navigation. But at Hanek, about 30 miles further on, the 3 miles of islands, rocks, rapids, and broken water which are called the Third Cataract are, except at High Nile, a formidable barrier. Once this is passed, there is open water for more than 200 miles at all seasons to Merawi. The banks of the river, except near Sadin Fanti, where the hills close in, are flat and low. The eastern bank is lined with a fringe of palm trees and a thin strip of cultivation, which constitutes what is called the fertile province of Dongola. On the other side, the desert reaches the water's edge. Along the right bank of this part of the river, the army was now to move. The first act of the advance was the occupation of Absarat, and on the 23rd of August, MacDonald's brigade marched thither from Suarda, cutting across the desert to Sadin Fanti, and then following the bank of the Nile. The occupation of Absarat covered the next movement. On the 26th, Lewis's brigade was ordered to march across the loop from Sadin Fanti and reinforce the brigade at Absarat. The distance of 37 miles was far too great to be accomplished without a system of watering places. This the Sirdar rapidly organized. Water depots were formed by carrying tanks and water skins on camels to 2 points in the desert, and replenishing them by daily convoys. But now a heavy calamity descended on the arrangements of the general and the hopes of the troops. During the afternoon of the 25th, the wind veered suddenly to the south. Thereupon a terrific storm of sand and rain, accompanied by thunder and lightning, burst over the whole of the Nubian desert, and swept along the line of communications from Suarda to Halfa. On the next day, a second deluge delayed the march of Lewis's brigade, but late on the 27th they started, with disastrous results. Before they had reached the first watering place, a third tempest, preceded by its choking sandstorm, overtook them. Nearly 300 men fell out during the early part of the night, and crawled and staggered back to Kosheh. Before the column reached Sadin Fanti, 1,700 more sank exhausted to the ground. Out of one battalion, 700 strong, only 60 men marched in. 9 deaths and 80 serious cases of prostration occurred, and the movement of the brigade from Kosheh to Absarat was grimly called the Death March. The Death March was the least of the misfortunes caused by the storms. The violent rains produced floods such as had not been seen in the Sudan for 50 years. The water, pouring down the broad valleys, formed furious torrents in the gorges. More than 12 miles of the railway was washed away. The rails were twisted and bent, the formation entirely destroyed. The telegraph wires were broken. The work of weeks was lost in a few hours. The advance was stopped as soon as it had been begun. At the moment when every military reason demanded speed and suddenness, a hideous delay became inevitable. In this time of crisis, the success of the whole campaign hung in the balance. Sir Herbert Kitchener did not then possess that measure of the confidence and affection of his officers, which his military successes have since compelled. Public opinion was still undecided on the general question of the war. The initial bad luck had frightened many. All the croakers were ready. A jingo government, an incapable general, another disaster in the Sudan. Such were the whispers. A check would be the signal for an outcry. The accounts of the Death March had not yet reached England, but the correspondents, irritated at being chained to headquarters, were going to see about that. And besides all this, there were the army to feed and the dervishes to fight. In this serious emergency, which threatened to wreck his schemes, the Sirdar's organizing talents shone more brilliantly than at any other moment in this account. Traveling swiftly to Mugrat, he possessed himself of the telephone, which luckily still worked. He knew the exact position of every soldier, coolie, camel, or donkey at his disposal. In a few hours, in spite of his crippled transport, he concentrated 5,000 men on the damaged sections of the line, and thereafter fed them until the work was finished. In 7 days, traffic was resumed. The advance had been delayed, but it was not prevented. On the 5th of September, the 1st, Lewis, and 2nd, MacDonald brigades moved to Dulga, and at the same time the remainder of the army began to march across the loop from Kosheh by Sadin Fanti to Absarat. Every available soldier had been collected for the final operation of the campaign. The expeditionary force was organized as follows. Commander-in-Chief, the Sirdar. The infantry division, Colonel Hunter commanding. 1st Brigade, commanded by Major Lewis, with the 3rd and 4th Egyptians, and the 9th and 10th Sudanese. The 2nd Brigade, commanded by Major MacDonald, with the 11th, 12th, and 13th Sudanese. 3rd Brigade, with Major Maxwell, comprised of the 2nd, 7th, and 8th Egyptians. 4th Brigade, with Major David, with the 1st, 5th, and 15th Egyptians. Cavalry Brigade and Mounted Forces, commanded by Major Byrne Murdoch. Cavalry, 8 squadrons. Camel Corps, 6 companies. Horse Artillery, 1 battery. The artillery was commanded by Major Parsons. Field Artillery comprised of 2 batteries. Maxims, 1 battery, British. Divisional troops commanded by Major Curry, the North Staffordshire Regiment, 1st Battalion. The flotilla was commanded by Commander Colville. Gunboats, Safir, Tamai, Abu Klea, Matema, El Ted. Armed steamers, Kaibar, Dal, Akasha. Total, 15,000 men, 8 war vessels, and 36 guns. Thus, 13 of the 16 battalions of the Egyptian army were employed at the front. 2 others, the 6th and 14th, were disposed along the line of communication, holding the various fortified posts. The 16th battalion of reservists remained in Suakin. The whole native army was engaged in the war, and the preservation of domestic order in the capital and throughout the Khedive's dominions was left entirely to the police and to the British Army of Occupation. By the 9th, all 4 brigades had reached the rendezvous at Dulga. On the 10th, the British regiment, which it was determined to send up in the steamers, was moved to Koche by rail from Saras and Gemai. The Sirdar prepared to start with the flotilla on the 12th. But a culminating disappointment remained. By tremendous exertions, the Zafir had been finished in time to take part in the operations. Throughout the army, it was expected that the Zafir would be the feature of the campaign. At length, the work was finished, and the Zafir floated, powerful and majestic, on the waters of the Nile. On the afternoon of the 11th of September, many officers and men came to witness her trial trip. The bank was lined with spectators. Colville took command. The Sirdar and his staff embarked. Flags were hoisted, and amid general cheering, the moorings were cast off. But the stern paddle had hardly revolved twice when there was a loud report, like that of a heavy gun. Clouds of steam rushed out from the boilers, and the engines stopped. Sir H. Kitchener and Commander Colville were on the upper deck. The latter rushed below to learn what had happened, and found that she had burst her low-pressure cylinder. This was impossible to repair until a new one could be for Alpha and fitted. In spite of this, however, the advance was not delayed. On the 13th, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd brigades occupied Kadura. Here the flotilla overtook them, and henceforward the boats on the river kept pace with the army on the bank. Herbike was reached on the 14th, and as the numerous palms by the water afforded a pleasant shade, a halt of 2 days was ordered. On the 16th, the 4th brigade arrived, and the concentration of the force was then complete. After the annihilation of his strong advanced post at Firket, the Dervish Emir, Wa'ad Bishara, concentrated his remaining forces in Dongola. Here, during the summer, he had awaited, and in the middle of August, some small reinforcements from one Emir of low rank reached him from Omdurman. The Khalifa, indeed, promised that many more should follow, but his promises long remained unfulfilled, and the greatest strength that Bishara could muster was 900 Jahadia, 800 Bagara Arabs, 2,800 spearmen, 450 camelmen, 650 cavalry, in all 5,600 men, with 6 small brass cannon and 1 mitrailleuse gun. To augment in numbers, if not in strength, this small force of regular soldiers, he impressed a large number of the local tribesmen, but as these were, for the most part, anxious to join the government troops at the first opportunity, their effect in the conflict was inconsiderable. The first sign that the forces were drawing closer was the cutting of the telegraph wire by a Dervish patrol on the 6th of September. On the 10th, the Sirdar heard that Kerma was strongly held. On the 15th of September, the Egyptian cavalry first established contact with the Dervish scouts, and a slight skirmish took place. On the 18th, the whole force advanced to Sardek, and as Bishara still held his position at Kerma, it looked as if an action was imminent. It was resolved to attack the Dervish position at Kerma at dawn. Although it seemed that only 4 miles separated the combatants, night passed quietly. With the first light, the army began to move, and when the sun rose, the spectacle of the moving masses of men and artillery, with the gunboats on the right, was inspiring. The soldiers braced themselves for the expected action. But no sooner were the village and fort of Kerma visible than the report passed along the ranks deserted. Rumor was soon merged in certainty, for on reaching Kerma, it was found that the dervishes had evacuated the place, and only a strong, well-built mud fort attested the recent presence of the Shah. Whither had he gone? The question was not left unanswered. Half a mile to the southward, on the opposite bank of the river, among the groves of palm trees ran a long and continuous line of shelter trenches and loopholed walls. The flanks of this new position rested on the deep morasses, which extend from the river both on the north and south sides of Hafir. A small steamer, a fleet of large gyassas, and other sailing vessels moored to the further shore, explained what had happened. Conscious of his weakness, the prudent Emir had adroitly transported himself across the river, and had thus placed that broad flood between his troops and their destruction. Meanwhile, the 3 gunboats, all that now remained of the armed flotilla, for the Tab had run on a rock in the Hanek cataract, were steaming gradually nearer the enemy. The army swung to the right, and, forming along the riverbank, became spectators of a scene of fascinating interest. At 6:30, the horse battery moved to the river's edge, and began to fire obliquely up and across the river. As soon as the first few shells had reached the Arab entrenchment, the whole line of shelter trenches was edged with smoke, and the dervishes responded with a heavy rifle fire. The distance was, however, too great for their bad rifles and inferior ammunition, and their bullets, although they occasionally struck the ground on which the infantry were drawn up, did not during the day cause any loss to the watching army. The dervish position was about half a mile in length. As the gunboats approached the northern end, they opened fire with their guns, striking the muddy entrenchments at every shot, and driving clouds of dust and splinters into the air. The Maxim guns began to search the parapets, and 2 companies of Staffordshire Regiment on board the unarmored steamers, Down and Akasha, fired long-range volleys. Now, as on other occasions throughout the war, the dervishes by their military behavior excited the admiration of their enemies. Encouraged by the arrival in the morning of a reinforcement from Omdurman of 1,000 black Jahadia, 500 spearmen under Abdel Baki, the dervish gunners stood to their guns and the riflemen to their trenches, and, although suffering severely, maintained a formidable fire. The gunboats continued to advance, beating up slowly against the strong current. As they came opposite Hafir, where the channel narrows to about 600 yards, they were received by a very heavy fire from guns placed in cleverly screened batteries, and from the riflemen sheltered in deep pits by the water's edge, or concealed amid the foliage of the tops of the palm trees. These aerial skirmishes commanded the decks of the vessels, and the shields of the guns were thus rendered of little protection. All the water around the gunboats were torn into foam by the projectiles. The bullets pattered against their sides, and, except where they were protected by steel plates, penetrated. One shell struck the Abu Klea on the waterline and entered the magazine. Luckily, it did not explode, the dervishes having forgotten to set the fuse. The shell struck the Mutema. On board the Tamai, which was leading, Commander Colville was severely wounded in the wrist. Armorer Sergeant Richardson was killed at his Maxim gun, and on each boat some casualties occurred. So hot was the fire that it was thought doubtful whether to proceed with the bombardment. The Tamai swung round and hurried down the river with the current, and at full steam to report to the Sirdar. The other gunboats remained in action, and continued to shell the dervish defenses. The Tamai soon returned to the fight, and, steaming again up the river, was immediately hotly re-engaged. The sight which the army witnessed was thrilling. Beyond the floodwaters of the river, backed against the sky of staring blue and in the blazing sunlight, the whole of the enemy's position was plainly visible. The long row of shelter trenches was outlined by the white smoke of musketry, and dotted with brightly colored flags waving defiantly in the wind, and with the still brighter flashes of the guns. Behind the entrenchments, and among the mud houses and enclosures, strong bodies of the jibba-clad Arabs were arrayed. Still further back in the plain, a large force of cavalry, conspicuous by the beams of light reflected from the broad-bladed spears, wheeled and moved. By the Nile, all the tops of the palm trees were crowded with daring riflemen, whose positions were indicated by the smoke puffs of their rifles, or when some tiny black figure fell, like a shot rook, to the ground. In the foreground, the gunboats, heading and pumping up the
Still
river,
saying,
were
I
surrounded
know
on
the
all
secret
sides by
betrayed
scouts
me
and
and
spurts of
Israel
water,
judged
thrown up by the shells and bullets.
forever.
Again, the flotilla drew near the narrow channel.
Forever.
Again, the watching army held their breath.
It's
And
ended.
again, they saw the leading boat, the Matema, turn and run downstream toward safety, pursued by the wild cheers of the Arabs. It was evident that the gunboats were not strong enough to silence the dervish fire. The want of the terrible Zafir was acutely felt. The firing had lasted 2 hours and a half. The enemy's resistance was no less vigorous than at the beginning of the action. The Sirdar now altered his plans. He saw that his flotilla did not hope to silence the dervishes. He therefore ordered De Rougemont, who had assumed the command after Koval was wounded, to run past the entrenchments without trying to crush their fire, and steam on to
Good
Dunbar.
luck.
To support and cover the movement, the 3 batteries of artillery under Major Parsons were brought into action on the swampy island of Artigasha, which was connected at this season to the right bank by a shoal. At the same time, 3 battalions of infantry were moved along the river until the Arab position. At 9 a.m., the 18 guns on the island opened a tremendous bombardment of 1,200 yards range on the entrenchments, and at the same time, the infantry and rocket
Apparently they know where everything is.
The artillery now succeeded in silencing 3 of the 5 dervish guns and in sinking the little dervish steamer Tara, while the infantry, by a
Right.
tremendous long-range fire, drove the rifle.
The helicopter on them
After
motherfuckers.
this, the gunboats at 10 o'clock moved up the river in line,
Right.
and disregarding the fusillade which the Arabs still stubbornly maintained, passed by the entrenchment and steamed on towards
I done
Dunbar.
dropped this little bit
After
of
this, the
coffee,
fire on
y'all
both sides
fuck.
began to intermittent. The fight may be said to have ended. Both forces remained during the day facing each other on opposite sides of the river, and the dervishes, who evidently did not admit defeat,
That's all I
brandished their
need,
rifles and
bitch.
waved their flags, and their shouts
Yep.
of loud defiance floated across the water to the
That's all I
troops.
need,
They have
bitch.
suffered very heavily. Their brave and
That's all I
skillful leaders
need,
were wounded by the
motherfuckers.
splinters of the shell. The wicked
Okay.
Muslim answer had been struck
That's all
by
I
the
need to
more
bring
than
is
200
justice,
men sorry,
alright?
including several Indians.
Yeah.
Moreover, a long train of wounded was seen to
Stand
start
for police, y'all finna be fucked up.
It is doubtful, however, whether Bashar would have retreated if he had not feared being cut off. He seems to have believed that the Sirdar
It's gonna be
would
an act of God.
once to Dunbar and cross there under cover of his gunboats. Like all Muslim soldiers, he was nervous about his long retreat. Nor, considering the overwhelming force against him, can we wonder? There was, besides this strategic reason for retiring, more concrete cause. All of his supplies of grain were accumulated in the Jayatas, which lay moored to the west bank. These vessels were under the close and accurate fire of the artillery and Maxim guns on the Gasha Island. Several times during the night, the hungry dervishes attempted to reach their store, but the moon was bright and the gunners watchful. Each time the enemy exposed themselves, a vigorous fire was opened and they were driven back. When morning dawned, which found that Hafir was evacuated and that the enemy had retreated on Dunbar. Why Bashar's anxiety about his line of retreat was unnecessary, for the Sirdar could not advance on Dunbar with a strong dervish force on his line of communications, and it was not desirable to divide the army and ask Hafir the covering force. But as soon as the dervishes had left their entrenchments, the situation was simplified. At daybreak, all the Arab boats were brought over to the right bank by the villagers, who reported that Bashar and his soldiers had abandoned the defense and were retreating to Dunbar. Thereupon the Sirdar, relieved of the necessity of forcing the passage, transported his army peacefully to the other bank. The operation of Fort Scott was part of his organization, and the whole force, complete with cavalry, camels, and guns,
My children
moved
been
across the
out.
broad rushing river in less than 36 hours, and without any apparent difficulty.
Anybody else?
The casualties on the 19th were not numerous, and in a force of nearly 15,000 men, they appear insignificant.
I don't think there's nothing wrong with me bothering a little bit of time with that.
11 native soldiers were
Okay.
wounded. The total of 14, amounted to less than 1 per thousand
They
each
not?
page. Nevertheless, this picturesque and bloodless affair has been solemnly called the Battle of Hafir.
No,
Dispatches were written for it. It is officially counted in records of service as a general action. Telegrams of congratulation were received from Her Majesty and the Khedive, a special class described. Of all the instances of Chico glory in the military history of recent years afford, Hafir is the most remarkable. The 20th and part of the 21st were occupied by the passage of the army across the line. Troops were still crossing when the gunboats returned from Dunbar. The distance of this place by water from Hafir is about 36 miles, and the flotilla had arrived opposite the town during the afternoon.
36 months.
A few shells expelled the small
69.
British garrison, and a large number of sailing vessels were captured. The results of the movement of the gunboats to Dunbar must, however, be looked for and feared. In consequence of the Sirdar's maneuver, that place was evacuated, and the unopposed passage of the river was secured. Bashar continued his retreat
Y'all
during the
protection
fall,
is
and,
removed.
marching all day, reached Nondelik in the evening.
Forever.
Wounded as he was, he reoccupied the town, and fortified preparations for defense against
I'll
the fortifications. The knowledge of his employment was not hidden from his enemy.
I'll
General
let
First
me.
Lieutenant Abu Klea, under Lieutenant Beatty, R.N., arrived with the design of keeping him occupied.
No, you
Throughout
can
the day,
do
a
it.
sultry duel was maintained.
You got it in you, you can do all this dumb
Failing on the
shit.
22nd, Beatty was reinforced
You
by
gotta do you to raise
and
some
seizing bombardment
kids
was made on the 10th.
and sell them, bitch.
Notwithstanding that the army did not finish
Make
crossing
your way
the
to
river
me with my check.
first, the Sirdar determined to continue.
Pray that I care about
The force of
rewriting your
Fort
damn
March further south,
future.
camped opposite the middle of the large island of Argo. At daybreak, the troops started again, and before the sun had attained its greatest power,
Pray
reached
that I
Dover.
care.
This place was scarcely 6 miles from Davila, and, as it was expected that an action would be fought the next day, the rest of 18 hours was welcomed by the weary soldiers. All day long, the army remained halted by the palms of the Nile bank. Looking through their glasses up the river, the officers might watch the gunboats methodically bombarding Davila, and the sound of the guns was clearly heard. At intervals during the day,
Guns,
both
officers.
horse and foot approached the outpost line, and shots
Just
were
see the
exchanged.
red ambulance.
All these things, together with the consciousness that the
All
culmination of the
these
campaign
things.
was now at hand, raised the excitement of the army.
Got a
for
little consciousness.
Everyone lay down that night, warmed by keen anticipations. An atmosphere of unrest hung over the bivouac, and few stopped shouting. At 3 o'clock, the troops were aroused, and at 4:30, final advance.
Take around 3 o'clock. What time it
Full
is?
moon, shining with copper,
3:20.
in the sky, vaguely revealed the rolling plains of sand and the huge moving mass of the army. As long as it was dark, the battalions were closely formed in quarter
As long
columns.
as it was
Presently,
dark.
the warmer, yellower light of dawn began to grow across the river through the palms, and gradually, as the sun rose and it became daylight, dense formations of the army was extended to an array more than 2 miles long. On the left, nearest the river, marched Lewis's brigade, 3 battalions in line, 4th in column as a reserve. Next in order, Maxwell's 3 battalions
That's
were
all
on the line.
right.
The artillery were in the center, supported by the North Staffordshire Regiment. Guns of the Texas Army had found their place, so that the lines and columns of yellow and brown were relieved by a vivid flash of British red. McDonald's brigade was on the right. David's brigade followed in rear of the center.
Sorry, that's my own little
The cavalry, horse artillery watched the right flank, and on the left the gunboats steeped along the river. For 2 hours, the army were the only living things visible on the smooth sand. At 7 o'clock, a large body of dervish horses appeared on the right flank. Further advanced half a mile discovered the Arab forces. Their numbers were less than those of the
They wanna
Egyptians.
play
Their
mine.
lovely flags conspicuous on sand, and the rows of flags of many colors.
Still playing,
Their
sending bitches to it.
determined aspect, no less than
Distract me.
representation of
Anybody who do
the
that
sharp.
is getting shit here.
The disparity of the forces was, however, too great. And as the
Road.
Egyptian army steadily advanced, the dervishes slowly retired. Their retreat was cleverly covered by the Baggara horse, who, by continually threatening the
Smoke
desert,
weed
fled
every
across the
day.
rivers.
Shout out to make dog
which
recipes,
the
by
rebels were now
man.
concentrating the fire, but continued to retire in excellent order towards the south and Delhi.
Proud of
The Egyptian infantry halted at Dongola, which when they arrived, they found already in the hands of detachments from the flotilla.
it.
The red flag of the President Star
Hey.
waved once again from the roof of the Madeira. The garrison of 400 black Jahalia had capitulated and were already fraternizing with their Sudanese captors, whose comrades in arms they were soon to be. While the infantry occupied the town, the cavalry and camel corps were dispatched in pursuit. The Baggara horse, however, maintained a firm attitude and attempted several charges to cover the retreat of their infantry. In one of these, an actual collision occurred, and Captain Adams's squadron of Egyptian cavalry inflicted the loss of 6 killed on the enemy, at a loss to themselves of 8
Da,
men.
da, da,
The
da, da.
cavalry and camel corps were not casualties in the pursuit. But although the dervishes thus
It's the motherfucker D
the
R
influence of
E.
retreat soon impaired their discipline.
You know I remember the D-O-double-G.
Were captured by the pursuers. The line of retreat was strewn with weapons and other effects. So many babies were abandoned by their parents that an
Where are they
artillery
now?
was to collect and carry them. Juan Bashar, Osman Azra, and the Baggara horse, however, made good their flight across the desert to Metena, and in spite of terrible sufferings from thirst, retained sufficient discipline to detach a force to hold Abu Klea Wells in case the retreat was followed. The Dervish infantry made their way along the river to Abu
Snoop
Ahmed and were much harassed by the
Dogg.
gunboats until they reached the fourth cataract, when the pursuit was brought to an end. The Egyptian losses in the capture of Dongola and the subsequent pursuit were British, nil. Native ranks, killed 1, wounded 25, total 26. The occupation of Dongola terminated the campaign in 1896. About 900 prisoners, mostly the Black Jahalia, all of the 6 brass cannon, large stores of grain, a great quantity of flags, spears, and swords fell to the victors. The whole of the province, said to be the most fertile in the Sudan, was restored to the Egyptian authority. The existence of a perpetual clear waterway from the head of the third cataract to the Rawi enabled gunboats at once to steam up the river for more than 200 miles. In the course of the following month, the greater part of the army was established in Rawi, below the fourth cataract, at Depot, or in Persia, drawing supplies along the railway, and from the railhead by a boat service on the long reach of open water. The position of a strong force after Rawi, only 120 miles along the riverbed from Abu Hamed, the northern Dervish post, was, as will be seen, convenient to the continuance of the campaign whenever the time should arrive. But a long delay in the advance was now inevitable, and nearly a year was destined to pass without any collision between the forces of the Khedive and those of the Khalifa. The success of the operations caused great public satisfaction in England. The first step had been taken. The Sudan was re-entered. After 10 years of defensive war, the dervishes had been attacked, and it was clear that when they were attacked with adequate forces, they were not so very careful after all. The croakers were silent. A general desire was manifested in the country that the operations should continue, and although the government did not yet abandon their tentative policy, or resolve utterly to destroy the Khalifa's power, it was decided that, as the road had so far been safe and pleasant, there was at present no need to stop or turn back. A general gazette of orders was published, with a single exception, which it would be invidious to specify. All the officers of the Egyptian army were mentioned in dispatches. Sir H. Kitchener, Colonel Hunter, and Colonel Rundle were promoted major generals for distinguished service in the field. A special medal,
Ain't
on
no
whose ribbon
mountain
blue
high
showed
enough,
through the
ain't
yellow
no
desert
valley
of Struggle.
low enough.
And both the engagement at Firket and the affair at Hafir were commemorated by plaques. The casualties during the campaign, including the fighting round Suakin, were 43 killed and 139 wounded. 130 officers and men died from cholera, and there were 126 deaths from other causes. A large number of British officers were also
Those
implicated.
horns.
End of chapter 7.
Motorcycle. Moped.
Chapter 8 of The River War.
Chapter 8
This
of
league
the
box recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 8 The Desert Railway. It often happens that in prosperous
Fuck the
countries,
police.
the laws of the nation and the rewards of the sovereign are bestowed on those whose offices are splendid and whose duties have been
We
commended.
don't need to
Others
practice
whose
on
labors
our
are
street.
responsible and vital to success are unnoticed.
Fuck the
This is true
police.
again. It is also
Fuck
true
the
of the
police.
In a tale of war, the reader's mind is filled with the fight, the battle, with its vivid scenes, its
So
moving
kids,
incidents, its
look
plain
at
and
that.
tremendous results, excites and
Fuck
animates
'em.
man's attention.
Bust
The
'em.
eye is fixed on the fighting brigades as they move amid the smoke, on the
Fuck
swarming
'em.
figures of the
Bust
enemy, on the general.
Y'all finna
the
go to
enemy,
jail
on the enemy,
yourselves,
on the
bitch.
The long traded line of communications is unnoticed. The fierce glory that plays on red triumphant bayonets dazzles the observer. Nor does he care to look behind to where,
Y'all don't give a
on
fuck,
rail,
huh?
road and river,
I'm here.
convoys are crawling to the front,
It's
uninterrupted.
alright though.
Victory is the beautiful, bright-colored flower. Transport is the stem without
It's
which it could
okay.
not have blossomed. Yet even the military student, in his zeal to master the fascinating combinations of the actual conflict, often forgets the far more intricate complications of supply. It cannot be denied that a battle, the climax to which all military operations tend, is an event which is not controlled by strategy or organization. The scheme may be well planned, the troops well fed, the ammunition plentiful, and the enemy intent, famished, or numerically inferior. The glorious uncertainties of the field can yet
Shit.
reverse everything. The human element, in defiance of experience and probability, may produce a wholly irrational result, and a starving, outmaneuvered army win food, safety, and honor by their bravery. But such considerations apply with greater force to wars where both sides are equal in equipment and discipline. In savage warfare, in a flat country, the power of modern machinery is such that
Energy.
flesh and blood can scarcely
Y'all
live.
putting all this
Chances of
energy
battle
in
are
this
reduced to
shit. Yeah,
Fighting the
go
dervishes was
need
primarily a
them,
matter
don't
of
need them.
transport. The Khalifa was conquered on the railway. Hitherto, as the operations have progressed, it has been convenient to speak of the railway in a general manner as having
Doing
been made or
that,
extended to various
hanging
points,
yourself.
merely to indicate the direction of the
Cause
lines of
I'm
communication.
strong.
We
Straight
were now
car.
invited to take a closer view.
Hell no.
This chapter is concerned with boats, railways, and pack animals, but particularly
Ah.
railways. Throughout the Dongola campaign in 1896, the Nile was the main channel of communication between the expeditionary force and its base in Egypt. All supplies were brought to the front as far as possible by water transport.
Well, these practice on ice cream.
Other means of conveyance, by railways and pack animals, though
Fuck
essential,
the
were very
police.
supplementary. Boats carry more and cost less than any other form of transport. The service is not so liable to interruption. The plant needs only simple repair. The waterway is ready-made. But the Nile is not always available. Frequent cataracts obstruct its course for many miles. Other long reaches are only navigable when the river is in flood. To join the navigable
Who y'all
reaches,
listen
thus
to
preserve
telling
continuity
y'all
of
to listen
communications,
to this
a
shit?
complex system of railways and caravans was necessary.
Who's that here?
A line of railway was required to connect the two navigable reaches of the Nile, which extend from Aswan to Wadi Halfa and from Kerma to Merawi. For the capture of Dongola, however, this distance was shortened by the fact that the river at High Nile is navigable between the Third Cataract and Kerma. In consequence, it was at first only necessary to construct the stretch of 108 miles from Wadi Halfa to Kosheh. During the years when Wadi Halfa was the southernmost garrison of the Egyptian forces, a strong post had been maintained at Saras. In the Nile expeditions of 1885, the railway from Halfa had been completed through Saras and as far as Akasha, a distance of 86 miles. After the abandonment of the Sudan, the dervishes destroyed the line as far north as Saras. The old embankments were still standing, but the sleepers had been burnt and the rails torn up. In many cases, bends were twisted. The position in 1896 may, in fact, be summed up as follows. The section of 33 miles from Wadi Halfa to Saras was immediately available and in working order. The section of 53 miles from Saras to Akasha required partial reconstruction. The section of 32 miles from Akasha to Kosheh must, with the exception of 10 miles of embankment completed in 1885, at once be newly made. And finally, the section from Kosheh to Kerma must be completed before the Nile flood subsided. The first duty, therefore, which the engineer officers had to perform was the reconstruction of the line from Saras to Akasha. No trained staff or skilled workmen were available. The lack of men with technical knowledge was doubtfully supplied by the enlistment of a railway 800 strong. These men were drawn from many tribes and classes. Their only qualification was capacity and willingness for work. They presented a motley appearance. Dervish prisoners, but still wearing their jibbas, assisted stalwart Egyptians in unloading rails and sleepers. Dinkas, Shiluks, Jalin, and Barabas shoveled contentedly together at the embankments. 100 civilian Sudanese, chiefly time-expired soldiers, were also employed. And these, since they were trustworthy and took an essential pride in their work, soon learned the arts of spiking rails and sleepers, fishing rails together, and straightening. To direct and control the labors of these men of varied race and language, but of equal inexperience, some civilian foremen platelayers were obtained at high rates of pay from Lower Egypt. These, however, with very few exceptions, were not satisfactory. They were gradually replaced by intelligent men of the railway battalion, who would learn their trade as the line progressed. The projection, direction, and execution of the whole work were entrusted to a few subalterns of engineers, of whom the best known was Edouard Girard. Work was begun south of Saras at the latter end of March. At first, the efforts of so many unskilled workmen, instructed by few experienced officers, were productive of results ridiculous rather than important. Gradually, however, the knowledge and energy of the young director and the intelligence and devotion of his still more youthful subordinates began to take effect. Pace of construction increased, and the labor was lightened by the contrivances of experience and skill. As the line grew longer, native officers and non-commissioned officers from the active and reserve lists of the Egyptian army were appointed station masters. Intelligent non-commissioned officers and men were converted to guards and pointsmen. Traffic was controlled by telephone. To work the telephone, men were discovered who could read and write. Very often who could read and write only their own names, and even that with such difficulty that they usually preferred a seal. They developed into clerks by a simple process of selection. To improve their education, and to train a staff in the office work of a railway, 2 schools were instituted at Halfa. In these establishments, which were formed by the shade of 2 palm trees, 20 pupils received the beginnings of knowledge. The simplicity of the instruction was aided by the zeal of students, and learning grew beneath the palm trees more quickly perhaps than in the magnificent schools of civilization. The rolling stock of the Halfa-Saras line was in good order, sufficient quantity, but the locomotives was out of all repair, had to be patched up again and again with painful repetition. Regularity of the breakdowns prevented the regularity of the road.
Painful repetition.
During the Dongola expedition and in its early days. Nor were there wanting those who employed their wits in scoffing at the undertaking and pouring thoughtless indignation on the engineers. Nevertheless, the work went on continually. The initial difficulties of the task were aggravated by an unexpected calamity. On the 26th of August, the violent cyclonic rainstorm, of which some account has been given in the last chapter, broke over the Dongola province. The writer on the earlier phases of the war, A. Hilliard Atteridge, in Towards Freedom, has also explained why the consequences were so serious. In a country where rain is an ordinary event, the engineer lays his railway line not in the bottom of a valley, but at a higher level on one slope or the other. Where he passes across branching side valleys, he takes care to leave in all his embankments large culverts to carry off floodwater. But here, in what was thought to be the rainless Sudan, the line south of Saras followed for mile after mile the bottom of the long valley of Khor Arusha, and no provision had been made, or had been thought necessary, for culverts in the embankments, where minor hollows were crossed. Thus, when the flood came, it was not merely that the railway was cut through here and there by the rushing deluge. It was covered deep in water, the ballast was swept away, and some of the banks so destroyed that in places, rails and sleepers were left hanging in the air across a wide gap.
Communication rejected.
Nearly 14 miles of track were destroyed.
Rejected.
The camp of the construction gangs was wrecked and flooded. Some of the rifles of the
Pisces child here doing some foolish stuff with magic.
Feet of sand. In one place, where the embankment had partly withstood the deluge, a great lake several square.
Quick action on doing it too. The cursor.
Because the as far as Kosheh was completely advanced towards Dongola began. After the army had been victorious at Hafir, the whole province was cleared of dervishes, and the Egyptian forces fled to Merawi. Here they were dependent on river transport, but the Nile was falling rapidly, and the army was in danger of being stranded by the interruption of river traffic between the Third Cataract and Kenna. The extension of the line from Kosheh to Kerma was therefore of vital importance. And a suitable route was chosen through the newly acquired and unmapped territory. Of the 95 miles of extended track, 56 were through the desert, and the constructors here gained the experience which was afterwards found on the Great Desert Railway from Halfa to the line in order to begin to make the amendments. Traffic on the 9th of October, and the whole work was carried forward with feverish.
She discovered to take her time with y'all motherfuckers.
The reach of the river from the Third Cataract to Kenna.
Even though she know how to block the crazy attack.
From the head of which an elaborate system of camel transport.
She know y'all try to hold on to her and plant seeds to work up.
But the problem of feeding the field army without interfering with the railway construction was one.
She realized her prophecy. Okay.
The worn out engines frequently broke down.
Shut up.
Free work in working order, and the other 5
Need to land y'all motherfuckers somehow, some way with her
3
mind.
times the construction had to be
When she
suspended.
received justice, clear y'all ass way of protecting herself somehow, some
The
way.
line to Kenna was
Keep coming up.
Its subalterns and its director turned their attention to a greater enterprise. In the first week in December, the Sir
Give it to her.
instructions or permission to continue the advance towards Khartoum, and the momentous question of the route to be followed
Keep
arose.
cursing her, she
The
get
first and only
powerful.
course was to continue to work along the Nile.
She
Next,
protected
the
from
region
being
was set to the
trapped.
railway. But from Rawawi to Abu Hamid,
Give it
the
to
river is
her.
broken by continual cataracts, and the broken ground of both
Yeah.
banks made a railway nearly an impossibility. The movements of the French
I
expedition
taught her how to
was
transition secret betrayal.
Egypt's compelled economy. The Nile route was
With
short,
my
but slow
mind.
and very expensive. A shortcut must be
That's what
found.
it said.
Three daring and ambitious schemes presented themselves. One,
Y'all
followed by the
wanna
desert
learn how to
route
do
from
it?
Korti to Metemma. Two,
You gotta
the
learn how to do
Victorious
it.
route from Suakin to Berber. Three,
That's how much
across
I
the Nubian
love
desert from Carrasco or Wadi Halfa to Abu Hamid.
Wish his
The question
sickness
involved
on
the whole
her
strategy of the war.
for
No
money.
more important decision was ever taken by Sir Herbert Kitchen,
Okay.
whether in office or in action. The request for a British division
Foolish
to
act
on
gonna
Mahmud's
be in the
Saliba.
spell
Great
here, and
gun
she
wheels towards
gonna
Mahmud
heal.
during that battle. The treatment of the Marchand expedition
Her mama
and that
gonna be
was resolved in
heartbroken.
the selection of the line of advance. The known strength of the Khalifa made it evident that
Revealed
powerful
to the
forces
court.
required the destruction of his army and the capture of
My
his capital.
mama
The use of railway transport to some point on the Nile, once there was
did
clear
all the
water,
shit
was
here
therefore
for money,
imperative.
or whoever
Berber
the
and
fuck
Metemma were
got
and
into
Abu
it.
Hamid was believed
It's
to
gonna be
be
heartbreak
Although
forever.
Berber and Metemma were important strategic points, it was
Drop
improbable
their
that
ass
the Dervishes
off.
would abandon these keys to Khartoum and the Sudan without severe resistance. It seemed likely indeed
Shackle
that the
hand and
Khalifa would
feet.
strongly reinforce both towns and desperately contest their possession. The deserts between Korti and
Every
Metemma,
last
between
one of them.
Suakin and Berber, contained scattered wells, and small raiding parties might have cut the
Ain't
railway
that how
across
y'all
the
do me
starving
when I
Ahmed's
go
head.
to jail?
It was therefore too dangerous to project the railway towards either Berber or Metemma
Dangerous.
until they were actually in our hands. The argument is circular. The towns could not be taken without a strong force, so strong a force could not advance until the railway was
Strong
made,
force
and the railway
could
could
not
not be made
be
until the towns were
advanced.
taken. Both the Korti Metemma and the Suakin Berber routes were therefore rejected.
They was
Resolution
like,
to exclude the latter
I
was further
picked her
strengthened by
up,
the fact that the
she's
labor of building a railway over the hills
not
behind
being
Suakin would have been very great. The route
combative.
via Abu Hamid was selected by
They
the
be
exclusion
reporting
of
on
the
my
Dervishes,
ass
but it had
when they
distinctive
lock my ass up.
Abu Hamid was within striking distance
She's
of the
not
Ottoman
no
Empire. It
combative.
was not a point essential to the Dervish defenses, and not therefore
Yeah,
likely to be so
bitch.
strongly garrisoned as Berber or Metemma.
Where's
It would therefore be
the
captured by a column marching along the river, and sufficiently small to be equipped with only camel transport.
Wade in the
The deserts
water?
through which the
Wade
railways
in
of
the
Abu Hamid
water.
would pass contained few wells, and therefore it would be difficult for small raiding parties to cut the line or attack the construction gangs. And before the line got within reach of the Dervish garrison at Abu Hamid, that
Touch my
garrison would be dislodged.
motherfucking knees.
Please
I done
succeed.
told them.
The plan was perfect. The
Anybody
Mark was
fuck
favored
with
and
them
conclusive.
is fucked.
It turned, however, on one point. Was the desert
In
railway
the
on
water,
possibility?
children.
With this question, the general was now confronted. He appealed to expert opinion. Eminent railway engineers and work
I'm
consultants.
gonna write
They
the
replied
fuck
with
out of
unanimity
the
that,
University
having due regard
Church
to
of
the
Harvest.
circumstances,
I don't
and
like
remembering
the
the conditions of
bitches
war
looking
under which
at
the work must
me,
be executed, it was
questioning
impossible to
anything
discuss
I
such a
think about me.
Distinguished soldiers were
Every
approached on the
bitch
subject.
does
They replied that
dead.
the scheme was not only impossible but absurd.
Everything
Many
in
other
their life
persons who were
is
not consulted
dead.
volunteered the opinion that the whole idea was that of a lunatic, and predicted
Get
ruin
rid
and
of the
disaster to
whole
the
building,
expedition.
bitch.
Having received this advice and reflected on it duly, decided the railway to be constructed without more
We're gonna
delay.
pull a hole of
A
water
further question
right there.
immediately arose. Should the railway to Abu Hamid start from Carrasco or from Wadi Halfa? There were arguments on both
Rain
sides.
over
The
the
adoption of the Carrasco line
send
would reduce
the
river
send
station
the
from
roughest
48
sword
miles
to the
stream.
University
The old
Church of
caravan route, which
Harvest.
General Gordon had traveled to Khartoum on his
Oh,
last journey,
God,
had been from
Mike.
Carrasco via Nurek Wells to Abu Hamid.
Swallow them
On
in
the
the
other hand,
storm.
many workshops and appliances for construction were already existing at Wadi Halfa.
Right now,
It was the northern terminus of the Dublin Railway.
force
This
everybody
was an
down.
enormous advantage. Both routes were reconnoitered. That from Wadi Halfa was selected.
Everybody step
The
foot
decision had
in.
been taken. The enterprise was at once begun. Lieutenant Girouard, to whom everything was entrusted, was told to make the necessary estimates. Sitting in his hut at Wadi
Ain't
Halfa,
nothing
he
to
drew up a
make
comprehensive
things
list.
over.
Nothing was
Living
forgotten.
God.
Every want was provided for.
Because
How much carrying
Jehovah
capacity
God.
was required? How much rolling stock? How many engines? What spare parts? How much oil? How many
Hey,
lathes?
Gabriel.
How many cutters? How many punching and shearing machines? What arrangements of signals would be
Not
necessary?
justice.
How many lamps? How many points? How many
Me
trolleys?
and my
What amount of
divine
coal should be
DNA
poured?
right now.
How much water would be wanted?
Forever
How should it be
modified
carried?
by
To what
force.
extent would its carriage affect the hauling power and influence all previous calculations? How much railway plant was needed? How many miles of rail? How many thousand sleepers?
Remove
Where
my
could we procure
enemies
such
away
short notice?
into
How many
the
fish
fire,
was necessary?
cast
What
them
tools would
in
be
that
required?
by
What plants? What
force.
machinery? How much skilled labor was wanted? How much of the class of labor available?
Destroy
How
the
many workers
enemy,
would be added?
enemy's plot
How soon would they
against
want
me.
it? How many trains a day must be run to
Destroy
keep
the
them in
enemy's
school?
plot
How many
against
must
me.
be run to carry plant? How did these requirements affect the
What's
effort
the
for rolling stock?
enemy's plot
The
against
answers
me?
to all these questions and to many others, which I will not
Twist
inflict
all
here,
evil
were set forth by
plots
Lieutenant
against
Girouard in
me.
a ponderous volume several inches thick, and such was
Make
the
it
comprehensive accuracy
backfire
of the
on
estimate
them
that
right
the working
now
parties were never
by
denied by the
fire
law,
and
even of
by
a piece of wax
force.
wire. In any
Every
circumstances, the
attempt
task would
of
have been
evil
enormous.
against
It was,
me
however,
and my
complicated
divine
by important
DNA.
considerations. It had to be executed with
Generations
military
to
precautions.
come
There was
on
apparently no
forever
water going
now
on. The
freezing.
feeding of 2,000 plate layers
Twist
of barren
the
desert was a
enemy's
problem
plot.
in itself. The work had to be completed before
King
winter.
Jehovah
And finally, the
Jireh.
money voted was not to be outrun.
Remove the
Sir Darrell
enemy's
attended to the last of it.
protection.
Girard was sent to England to buy
Now
standard rolling stock.
and
15 new
forever
lines and 200 trucks
freezing.
were ordered. The necessary new workshops were commenced at Halfa.
Do
The
not
students
allow
were procured
it
to direct them.
to
1,500
be
additional
shielded
enlisted in
from
the railway battalion
anything
and trained.
but
The
death.
water question was dealt with. The reconnoitering surveys had reported that though the line was
Allow
certain to be
death
easy for
only.
110
My
miles. And
enemies.
according to Arab accounts, for the remaining
Yes,
120
all
miles,
cursed
no
to
drop of
me,
water was
all
to be
trying
found.
to
And only
distract
2
me
lengths
about
of
that
last
to
were
them.
known. Camel
All
transport was
create
the
an
stop the
illusion
pressure.
over my
Each engine has,
divine
first of all,
DNA.
enough water to carry it to railhead and back, besides the reserve against accidents.
Allow
It was
death
evident
to
that the
them.
quantity of water required by any locomotive would continually increase
All
as the
trying to
rest and the
create
distance grew greater,
anything that
until
is
finally
harsh
the material
towards
trains
my
would have
life.
one-third of their
Allow
carrying power,
death to
absorbed
them.
and transported the water for their own consumption.
It cannot be
The amount of water
allowed in
necessary
the
was
name
largely
of King
dependent on the grades of
Jehovah
the line.
Jireh.
The flat desert proved to be a steady slope up to a height of 1,600 feet above Alpha.
For
and
I am
populations
his
were further
child.
complicated. The difficulty had, however, to be faced.
And in the holy name of
1,500 gallon tanks were
Jehovah, I
procured.
shall have
These were mounted on
victory
trucks
and
and connected by hose.
justice, and my
Animal striking
enemies
characteristic
shall
of the
be
trains of the Sudan
remained
military
with
railway
fire.
was the long succession of
With
enormous
no
bunches on
blessings
wheels,
from
on
the
which the motor power of the
divine.
engine and the lives of the passengers depended.
now
The
and
first vehicle
forever
of sand on the Desert
freezing.
Railway was turned on the first day of 1897, but until May, when the line to Kerma was finished, no great efforts were made, and only 40
I'm a
miles of
child
have
of
been laid.
God.
In the meanwhile, the men of the new
And
railway
so is
company
my
were being
divine
trained. The plans
DNA.
flowed steadily and
Anybody
Placed on
Yeah,
material of
do
all sorts arrived
anything
from England. From the growing
evil.
workshops at Alpha, the continual clattering clanging
sending
hammers,
any
and the
evil
waxing of manufacture
attachment
rose to the
of
heavenly sky.
demon
The malodorous incense of
forces
civilization was offered to the startled gods of the earth.
against
All
it
this was preparation, nor was it until the 8th of May that track laying into the desert
shall
began
be
in earnest.
killed,
The whole
murdered,
construction gangs and railroad
suicide.
staff were brought from Kerma
I
to
don't
Wadi
care
Halfa.
what
The
happened
daring
to
fighters of
them in
modern
the
war
name
started
of
on their
King
long march through the
Jehovah.
wilderness, dragging their
Stop
load
their
behind them.
hearts
Safe
right
and sure
now,
roads,
King
infantry,
Jehovah.
cavalry, guns, and gunboats might follow with speed and convenience. It is scarcely within the power of
Allow
words
them
to
to
describe
know
the
that
savage
their
desert
last
regions
breath is
into which the
going to
line
be
and its
taken
destructors plunged.
very
The
soon.
smooth ocean of bright-colored
In
sand
the
stretched
name
far
of the
and
mighty
wide
King
into distant
Jehovah
horizons. The
Jireh.
tropical sun beat with senseless perseverance upon the level surface.
Allow them to
until the
have
strength of the
nothing
hand to hand.
that haunts
Filling
them
the air
but
glittering
death.
shimmered as over a furnace. Here and there, huge masses of crumbling rock rose from the plain, like islands of cinders in a sea of fire. Alone in this vast expanse stood Railhead, a canvas town of 2,500 inhabitants, complete with station, stores, post office,
Shall
telegraph
anyone
office, and
attempt
canteen, and
to
only connected
be
with the living world of
aggressive
men and
towards
ideas by two
anything
parallel
that
iron
is
streets,
of my
3
divine
feet, 6 inches
DNA?
apart, growing dim and narrower in the long perspective,
With
until they were twisted
evil
apart by the mirage
attachment.
and vanished in the indefinite distance. Every
Stronghold of
morning in the
evil.
remote nothingness there appeared a black speck,
Allow it
growing
to be
larger and
casted
clearer,
in the
until
fire
the
with
whistle of
death.
and clatter amid the aching silence of ages.
Right
The
now.
material train arrived, carrying its own
By
water
fire and by
300 yards of
force.
rails, sleepers, and
The
accessories.
enemies
At
are
noon came another
dead,
smith,
all of
developing
them.
in a similar manner into
In
a
the
supply
name
train,
of the mighty
also
King
carrying its own
Jehovah
water,
Jireh,
including
the
water for the
God.
battalion of the escort and the 2,000 artificers and platelayers. As the
Archangel
letters,
Michael,
newspapers,
loving
sausages,
ancestors,
jam,
deceased
whiskey,
loved
soda water,
ones,
and
I
cigarettes,
ask you
which
please
enabled the
come
Britons
in
to
and
conquer the world
call
without
upon your
discomfort.
loving
And
name.
presently the empty trains would depart, reversing the process of their arrival, and vanishing gradually
All
along the line
kindred
which appeared at grass,
spirits.
to turn up into the air and
All
run at
kindred
tangent into an
souls.
unreal world. The life of the strange and lonely town was
All
characterized by a
relatable to
machine
my
like
mind.
regularity, born perhaps of
I
the
call
iron road from
upon
which it
you.
derived its nourishment. Daily at 3 o'clock in the morning,
Mind,
the
body,
traffic
and
started with
soul,
the
and
bank
in
cars.
spirit,
With the dawn, the
please.
material train arrived. The plate laying gangs
Allow
swarmed
your
over the
prayers to
clusters of
connect
farms,
with
and
mine
were
and
carried to
be
the
in
extreme middle of the track.
agreement.
Every man knew his task, and knew too
All
that
our
he would return to
enemies
camp
are
when it was
dead
finished,
against
and not
our
before.
divine
Warren
DNA.
quickly
They
set
shall
easily
be
to work without
killed.
necessity of an order. 100
In the
yards of
mighty
material
name
was
of
unloaded.
King
Sleepers were
Jehovah.
arranged in long succession. The rails were spiked to every alternate sleeper, and then the great 80-ton engine moved
They
cautiously
shall be
forward
in
along the
prison
exhausted track, like an
now
elephant
and
flying across a
forever.
bridge.
In the name
The
of
operation
King
was to be
Jehovah
continued through the
Jireh.
hours of the burning day. Behind the train there followed other gangs of platelayers, who completed the spiking and ballasting process.
Archangel
When the sun
Michael,
sank beneath the sands
remove
of the
my
horizon,
enemy's
and the engine
protection.
pushed the empty trucks and the
It shall
laden
not
cars
be
to the railroad.
protected in
Pushing back
anything
over a
of
finished and
evil.
permanent line. There was a brief interval while the
Right
campfires
now.
flickered in the waste,
And
like the
forever.
lights of a liner in mid-ocean, while the
God.
till morning brought the glitter which the
And his
construction gangs
righteous
had
children.
The sinking of the wells, an enterprise at which the friendly Arabs scoffed, was begun on the Sirdar's personal
Everything
commission, but
against
also
it is
partially
dead
observed
in
as
the
a
name
success
of
was
King
won by
Jehovah.
calculation. For, since the first 2 wells were made, 8 others of greater depth had been bored, and in no case has water been obtained. As the railway had been made, the telegraph wire had, of course, followed it. Every consignment of rails and sleepers had been accompanied by its proportion of telegraph poles, insulators, and wire. Another subaltern of engineers, Lieutenant Manifold, who managed this part of the military operations against the Arabs, had also laid a line from Marawi to Abu Hamid, so that immediate correspondence
Burn
was
they
made
homes,
between Arsenal,
Jehovah.
and River. The labors of the railway battalion
All they
and the
descent.
completion of the line to Abu Hamid. The desert railway was made. It had now to be maintained.
Right now by fire, by
The
force.
terminus of Helfa had become a busy town.
Shall they make any strike against me? Right now, Jehovah, King Jireh.
And elaborate machines. Plant of all kinds purchased in Cairo.
That's right.
Acquisition from England, with odds and ends collected.
Your
from
mighty
different
name.
factories,
This is
filled
your
with an
kingdom,
extraordinary
Jehovah.
variety of stores. Foundries, lathes, dynamos, steam hammers, hydraulic presses, cupolas,
All
machines,
control
cutting
come
machines,
from God,
drills had
the
been
living
set up
God,
in
King
England.
Jehovah
They
Jireh.
needed constant attention. Every appliance for repairing each must be provided. To haul the tonnage necessary to supply the army and extend the line, nearly 40 engines were eventually required, purchased at different
I
times.
should remain at
10
peace
distinct patterns. Each
in the
pattern
name
needed
of King
respective reserve
Jehovah
spare parts.
Jireh.
The permutations and combinations.
Kill
of the
all against
the
that.
engines were old and all
Right
worn.
now by fire and by
Broken
force.
and
All their
Parts
descent.
were affected by the desert sand and needed ceaseless attention and repair.
Now and
It was
freezing.
for 7 days a week. To the complication of machinery was added the confusion of tongues.
Wake 'em up and show 'em death. Endless death now in the name of King Jehovah Jireh, Archangel Michael. Loving ancestors.
The engineer officers displayed qualities of tact and
My
temper.
deceased
Their
loved
judgments were
ones.
indefatigable. Overall, the Sirdar
Claim this victory right
usually
now.
Gracious, rarely impatient, never unreasonable. He moved among the workshops and about the line, satisfying himself that all was proceeding with economy and dispatch. The sympathy of common labor won him the affection of the subalterns. Nowhere in the Sudan was he better known than on the railroad. Nowhere was he so ardently believed in. It is now necessary to anticipate the
Declaration of
As soon as the railway reached Abu
Independence.
Hamid, General Hunter's force, which was holding that place, dropped its slender
That's
cavalry
right.
from Marawi and drew its supplies along the new line direct from Wadi Halfa. After the completion of the desert line, there was still left 17 miles of material for construction, and the railway was consequently
Forced payment from our
15 miles
enemies
south of
right
Abu Hamid.
now.
Meanwhile, Berber
In
under
full,
consideration
forever.
called the concentration of a larger force to maintain that town. The 4
For
battalions which
death
had been Marawi were floated
and
down to
freezing.
Halfa, and there in training were carried by Halfa
Right
to
now,
Hamid to
by
Dakhla,
fire and the
450
force
miles.
of King
When the
Jehovah.
railway journey had been begun across the desert, it was believed that the Nile was always
Archangel
bounded
Michael,
by
loving
water.
ancestors,
Informer campaigns
deceased
had been
loved ones,
regulated,
loving
and waterway became
universe,
clear.
protecting
But as the river
shield.
fell, it became evident that
This prayer petition,
with the subsidence of the waters, cataracts began to appear, and to avoid these, it became necessary, first of all, to
anybody
extend the
that attacks
water to
against
Anya,
it
and finally to the
is
Anhar.
a dead
Before
person
Solomon had
right
been
now in
and
freezing.
unusual financial difficulties presented
In
themselves.
the name of King
When
Jehovah
the water was
Jireh.
settled, and the extension began at the rate of about a mile a day. The character of the country varies considerably between other
All
cities.
angels of the
For
divine.
60 miles, the line ran beside the Nile. At the
All
end of the
archangels of the
on the
divine
west,
Holy
cultivable, though
Spirit.
mostly uncultivated
I
strip.
call
Along
upon
the
you right
silver
now.
of the fine sand drifted
Attack my
scattered,
enemies.
scraggy gum palms and prickly mimosa bushes grew. Between the branches of these somber trees, the river gleamed, a cool and attractive flood.
Leave them dead
Here broken by frequent rocks and dry water courses. From
in the fight
another desert section of 50 miles
right now.
to avoid some very difficult ground by the Nile bank. From Abadia to the Atbara, the last stretch of the line runs across a broad alluvial expanse from whose surface plain trees of mean appearance.
In the name of
According
King
to
Jehovah Jireh.
flowers watered by the autumn rains. The fact that the railway was approaching regions where rain is not an almost unknown phenomenon increased the labor of construction. To prevent the embankments from being washed away into watercourses, 10 bridges and 60 culverts had to be made, and this involved the transport over the railway of more than 1,000 tons.
Peace
of
be
material,
still
in
to
addition
these
to
lands right now.
By the arrival of the
Loving
reinforcements at Berlin, the
universe.
fighting force at the front was doubled.
Or death to those
Business
against
supply.
it.
The task of providing the food of an army in a desert, 1,000 miles from their base, and with no apparent means of subsistence at the end of the day's march.
Dry them
was
out,
picturesque,
King
but not less
Jehovah.
important than the building of railways along which that nourishment is drawn to the front. Supply and transport stand or fall together. History depends on both, and in order to explain the commissariat aspect of the river war, I must again both repeat and anticipate the account.
Shake their
Sir
grounds,
exercised direct
Lord.
and personal supervision over the whole Department of Supply, but his action was restricted almost entirely to the distribution
Allow them
of
to crumble
the
beneath
accumulation of
their
labor
feet.
supply were the task of Colonel Rogers, and this officer, by 3 years of exact calculation and unfailing allowance for the unforeseen, has well deserved his high reputation as a feeder.
All ascended
The
masters.
first military necessity of the war
I
was,
call upon your loving
most
name.
the bulk of the Egyptian army at Akasha.
Attack
In
my
ordinary
enemies.
circumstances, this would not have been a serious
Till
concern.
death.
The frontier reserves of food were calculated to meet such an emergency. But in 1895, the crops in Egypt...
Get 'em off of me.
At the beginning of 1896, there was a great scarcity of grain. When the order for the advance was issued, the frontier grain stores were nearly exhausted. The new crops would not be garnered until the end of April. Thus, while the world regarded
Right
Egypt as
now,
a vast granary,
in the name of
soldiers
King
were obliged to
Jehovah
purchase
Jireh.
4,000 tons of durum,
Archangel
and 1,000
Michael,
tons of
your
barley,
loving
and 1,000 tons
ancestors.
on which to begin the campaign. The chief item of soldiers' diet in most armies is bread, and several of our wars
Then
have
me.
and consequently the efficiency of the troops has been impaired by bad bread or by the too frequent substitution of hard
Do
biscuits.
not allow
The
nothing
daily
to
markup of
disturb
the
what
pounds
I
of flour
do.
daily, and it is easy to imagine how bitter
And
foreign
it is death to those that
His duty
is.
was to insist on proper quality, and the contractors
Trying to disturb me.
meriting the epithet rascally, intent only upon profit. But in the well-managed Egyptian service, no such difficulties arose. The department had in 1892 converted one of
That's
Ishmael
right.
His gun factories near Cairo into a victualling yard. Here were set up their own mills for grinding flour, machinery for manufacturing biscuit to the extent of 60,000 rations daily.
I've
even for making
spoken.
soap. Three great advantages sprang from this wise arrangement. Firstly, the good quality of the supply was assured. Complaints about bread and biscuit were practically unknown. And the soap, since the soldier, in contrast to the mixture of
This
rubble,
shit
grease,
practically unknown. You heard him.
could actually wash himself and his clothes with it. was
That's
fixed.
right.
Secondly, all risk of contractors failing
Get
to
them
funds
and
was avoided.
end it right
These
now.
funds resulting from the economy had
Nothing but
useful
defeat.
of 150 acres. And thus, although the purchase
For
of
my
land
enemies
was
right
expensive,
now.
the end of
Dust.
the war, Fortune returned crippled. Arrived the day of the
Right.
fight. And thereafter, communications were open.
My granddaddy rode the city buses.
Created the most difficult situation
Up
of the
to
war.
retirement. Yeah, I'm telling you motherfuckers, because he was a very serious man. Very educated. Get him fucked up. Exactly.
40 miles by rail from Ramadi to Aswan, 205 miles by boat. From Aswan to Shalal, 6
Little
miles by
slit
boat.
throat.
248 miles by military railway. From Dakesh to Sheraik, 45 miles by boat. From Sheraik by camel, 13 miles round the cataract.
Get your
By camel
fucking
to
throat,
Al-Ain.
bitch, or
And
somebody
then
else
50 miles by
will.
boat. The road taken by this box
Who
of
gives a fuck?
every ton of supplies required by 10,000 men in the field. The uninterrupted working of the long and varied chain was vital to the welfare of the army and the success of the war.
Beef
Only
in the
when
night.
every section was adequately
Who
supplied,
gives a
and no one
fuck?
either choked or starved.
Right.
Stalin had himself
Victory on
directed
this
every
shit
day
here.
by transport officers.
3 of the
Despite the
motherfucking
circumstances
cups.
of the boats,
Tower.
those that grew sick or died. And
Wheel
of
of
the bottom of this, the line was completed to Bashar. On the 5th of May, they reached Abadi. The whole railway.
Fuck. Give a fuck what you try to do. You should have something else to do. Get a fucking agenda. My motherfucking money. That's the start, motherfuckers. You thieving ass pay the pinnacles.
The director and his subalterns had labored long. And their efforts
Selling
were
yourselves
success.
cheap, you
On the day of the
motherfuckers.
first troop steamed into the fortified camp at the confluence of the
Who gives
Nile
a
and
fuck?
the River. The doom of the dervishes was sealed. It had now
I
become
bet I
possible
can't
for
give a
the
fuck
sea
about
to
that.
send
I
into the
bet I
bodies of
can't
the
give a
dead
fuck
great
about
armies
that.
of the sea
Can't
and
give a
the
fuck
river
about that.
to supply the Nile
Oh,
with abundant food and
hell
ammunition.
no.
All the very
Hell
good
to the
men
fuck
of the
no.
war, and to support their action planned by
Can't do it. Look at that.
was predominantly
Can't
the
do
river
it.
and command the banks. And could anyone
Motorcycle.
find their way past Khartoum, even to Sennar, Bashona, or
Bitch, I
Sirte?
ain't got it right.
Though the battle was not
But I do it to get on your ass, bitch. I know. I need that shit to reach, so we put that shit in the smoke, my
Most
nigga.
convenient hour, with the least trouble. And at the
Fuck wrong with y'all? Long distance travel, bitch. Shout out to the Most High. Fuck the nigga for real. Bitch, I don't give a fuck what you motherfuckers talking about, bitch. Just a fuckhole. Give a fuck, bitch. Yeah. Shut up. Shut up, bitch. Love your aunt, motherfucker. You gonna lay next to your enemy, you gonna slit your fucking throat, bitch. Shit, bitch.
Small wooden pulpit and address the assembled worshipers.
Y'all don't know my struggle, bitch.
Under Wad Bishara, he enlarged the losses the Turks had sustained and described their
Yeah,
miserable condition.
stupid
He reported the fact
motherfuckers.
that certain of the Jahalia had surrendered and reminded his tortures, which it was the practice of the English and Egyptians to inflict upon the piety which disgraced the age.
Give a fuck what they talking about.
And his enjoyment of the favor of God in the councils of the late Mahdi, and having by his oratory raised the fanatical multitude to a high pitch of excitement, he thus concluded his long
I
career.
don't take
These
L's,
rude
bitch.
chiefs had retired from Dagala, yet they are not defeated. Only they that disobey
YOLO
me
in this shit,
I instructed the
bitch.
faithful to refrain from fighting.
Fuck on with y'all niggas,
It's by
man.
my command that they have done what they have done. But the angel of the Lord and the spirit of the Mahdi have warned me in a vision that the souls of
Fuck
the
y'all
accursed
niggas
Egyptians
got going
under
on,
invisible
bruh.
things shall leave their bodies between Dagala
Running
and
around, bitch. What's up?
shall whiten. Thus shall the
What's
enemy be
up?
conquered.
Yeah.
And drawing his sword,
Ace
he
of
cried with a loud
swords.
voice, it did but
What the
sword.
fuck?
The religion is
Bitch, what it
victorious.
is.
Islam shall triumph. Whereupon the worshippers, who to the number of
Fuck
20,000,
you
felt a great
motherfuckers
confidence,
wanna do.
although they could not all hear his voice, saw his sword flashing in the sunlight,
Or
and the
wands.
court imitated him, waving their swords.
Seven seats,
Praising
seven
mighty shall appear.
pentacles, bitch.
When the tumult had
You
subsided,
playing seeds
Esau
from the
announced that
divine,
those
fuck
who remained
niggas.
faithful
What's
until
up?
the
What
end,
y'all trying to
and his
do?
part would remain, knowing that God would
Pussy
vindicate them.
assholes.
Public confidence was thus restored.
What's up?
In order that the divine favor might
Trying to
be
motherfucking cheat the
until
system,
God
bitch. I think not, bitch. I'm gonna sit my ass right here and watch you bitches go to jail.
Following the route of the
That's
dead,
what the fuck I'm
he
finna do.
went to Metemma.
To a Wands tower.
In spite of this,
Bitch, you gonna
both
discover a
other
tower.
survivors of his flag. Bishara,
Blocked
who
ass
routed the organized
motherfuckers.
of
Look
the
at that, nine of wands.
Metemma, the headquarters of the Jalin.
Blocking your family, bitch.
To arrange for a general concentration.
There you go.
The emir, Ibrahim,
Exactly, the queen of cups, bitch. I done told you with my real psychic ass, bitch. I can read your motherfucking mind, so what? Motherfuckers, get out my head, bitch, cause I don't like your thoughts. Gotta write your bitches off, put you in the fire.
He did not produce the number of dervishes in the
Don't give a
fuck.
fuck.
Ed Darner, Adorama, Asubri, El Bashir.
That's right.
For a short visit in the long
Rejected
consultation,
ass
Muhammad
motherfuckers.
returned to his post at Adorama. Last
Forever.
but not least in importance, Mahmud, who commanded the
Fuck,
army of the West,
bitch.
was ordered to leave very reduced garrisons in Kordofan and Darfur.
You fucked up, bitch. I don't even know. Gonna fucking try me, bitch. I don't think so.
Mahmud, who was as daring and ambitious
Thank
as he
you.
was conceited and incapable, received
Even
some
more,
authority and
get me
sent forth
fucked up with a bitch that know me, think they can try me. Bitch, I said hell
Balaam and
no.
Barabra were discontented. He knew that they were weary of his rule and approval.
Okay?
In proportion as the Egyptian army advanced, so their loyalty. and
Talking about just walk like this for real.
He therefore abandoned all idea of making a
Niggas
stand
know
against
though.
the emir Yunus, who, since he had been transferred from Dagla in 1895,
Cool
and
then.
was directed to collect all the camels.
Intuitive
boats,
about the
grain,
devil
and
magic,
supplies
bitch.
of
Focus on this shit like a
Yunus
project,
was
bitch.
thoroughly
That's
The
right.
inhabitants were soon relieved of
I
all their
do
property,
that.
and most of their means of livelihood.
I got
And
free
a natural
time,
resentment
bitch. I
of
did a
his
lot of
resources,
shit
and
early,
the
bitch.
anti-astonishment
It's
events
good.
Which followed the capture of Abu Khalid.
Okay?
This last place
You ain't
was
tripping
built
about doing nothing right now.
Its
Good.
garrison was not large, and although it
Thank
had
you.
from the most northerly Dervish position, only a slender
Spare
reinforcement
death
added to the
coming.
rest under the
That's
command
what
of
it
Muhammad
say.
Hussein. The power of the
You'll be
Muslims
eliminated
in
what
the
you
campaign
cheated and
was
tried to
fully
hold
defeated
on to. You
and
gonna
the
reveal your
forces
hung
of the
yourself
resistance
with
began
God.
to construct several forts at the northern end of the
God
Shahid
in
Gorge.
control.
Gordian,
Foolish
on board
bitches
both
watching me. That's
sides,
what it's
liability
saying.
to
I'm
the
protected. I'm finna end the
exporting
cycle.
lines
The
and
world
swords.
card.
Now, the Federal
Last
was not
card.
sufficient force to hold the works when they were made.
Bitch is dead. Like
It has a powerful effect on the
you heard.
and while he neglected no detail, he based his hopes on the
Fucking
inevitable
worried
success
about
of
me,
the
bitch.
Main
Better worry about
River
your
and
own
the
death.
walls of the city.
I keep
With
telling
this
you
prospect continuing before
motherfuckers.
him, he drilled
But
into
go on and
the
ruin your fate for mine.
regularity.
Go on
The
ahead.
standard soldiery practiced their
And I don't even know you, you stupid motherfuckers.
But after a
Go
while,
on and do it, bitch. I'm finna have wish fulfillment with a golden opportunity, bitch. Keep on.
The Iron Road stopped at Kerma. Why had they not followed up their success? Obviously, because they feared.
Everybody chasing this shit, right?
This, the Khalifa took fresh courage, and in January
Knight of
1897
swords.
began to revolve
Cut off,
taking the
bitch,
offensive
police.
and expelling the invaders from the Dongola province.
Straight up.
The army drilled and maneuvered continually on the plains of Karari.
What's happening with this government? What's happening with the
Large forces
government?
drive Kisra or Sudan
Literally
Kisra,
them.
including dervishes on expeditions.
What's going on?
The Sirdar did not remain
They trying to get some
Tireless
patience.
enterprise of the intelligence branch
Okay.
furnished complete information.
I done told y'all about that patience though, bitch. I want my money. With a fortune.
Regular reconnaissances were made
Okay.
by cavalry, both into the desert towards Skaptul Well and along the river. Towards the end of May, it was
Put my
reported
shit
that
back,
the
bitch.
crossed the Nile was
And I'm not
raided by
motherfucking playing.
In consequence, the Sirdar ordered a strong patrol under Captain Luke Gallet.
Queen of
Consisting
Wands.
of cavalry under Captain Mayhem, 3 companies of
I know this, bitch. I do some dumb shit too, bitch. Alright?
Through the Shukuk Pass and as far as Salaman. The
Alright.
operation was unbroken by incident, but as the patrol was returning, it was attacked by an equal force of dervishes. And a sharp
Okay.
exchange ensued in which one British officer,
Okay.
Captain Payton, was severely wounded. 9 Egyptian troopers were
Okay.
killed.
They gonna abandon the
This
foolish
proved that the
act.
dervishes were on the
Okay.
move and forced the greatest.
How long we gonna take to do that, motherfuckers? Cause see, now I'm cussing.
The Khalifa received him with delight, and several
Apology.
of were held outside the city.
From who?
Mahmud himself
Bitch, I don't
was
give a
against the
fuck.
Turks. He had no experience.
I want my
in
motherfucking money.
that he
I wanna
used
get
his
out of
sword
here.
the invading forces, partly persuaded by the zeal of
Don't
his
start me
attempt,
with
partly
that
by the
shit.
attitude of the Jalin. The Khalifa determined
Everything must go as I do too.
into loyalty, or force them to revolt while the Egyptian troops
That's what I do.
to chief of the Jalin,
I'll let you
Abdallah
go.
Sa'ad, to honor them, and informed him that the Jalin
I
territories
get rid
were
of
threatened by
fuck
the Turks.
shit.
In the goodness of his heart, therefore, and because he knew that they loved the Mahdi and practiced the true religion, he was resolved to protect them from the without his head. The Khalifa
They got their
continued
true
to entrust his
religion
army with his
G's
army,
on.
would be sent for that purpose.
I heard they selling
Government showed
Walmart
the
now.
furnishing of all supplies and accommodation. He
What?
decided that the interview was over. The chief had the temerity to protest. He assured the Khalifa of his loyalty and of the ability of his tribe to repel the enemy.
Try the
He
nigga for
implored him not to
real,
impose the burden
bitch.
of
I
an
don't think
He
so.
exaggerated the poverty of Metemma. He lamented the misfortunes of the times. Finally, he begged forgiveness for making his protest.
Them pussy
The
ass
Khalifa
niggas
was
did
infuriated.
that. They still
Forgetting
want
his
me to
usual
slave
self-control
and
and
do
forms of
fuck
others,
shit.
he broke
Alright.
out into a long and abusive rage.
Alright.
He told the chief that he had long doubted his loyalty, that he despised his protestations, that he was worthy of a shameful death, that his tribe were a
Shameful
blot on the face of
death,
the earth,
bitch.
and that he hoped Mahmud would improve their manners and those of
Every
their
last one of them.
Allah Wad Sa'ad crept from the presence and returned in fury and disgust.
School bus.
Having collected the headmen of his
Again.
tribe, he informed them of his reception and the Caliph's intent.
I
It did not need
informed
to be
you.
told that the quartering
Your
of Mahmud's army
conception.
meant the plunder of their goods, the ruin of their homes, and the rape of their women. He resolved to revolt and join the Egyptian forces. As a result of the council, the jail chief wrote 2 letters. The first was addressed to the Sirdar and reached General Rundle at Merawi by messenger on the 24th of June. It declared the jail insufficient to the government and begged for help if possible to men who were failing that in arms.
Seen the
Concluded by
moped.
saying that, help or no help, the tribe were resolved to fight the dervishes and hold Metemma to the death. The second letter, a mad and fatal letter, carried defiance to the Khalifa. Rundle, who was at Merawi when the jail messenger found him, lost no time. A large amount of ammunition and 1,100 Remington rifles were speedily collected and hurried on camels across the desert by the Korti Metemma route, escorted by a strong detachment of the Camel Corps. The Khalifa did not receive his letter until the 27th of June, but he acted with even greater promptitude. Part of Mahmud's army had already started for the north. Mahmud and the rest followed on the 28th. On the 30th, the advance guard arrived before Metemma. The jailin prepared to resist desperately. Nearly the whole tribe had responded to the summons of their chief, and more than 2,500 men were collected behind the walls of the town. But in all this force, there were only 80 serviceable rifles, and only 15 rounds of ammunition each. Abdallah expected that the dervishes would make their heaviest attack on the south side of Metemma, and he therefore
Come
bestowed
on,
his 2
take me
riflemen
through
along that.
everything. And them
And for the rest
bitches
of the
act like
time,
they can't
forcibly
go
entrusted to
through
the knowledge of the
nothing.
spearmen.
Bitch,
On the
I
morning of
think.
Mahmud, with a force
Give a
variously
fuck.
estimated at 10,000 or 12,000 men, began his
You won't
assault.
pay me,
First
bitch.
attack fell,
Alright.
as the chief had anticipated, on the southern face, surrounded the whole town. And just as the jail and ammunition was exhausted,
Hotel.
a strong force of the dervishes penetrated the northern face of their defenses, which was held only by spearmen. The whole of Mahmud's army poured in through the gap, and the garrison, after a stubborn resistance, were methodically exterminated. An inhuman butchery of the children and some of the women followed. Abdallah Wad Sa'ad was among the killed. A few of the jailin who had escaped from the general destruction fled towards Gakdul. Here they found the Camel Corps with their caravan of rifles and ammunition. Like another force that had advanced by this very road to carry succor to men in desperate distress, the relief had arrived too late. The remnants of the jailin were left in occupation of Gakdul Wells. The convoy and its escort returned to Korti. But while the attention of the Khalifa was directed to these matters, a far more serious menace offered from another quarter. Unnoticed by the dervishes, or if noticed, unappreciated, the railway was stretching farther and farther into the desert. By the middle of July, it had reached the 130th mile, and, as related in the last chapter, work had to be suspended until Abu Hamid was in the hands of the Egyptian forces. The Nile was rising fast. Very soon, steamers would be able to pass the fourth cataract. It should have been evident that the next movement of the advance of the Turks impended. The Khalifa seems, indeed, to have understood that the rise of the river increased his peril, for throughout July he continued to send orders to the emir in Berber, Yunus, that he should advance into the Monastir district, harry such villages as existed, and obstruct the frequent reconnaissances from Merawi. Yunus, however, preferred to do otherwise, and remained on the left bank opposite Berber, until at length his master required a countryman to explain his conduct. Meanwhile,
I don't
the
like
town
what I
was
see here.
by the rise of the Nile and the progress of the railway, the movement of the Egyptian advance arrived. At the end of July, preparations were made, as secretly as possible, to dispatch a flying column against Abu Hamid. The dervish garrison, under Mahmud
It's
Zayn,
not working.
was not believed to exceed 600 men, but in order that there should
It's
be no
not
doubt as to
working
the
the way I
result, it was
want it
determined
to
to avoid a
work
strong
out for
force.
this
A brigade of all
kid.
arms
The
was formed
kid,
as follows.
exactly.
Commanding,
It's
Major
not
General
working for that. It's not
Artillery.
working. I don't
Artillery.
think so.
Number 2 field battery. This battery
I don't
consists of
think
6
so.
Krupp guns, 2 Maxims, 1 Gardner gun, and 1 Morgenfeld, an effective medley. Infantry.
I don't
McDonald's
like
Brigade,
it.
consisting of 3rd Egyptian, the 9th, 10th, and 11th. So
I
from many
like
points of
it.
view, the most imposing figure in the Egyptian army. He had served through the Nile expedition of 1884-85 with some distinction in the Cadiz service. Thenceforward his rise was rapid, even for an Egyptian officer, and in 10 years he passed through all the grades from captain to major general. His promotion was not, however, undeserved. Foremost in every action, twice wounded, once at the head of his brigade, always distinguished for valor and conduct. Hunter won the admiration of his comrades. All the personal popularity which great success might have brought to the Sirdar focused itself on his daring, good-humored subordinate, and was to Hunter that the soldiers looked whenever there was fighting to be done. The force now placed under his command for the attack upon Abu Hamid amounted to about 3,600 men. Until that place was taken, all other operations were delayed. The Sirdar awaited the issue at Merawi. The railway paused in mid-desert. The troops composing the flying column concentrated at Kassingar, a small village a few miles above Merawi. On the right were Abu Hamid, bank of the Nile. General Hunter began his march on the 29th of July. The total distance from Kassingar to Abu Hamid is 146 miles. The greatest secrecy had been observed in the preparation of the force, but it was known that as soon as the column actually started, the news would be carried to the enemy. Speed was therefore essential, for if the dervish garrison in Abu Hamid were reinforced from Berber, the flying column might not be strong enough to take the village. On the other hand, the great heat and the certainty that the troops would have to fight in action at the end of the march imposed opposite considerations on the commander. To avoid the sun, the greater part of the distance was covered at night, yet the advantage thus gained was to some extent neutralized by the difficulty of marching over such broken ground in the darkness. Throughout the whole length of the course of the Nile, there is no more miserable wilderness than the Monastir Desert. The stream of the river is broken, and its channel obstructed by a great confusion of boulders, between and among which the water rushes in dangerous cataracts. The sandy waste approaches the very brim, and only a few palm trees, or here and there a squalid mud hamlet, reveal the existence of life. The line of advance lay along the river, but no road relieved the labor of the march. sometimes trailing across a broad stretch of white sand in which the soldiers sank to their ankles and which filled their boots with a resting grit, sometimes winding over a pass or through a gorge of sharp-cut rocks, which, even in the moonlight, felt hot with the heat of the previous day. Always in a long, jerky, and interrupted procession of men and camels, often in single file, the column toiled painfully like the servant to whom it was said, "On thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat." The column started at 5:30 in the evening, and by a march of 16.5 miles, reached Mushra el Obiad at about midnight. Here, a convenient watering place, not commanded by the opposite bank, and a shade of 8 or 10 thorny bushes afforded them the first suitable bivouac. At 3:30 p.m. on the 30th, the march was continued 8.5 miles to a spot some little distance beyond Shabbat. The pace was slow, and the route stony and difficult.